How are you feeling? How long have you been here?
3 months, May 17th.
And what brought you?
That's difficult to answer.
I'm not clear. How is it that playing the piano for people has eventually resulted in your being here in the hospital?
That's difficult to answer.
this the end? There's a noise inside my head of crying people facing death. Is this the end? Is this the end? Oh, I'm burning in the stone.
Trick or treat, mother effers. Trick or treat, trick or treat, trick or treat. Okay, this is the only costume that I have. Is my crown. This perpetually by this. I went to the Halloween store yesterday and I tried to find, I was like, it's time to get something else other than a crown. You're an adult, you need a good Halloween costume. And I walked around the whole Halloween store and the only thing that was kind of close to maybe appealing to me was like a steampunk thing. And I actually have like a really nice like hat from New Orleans that actually probably could have been my Halloween costume if I'm honest about it. But I was like, no, none of them. And actually, this is really appropriate because, as you guys know, I am indeed the queen anti-communist of the internet. I have dubbed myself the queen anti-communist of the internet. And that's about to become really relevant because James is doing his last flailing gasps. I was notified of James doing a live podcast premiere on the basics of cultural Marxism. Now, this is a surprise because you really would have thought that James would have done this shit a long time ago. You really would have thought that maybe James would have done this podcast, I don't know, like several years ago. But he's just getting around to it now as he feels the fire of all of the antagonism that we've been sending his way. He's just getting around to it. And so, you know what, guys? We have a duty. We have a duty. We have a duty to know what the enemy is saying. We do this with the socialists. James really shouldn't be upset about this. We do this with the socialists. We've been doing this with the socialists for literally years. When I first had this idea to do this with socialists, James was actually the first person I told about it back in 2021. You guys saw it when I revealed my entire DM history with him after he spread rumors on the internet that I had violent sexual fantasies about him and was trying to fuck him. And I was like, oh yeah, let's look at our entire DM history, mother effer, because there ain't no flirting, there ain't no hearts, there ain't no kissy faces. What there is a lot of me talking to James about, like, here's what I want to do and here's what I'm thinking about and what do you think about this and what do you think about that? And one of the things I said to James is, what if we just were disruptive in their presentations? And he was like, oh yeah, it's a great idea. And I was like, yeah, I think it is a great idea, isn't it? And so I started doing that with socialists years ago, back in 2021. And, you know, James had no problem with that. He had no problem when I did with socialists in 2022. He had no problem when I did with socialists in 2023. James started to have a problem when we started to realize that he was full of shit and that he had totally lost it and that he had started teaching things that were way, 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 way unhinged from reality. And so then we started debunking James's presentations, because if James wants to be a dick about it, and James wants to wrongly inform millions of people about what's going on, listen, man, I don't have the platform James does. I don't have the audience James does. That's all fine, well, and good. I can't do nothing about that. But what I can do is make sure there is a resource somewhere on the internet where someday, when people are finally sick of James's shit, someday they can find this resource and they can go, wow, there were other people talking about how James is full of shit, and I just didn't know about it. So we're creating that resource. We are creating an oasis in the middle of the desert. Now, before we get started, I want to make sure everyone subscribed to James's channel under at least 3 accounts. I'll put the link in the chat. This is the video that we're watching. Now, I'm going to lay some ground rules for this. We're going to be getting started in about 10 minutes. I'm going to lay some ground rules, okay? Hang on, let me just pin this to the top of the chat. Here's the stream we're watching. Make good choices. Okay, we need to be subscribed to James's channel under multiple accounts because he's going to ban us. But, like, we're going to slow play this one, guys. We're going to slow play this one. Actually, I need to get the chat back. Show chat. How do I... Hang on. Hang on. I want to make sure we're showing the chat. There it is. So, guys, we're going to slow play this one. We're going to go at a leisurely pace. Hang on a second here. I just need to fix something. You guys can see my screen, right? I just need to put it back in default mode so I can actually see what I'm doing. If my thing wants to load, okay. Okay. Now YouTube is back in default mode. Now we're going to go back here. So now I'm going to be able to see what I'm doing. We are going to slow play this one. All right. Milo says, Milo, thank you for the super chat. If I was the devil and I wanted to keep the right confused about their enemy so that they would not see the revolution coming until it was too late, I would invent James. Yeah. I kind of feel the same way. Subscribers only mode enable. The messages. Okay, so you only have to be subscribed to the channel for a minute. So everyone go make sure that you're subscribed under at least 12 accounts. Maybe not 12, but if you wanted to subscribe under 12 accounts, that'd be great. Because we are going to be asking questions and we are going to be putting... Now, this is not a live... James is not live on the internet. He's just doing a premiere. So he can't talk to us. But what we can do is put information in the chat. And we are going to be really judicious about what we put in the chat. Because, guys, are you ready for it? This is a 3-fucking-hour podcast. 3 hours. 3. So this is a marathon. This is not a sprint. And we are going to put information in the chat when we feel is necessary, but we are not going to spam his chat. We're not going to be ridiculous in his chat. We have to hold ourselves, and I will remind people of this as we make our way through the presentation. We have to hold ourselves to a high standard. I do not want to see any character attacks. I do not want to see any insults. I only want to see things in the chat that are relevant to the things that James is talking about in this podcast. I don't want you to bring up anything that is not directly related to what he's talking about. I will be telling you what questions I think you should ask. I will not be chatting in, of course, because they would use that against me. But you guys can. I will ask you to say certain things sometimes when I believe it's highly relevant to what's going on. You are also welcome to say, I'm not going to say like I'm telling you everything to say and you just have to do it. You can say whatever you want. But the thing is, I really don't want to see anyone causing problems, okay? The point of our war with James Lindsay is that we are engaging in an intellectual battle. We are not stooping to the depths that James Lindsay is stooping to. We are engaging in an intellectual battle of ideas. James can't do that. All James knows how to do is insult me and slander me and lie about me and whine about me on the internet. He has never once engaged with our intellectual questions, and that is how we know that this is the weapon that we can use against him that is going to be the most effective. Look, people are already talking about it. Oh, wow. Because you know why? Because I blocked Peter. Peter is someone who was disruptive in my chat, and I blocked him, and now he's complaining over in James's chat. I subbed to Carlin a few months back thinking she might shed light on my understanding of things. Boy, was I wrong. Began chatting in her screams, and what do you think happened? Well, Peter, you got blocked because you were repeatedly disrupting my chat when I told you not to. Anyway, now Peter is on James's team because this is what happens on the internet. Peter is a great example of someone who doesn't actually care about learning anything, doesn't actually care about making progress in the real world, just wants someone to pander to his fifis. And so Peter can chat in over there all he wants. That's fine. We don't really care. But do you know what we're not going to do? Excuse me. Do you know what we're not going to do? Do not even acknowledge Peter. Do not even chat with Peter. Do not answer him if he directs things at you. So people like him, what they're going to try to do is they're going to try to egg you into a back and forth with them. And they're going to do it by insulting me. They're going to do it by insulting the stuff that we do over here. They're going to do it by whining and complaining. They're going to do it by saying, you're obsessed with James. And blah, blah, blah. Ignore them. Ignore them entirely. Our only job when we choose to chat in, which is going to be, again, this is a marathon, this is not a sprint. Our only job is to articulate information that is relevant to what James is saying. So we ignore people like him entirely. Do not engage with anyone in the chat. Okay? Do not hurl insults. Do not say anything about the Jews. I don't want to see any Jewish stuff over there. It is counterproductive to what we're doing today. I only want to see people engaging in intellectual argumentation about what James is saying. Is everyone clear on that? Put 1 in the chat if you're clear. Put 2 in the chat if you have questions. It is very, very, very important that we maintain the high road when we do stuff like this, because we are recording all of this. We are recording our actions and we're recording their actions. And what we want to show people is that we are the ones that are asking relevant, highly intellectual questions, and James is the one throwing a massive fuck off hissy fit for anyone who questions him. This is not for people in the chat. This is not for retards like Peter. This is for people who are watching this and going, why can't James answer intellectual criticisms of his work? That is what we're doing here. We have had 2 other successful outings like this. We had one on James's channel. We had one on Deb's channel when James was on for a live interview. And so we want to make it 3 for 3. We want the trifecta, okay? We do not cede the moral high ground because it is obvious that we are right. And they can whine and complain and cry and all that stuff. And it doesn't matter. All that matters is getting correct information out to people who are interested in the topic, all right? So that's what we're doing here. Should be getting started in about 3 minutes. Guys, before we get started, I just want to remind everyone, happy Halloween. That's why I'm wearing a crown. Also because I'm the queen anti-communist of the internet. But I just want to remind everyone, because it is Halloween, this is the last day to get the special limited edition Halloween merch in the Unwoke Art store. That's unwokeart.com. Link in the description below. These designs will be leaving the store come tomorrow. They will may never be back because it's a special limited edition design. We've got Marxism is coming for your soul. We've got collectivism. We've got everyone is equal until they're not. And then we've got the bestseller Marxist Utopia of the Dead. You can get it in t-shirts, sweatshirts, pint glasses, mugs, stickers. And this is the very, very last day. And so get your orders in, guys. Come tomorrow. We're going to have a whole other new set of limited edition merch in the store because I got some cool stuff coming up. Hopefully it's up tomorrow. Maybe it'll be up later this week. Whatever. Got a lot of stuff coming up in the next week. Of course, the presidential election. Hey, if Trump wins, I'll bring back the Trump merch. If Trump wins, I'll do, not only will I do the golden Trump again, I will also bring back a special new limited edition Trump design or something like that. So if Trump wins, we'll get some new Trump merch in the store because even though I'm not voting for him, I do have an appreciation for him. And it's the way it goes. All right, guys, we are about to get started. Let me get the sound set up over here. I hope you're all having a wonderful, 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 wonderful day. And I'm really looking forward to this. I was so excited. I was like, this is exactly what we need. This is trigger. How did James not realize he was baiting us by doing this on Halloween? Everyone, please mount the like button for me. Mounting the like button lets YouTube know to recommend this content to more people. I am live early today. We will not be doing a 5 p.m. stream. We'll just be doing this. I apologize if that pisses anyone off. I didn't know about this until like 2 hours ago. Hey, you figured out how to operate your own computer? Congratulations. Welcome. Welcome. Guys, remember, maintain the moral high road at all times. Everything you put in that chat, you are representing me. We're going to slow play this. This is a 3-hour podcast. We got 3 hours. We might not even make it through the whole thing. But we're going to try. We're going to try. Subscribe to James's channel under at least 3 accounts. 5 accounts would be better. 12 accounts would be better. Okay, we're getting started. Why is there an ad? Oh, God. This is very zen. This is very, very, very zen. I will be telling you guys what questions I would like asked or what statements I would like made in the chat throughout the presentation. No, you cannot say this. No. Not at the beginning anyway. Again, we are taking the high road. We might do a grand finale depending on how all this goes, but this is 3 hours long. So if you say this, he's just going to ban your account and then you're not going to be able to say anything else. And also, it makes us look bad. We don't want to look bad. We want James to look like he is deleting legitimate questions and legitimate statements. That's what we want. I'm drinking some coffee. You guys can also do the thumbs down on James's side if you want. Not on my side. You thumbs up over here, you thumbs down over there. Yeah, this is our Halloween spooktacular for Jimmy Jim Jim. I'm quiet compared to the video. Okay, I'll turn myself up. I will turn myself up loud. Is that better? His volume is loud on this video, honestly.
Hello and welcome to another episode of the New Discourses podcast. This is James
how is
Lindsay.
this? Am I louder?
I am doing something for you that you've been asking for a long time today. And what I'm doing today is a basics. The basics of cultural Marxism.
Thanks, James.
Now, when we talk about woke Marxism and Marxism more generally, there are a lot of subjects to cover. And I mean, I think we could probably build entire university style, I mean, not just courses, sequences, curricula around all of the different topics. And as a matter of fact, what I want to do today is to kind of break into 4 pieces a rough introduction to cultural Marxism, which is just one phenomenon. And just to disclaim, cultural Marxism is a fraught term. Cultural Marxism has been declared by the powers that be a conspiracy theory, and in particular an anti-Semitic conspiracy theory. The claim is that the people who just notice things, as they call themselves on the internet today, because they're in resurgence, happened to notice that the members of the Frankfurt School in particular, which is one of the dimensions of the cultural Marxism or Western Marxism phenomenon, were all ethnically Jewish, although they were not, as a matter of fact, practicing or observant or certainly Orthodox Jews in any regard. As a matter of fact, their religion was communism. They would have promoted, not quite to a man because of Walter Benjamin, but they would have promoted
their religion was communism,
broadly
and that's why it's
atheism
Gnosticism
as a kind of baseline,
No.
and then a
Wrong.
faith of utopian communism or socialism, depending on which ones we're talking about. I don't know that Max Horkheimer, for example, was particularly bent on a utopian vision, but Herbert Marcuse was most definitely bent on a utopian vision. He said so himself in his own words. So
That
it's
doesn't mean
difficult to talk
atheist,
about
James.
cultural Marxism, and this is my little disclaimer at the beginning, and then I'll kind of talk more about what I'm doing, why I'm doing it, and get to the meat of this. It's difficult to talk about cultural Marxism because it is labeled an anti-Semitic conspiracy theory, believing that people who just notice things have pointed out that the Frankfurt School was overwhelmingly, if not entirely, ethnically Jewish, and that they had a plot to destroy Western civilization. That is the so-called anti-Semitic cultural Marxism conspiracy theory. Here's the thing. There are a lot of elements of truth to that. However, there are also a lot of incorrect elements, like I just said. These people, what's incorrect? Their religion was not Judaism. Their religion was communism.
No,
Very
James,
clearly,
fuck
and
you!
in somewhat different stripes.
But weren't they
were
Jewish?
Marxists, which is
Don't say
something
that in the chat. No
you
no
can see
Jew jokes in the
Marxists
chat.
who pretend to be Christian or who use Christian motifs.
But they weren't
You can
Jewish,
see
though,
Marxists who
James.
pretend to be
They weren't Jewish.
whatever religion they have to be in order to fit in. So it's not anything to do with their Judaism. That's kind of an important incorrect point. Now, what is true is that they were from Jewish families, and they did have a plot to destroy Western civilization. But that plot did not grow out of their Judaism. That plot grew out of their communism. So the conspiracy theory often has to deal with this uncomfortable debunking
wrong,
fact by
James,
going
wrong,
backwards a
but-
step and saying communism itself is a apparently correct expression
This
of
is
the
literally
Jewish
just a response to
mentality,
me and
the
Nick
Jewish
Fuentes. You guys
ethnicity, which
understand this,
apparently is
right?
attached to that mentality, or the Jewish faith, which is starkly wrong. But that is, anyway, the conspiracy theory. So that makes it difficult to talk about cultural Marxism. I, for instance, have a Southern Poverty Law Center profile claiming that I am general hate and an anti-government general. And it spends a fair amount of time, as does my probably intelligence-produced Wikipedia entry, spending a significant amount of time saying that I peddle the cultural Marxism conspiracy theory. Unless you think, I think this is, of course, amusing. I think it's credentialing to have an SPLC profile. But as it turns out, it does cost you in real life. You do not get invited to the nicer of the nice things in the world because of having an SPLC profile, which is a problem. And they know it, and that's why they do this. And one of the primary accusations against me is that I traffic in the so-called cultural Marxism conspiracy theory. They're so dedicated to people not knowing what cultural Marxism is that they replaced the original entry for cultural Marxism on Wikipedia with one called Cultural Marxism Conspiracy Theory about 4 years ago. I remember using the previous entry as a source. You can still obtain that by now through a link on the conspiracy theory website. But if you actually type in cultural Marxism into Wikipedia, you get taken to a claim that it's a conspiracy theory first and foremost. And I used the original as a source when I was first starting out. I mean, I don't remember when, 2000, it could have been as early as 16, 15, but certainly by 2020, I was looking into that because that's also 2019 is when I got introduced to Herbert Marcuse and his writing. So 2019 is when I started to look into all of that. So certainly by 2020, I would have been looking. And they changed, possibly, at least partly as a result of my work, they changed the Wikipedia landing page for cultural Marxism. But this is going to be an introduction to the basics of cultural Marxism. That means it's going to be an overview, and I'm going to kind of elaborate on why I'm doing this. I've been asked for years, will you make a basics program? Will you make something easy? I get asked routinely.
I'll do it.
If I was going to send
I'll do
somebody
it.
to a first place to land, and if you're listening, I want you to
I
pay
already
attention
have
to this
that.
and remember it. If you were to
Kind
tell
of.
somebody what's the first piece of your work they should engage with, what would it be? I get asked that all the time. Well, here you go, boys and girls, the basics of cultural Marxism.
Oh, good. This is James
That's
How to
this
Speak
episode.
Socialist
This
course.
is meant to be a starting place for people who want to start to understand what has
Oh, this is
happened in our
perfect.
world over the last century or so that has set the stage for the woke movement and everything that we're dealing with the Marxist attack on society. And in fact, if they're at the point of wanting to understand the rapidly growing reaction that is stepping into the trap devised by the cultural Marxism conspiracy theory type people, then this is the starting place to understand the actual historical reference of cultural Marxism. So this is just an overview of kind of the big picture story presented at a fairly basic level. This is a starting place for people looking for one. This is not going to be the deep, deep dive. If I have time and there's interest, I might do that. I might turn this into a multi-part, I'm thinking 5-part series, where this is the first of the 5, in which I explore each of the following 4 units. So I have 4 units I'm going to cover, and I could take each of these following 4 units and expand each one of them with details and accurate quotations that I read, like I do in my workshops, for those of you that have attended my workshops. In fact, most of the quotes I would use, I would pull from the workshop notes that I made, and do those as individual podcasts if there's interest. So, like, if we thought of this as a university structure, let's consider this to be 101. And those would be like 201, 211, 221, 231.
You guys can
or
compare
whatever.
this
In
to
other
how
words,
to
this is
speak
like the
socialist,
freshman
and you can see
introduction.
what you learn
Those
more
would
from.
be like the sophomore survey
yeah,
courses.
that's never going to happen.
Now, the
and
fact
it's his
is that
fault
those
that
would
it's never
still
going
be
to happen.
survey
So
courses, and we could
relax.
do
It's never gonna
literally,
happen.
if we really wanted to, we could do an entire
Also, I am far
semester
superior to James in
where
every
this
way,
is
and
just
he
the
is
first
wrong, and he needs to
lecture,
sit in his wrongness
or
and admit
first
his
and second
Gnosticism
lecture,
bullshit
depending,
is
'cause it's
wrong.
going to be long. And then there are several further lectures that go into tremendous amounts of depth about each of these characters, each of these books. You could do I could do an entire series, and I have done series on just single essays, like Repressive Tolerance was a 4-essay series. Essay on Liberation was a 4-essay series. We could do a very long or very short, depending on what you wanted to hear out of it, essay series on Max Horkheimer's creation of critical theory. There are lots and lots of things to say. The prison notebooks from Antonio Gramsci, which are going to come up in this, are over 3,000 pages long. We could make as much information as we wanted to. History and Class Consciousness by George Lukács is a very difficult to read book that's in the excess of 300 pages. We could make entire
James
courses
isn't going to be
out
hinged
of
into
each
what the left is
subject
currently
I'm
doing
going to
today
touch on
at all. This is all
within
historical
so
development
I'm
stuff.
just telling you that to really give you the sense that what I'm about to give you, because I know how the world works, in particular I know how the internet works, is a surface level introduction to the history and basics of cultural Marxism. And that I may proceed to do a still shallow but deeper dive into each of 4 units. The 4 units for this workshop, I guess, or this podcast, this episode, the 4 units that I'm going to present are: first, Marxism and its historical context. We can't actually talk about the basics of cultural Marxism without understanding something about Marxism. And we can't talk about why cultural Marxism occurred at all without understanding the historical context of the failure of Marxism in its original sense. Secondly, I'm going to talk about a thing that actually carries the label, historically, cultural Marxism. Western Marxism could be a catch-all for these various views by units 2, 3, and 4 for this particular podcast. But cultural Marxism is the right name to describe the thing that was happening roughly in the, I guess, 1910s and 1920s into the early 1930s, maybe through the middle of the 1930s, primarily within Western Marxism. Third, I'm going to cover critical Marxism, which is also sometimes referred to, or usually referred to, as the critical theory. And so the critical theory was developed in the Frankfurt School by Max Horkheimer in 1937. And it is a diversion. It is a different track from the rest of Western Marxism. It takes the cultural Marxist kind of underpinning and takes it in what it hoped would be a more productive direction that is in fact even more negative in its general theology, and takes it off in a direction that to this day is still a vibrant school of thought, although it's less than it once was. And there was a massive and important split within the the critical Marxism vein that leads us into, and this would have been in the 1960s, really, going into the 1970s, maybe even by the 1980s, that goes into what I'm going to consider the fourth of these units, which is woke Marxism or intersectional Marxism, which is really cultural Maoism or American
No,
Maoism
wrong,
or
wrong,
intersectional
wrong,
Maoism,
wrong,
but the
wrong.
importation of Maoism
Today's
and identity
Marxists
politics
reject
becomes
Mao,
the defining
James.
characteristic of that. And so once again, the 4 units are the historical context in which cultural Marxism arose,
Because
with a
he's
brief introduction
misinforming
to
millions of people.
Marxism itself,
How do you
in probably
okay.
a way you're not used to hearing as Unit 1.
I want you, specifically you, and anyone else that questions why I stream James, define how the left defines capitalism for me. Go. The next thing I want you to see you say in my chat, you give me the left's definition of capitalism. Specifically. And if you can't do that, that means James has not taught you accurately, and that means he needs to fucking shut the fuck up because he's not teaching people basic 101 level information. So we're going to wait for your definition of how the left defines capitalism. I'll look forward to seeing that in my chat. And that's anyone else that wants to question me on this.
And we're definitely not swimming laps, and we're definitely not diving to the bottom. That is a completely different project. And if this is interesting enough and we find time and energy, given all the other things we have to do,
Mao has
maybe
nothing
I'll take
to
each
do
of
with
these 4
modern
units
Marxism.
and expand them
It's
and do full-length
Leninism.
podcasts
It's
on
not
each. And then you'll
Maoism.
have
It's Leninism.
level 1 or level 100 and level 200 introduction in 5 pieces, or maybe it's just going to be the one, who knows, that you can send to people and say, this is where you should start with James's work to understand what he's talking about. Okay, so Unit 1, Marxism and its the historical context in which cultural Marxism arose. So Marxism is a religion. That's the first sentence that we need to cover. The summation of that faith, actually, and you think I'm making a joke, and I'm not making a joke, the summation of that faith can be summarized in a very famous sentence now that does not come from Karl Marx, despite memes on the internet misleading you to believe that it does. And that sentence is being able to see what can be unburdened by what has been. Of course, Vice President Kamala Harris, at least at the time of this recording, she's Vice President Kamala Harris says that a lot, and has said that a lot for years. I again reiterate, Karl Marx did not, to my knowledge, anywhere write that. He's written so much stuff, it's possible it's somewhere, depends on the translation from the German, but to my knowledge, he's never written that explicitly. There are many expressions in the Marxist canon from Marx himself and others that sound an awful lot like that, or that express that sentiment. So I believe it is in fact the beating heart of the Marxist religion, is being able to see what can be unburdened by what has been. It's a romanticism toward an idealized future. So it's the worst of French Romanticism as a philosophical school combined with the worst of German idealism as a philosophical school, and you idealize the future into a literal utopia, or a state of the Garden of Eden on earth, or a kingdom of God on earth, called communism, which is a stateless, classless society in which from each according to his ability, to each according to his needs is the distribution method. So you're able to see that as something that can be, but you have to be unburdened.
No. This is not what I asked you for. I asked you for the left's definition of capitalism, and there are not plenty of different definitions of capitalism. That's bullshit. If you think that that's true, you have learned nothing from James. I want you to tell me what the left's definition of capitalism is now. And if you can't do that and you keep whining and complaining in my chat, we're just going to ban you and you can go back and learn nothing from James, because you've obviously learned nothing from him already. There are not plenty of definitions of capitalist by the left. There is one very specific definition that they use over and over and over and over and over again, and if James was doing his fucking job, you would know what that is. You do not know what that is because James is not doing his job. Now, the next thing I want to see from you is the definition of capitalism, or get the fuck out.
At one point, I stopped looking at it. I forgot. Here we are. But in that, Karl Marx is very clear that he says that he says men make their own history, but they do not make it as they please. And I'm kind of paraphrasing from memory because I haven't memorized.
Marxism believes capitalism is the root of all evil. If anyone doesn't understand that, you've probably learned from James.
The weight of the existing world.
No, so you don't know what you're talking
like
about. Thank you. Sit down, shut the fuck up, and maybe learn something. Your historical conditions trap you into a mindset, into a way of being
right? So that's being burdened by what has been,
Oh yeah.
literally. And that the idea is that he
you just got
says a few
permanently
paragraphs
banned.
down, he
Goodbye.
talks about how all the revolutionary movements in the past, so men make their own history through revolution and governance, but primarily revolution, moving history in lurches throughout time. And he says the revolutions of the past have looked to the past. But the revolutions of the 19th century, meaning the socialist and communist revolutions that he was trying to spark, actually do not look to the past. They don't romanticize the past. By the way, that's what the fascist movements did later in the 1920s and 1930s. They don't romanticize the past, they romanticize the future. He says they do not take their inspiration from the past, but from a future that can be. He doesn't actually say that can be. He says from the future. And so here you have the ability to envision something that can be unburdened by what has been, and you can work to make that history come true. So the beating heart of Marxism, I think, is almost perfectly expressed in a couple of paragraphs on the first couple of pages of the 18th Brumaire of Louis Bonaparte by Karl Marx, which he wrote in 1852 or 1853, I forget which one. Okay, so that's the religion of Marxism. And Kamala Harris has it dumbed down for us, as you might expect, that we are able to see what can be unburdened by what has been. You find the same sentiment stretching across the Communist Manifesto. It's a little harder to find. Those of you looking, if you want to go look, the first paragraph of the Communist Manifesto, which we're about to talk about, then the last paragraph of the full actual body of the Communist Manifesto, which is not the last paragraph of the document, because there's a bunch of appendices where Marx complains about people he doesn't like. So there are 3 chapters, if I remember right, that are the bulk or the body of the Communist Manifesto. And if you read the first paragraph of chapter 1 and the last paragraph of what I think is chapter 3, the last paragraph of the body of the Communist Manifesto, then you will find the same sentiment expressed across the entire manifesto.
So James
but again,
is literally like,
exactly.
just read these 2 sections of the book and
never
ignore
said
the
it
rest
the way
of
that
it.
Kamala says it. Don't believe the memes on the internet. That's silly. So what is this communist religion about? Well, let's talk about
James
the
is
Communist
literally
Manifesto.
saying, just
How does
read these
communism
2
work?
sections
What is
of the Communist
communism in the
Manifesto
words
and
of its
trust me that
creators?
I'm
The
not
Communist
cherry
Manifesto
picking it,
for
bro.
historical purposes was published in 1848.
That kind of sounds like James is
And
cherry
we
picking
don't
the
have to
Communist
remember the
Manifesto
dates
to
here,
make
but I'm just
Kamala
kinda
Harris a
giving you
communist.
Timeline: 18th Brumaire of Louis Bonaparte, early 1850s, Communist Manifesto, 1848. And so the very first paragraph of the first chapter,
Can
there's
someone
a preface
ask,
that's
can someone say in the chat, this kind of seems like you're cherry picking the Communist Manifesto to make Kamala Harris seem like a communist? Can someone say that?
the first chapter, which is bourgeois and proletarians, or bourgeoisie and proletarians, where he's defining
Thanks, bot.
the terms. And his case is that what's going on, this is the communist belief system, is that all of history, first of all, is made by men, but is the history of class conflict. So
True.
in every historical epoch,
Correct.
there are classes, and the classes war with one another. They are in intrinsic antagonistic conflict over social standing and access to resources.
Bob
And he
Avarkian
says
is
that
the
that can be
Revcoms. The
summarized
Revcoms
in
are
a
a laughing
variety. It
stock
takes
on
a
the right
variety
on
of
the
forms.
left.
It can be
Someone's talking
summarized
about the
in a
Revcoms in the
single
chat.
word, which is 3 words: oppressor versus oppressed.
True.
And that is the key structure of the Communist Manifesto, the key concept.
True.
Oppressor versus oppressed. History moves through the intrinsic conflict of an oppressor class and an oppressed class
His chat's
that are
not
working
updating. Are you
together,
banned?
whether they know it or not, to generate history in a dynamic called oppression. Now, Karl Marx does not fully believe
Can someone else try that?
that's the only state of mankind, or the state of man's experience in life. He has this whole concept, what he
Yeah, you're probably
calls
shadow
the
banned.
scientific socialism, Wissenschaftlicher Sozialismus.
Yo,
As
we
best I
just
can
started,
do the German, which you can
We got a long
correct
way to
me,
go.
I don't care. His science of history, in other words, the movement of history, has a beginning state and an end state that are outside of history. History is the history of class conflict, and it begins with slavery. When one group decides to oppress another in slavery, Now you have history being made, and not just being made, but moving, and not just moving, but moving by men's hands, and not just moving by men's hands,
Let's
but moving by
just take a
men's
pause.
hands
We've already kind of missed the
through
opportunity,
act
Judy. Let's
of
just hold
creating
back.
a dynamic of oppression and thus class conflict. Before history, there was a state he called primitive communism, where you have tribes, and tribes are extended families, and the extended family tribes do not have a sense of private property. Private property is the bugbear in this story.
Oh!
Okay? It's what
Correct.
makes men see themselves as estranged from one another.
Correct.
And what it all comes down to is the idea of the private of private property. What
Yes.
makes private property private is what's called in law the fundamental right to exclude. In other words, notice that, by the way, their thing that they push in answer to everything is inclusion, right? The fundamental right to exclude, which means if this is my knife, I can prevent you from having it.
True.
I can exclude you from taking
Good.
it,
Progress.
from owning it, from holding it, from using it at my discretion. I have the fundamental right to exclude your use or holding or taking or ownership of the knife because it's mine. And that is the fundamental fall of man, actually, in the religion of Marxism. Before that, he says, in primitive communism, there's no such concept.
And now we're going back to the
Everything
Gnostic
is owned
mental
communally
gymnastics.
within the entire tribe. The problem is that in this kind of state of nature, men are in tribes. Yes, they are communes. Yes, they share, which I don't even think is fully accurate, by the way. He's romanticized the past here. But
it doesn't matter.
They have no sense of private property.
True.
They do not have ownerships, but the problem is there's one here and there's one there and there's one over there.
Under the
and they are
collective
estranged
care.
from one another. And in fact, when they meet each other, there's often conflict over territory or whatever else. And so the idea is that sooner or later, some of these tribes start to enslave one another, and they can do far more
True.
by creating slaves than they could do
slaves
just as
are
their own
private
communal
property,
pod of maybe,
James.
anywhere
Someone
between
say,
a few
aren't
dozen
slaves
up to
considered
maybe
to
a
be
few
private
hundred,
property under capitalism?
that share everything. And so before history, we live in this
Slaves
kind of
are private
primitive,
property. That's the
tribal, but communist state.
That's where critical race theory
and
comes
then
from.
way on the other end, after history, the goal is to return to a stateless, classless society that is now global
Not
communism.
stateless,
which means,
non-capitalist
if you've heard
state.
me talk about the logic of the spiral in the past, that you start at communism and you go through a variety of other states. Imagine you're walking, though, in a circle because you're going to come back to communism. Start with tribal communism, end in global communism. So it's like you walk in a circle that ends back in the same place, except not. It's like climbing a spiral staircase because you end back in communism, but elevated by one or more levels. It could be national communism as one level and global communism as a second, but you've elevated to a higher level. It's no longer that you have tribal communism in small, isolated tribes. You now have global communism. Same concept, higher level understanding. That is core to their theory of transformation, is that you're always trying to get back to the undifferentiated original at a higher level of comprehension, understanding, and practice. That's fundamental to this religion and its practice. But let's go back to the theory of history. First, you start out with tribes that are estranged from one another, and then they figure out that they can enslave. When they meet each other, they don't just fight over territory. They actually conquer the other tribe, take their territory, take their resources, and put the defeated tribe to work for them, and gather other defeated peoples and have them make babies and create an army of laborers who do slave labor to the benefit of the oppressing group. And now you have, for Karl Marx, the beginning of history, because history is defined by the movement of class antagonism. Before that, you don't have classes. You just have a bunch of estranged communists. After that, you have classes. So this is like we're walking around that spiral staircase, and we're no longer at communism. We're walking away from communism. We're walking around. We have introduced the idea of property. Maybe it's not wholly private. Maybe it's kind of more socialistic. In fact, maybe the ruling group owns everything and the exploited, enslaved groups own nothing. But then as you move through history, eventually the slaves revolt. The contradictions of the of the conditions become too much, they revolt, they're able to get a foothold, they band together, something happens, they're able to band together, and there's a revolution in economic structure and social structure that creates what he calls a feudal economy. A feudal economy comes next. This is where, rather than having the pure antagonism of slavery, you now have this slightly symbiotic slavery through the lord with his serf, or the guild master with his journeyman, or something like this. So now you have some kind of a lord serf or master pleb relationship. So the idea with the king being a kingdom and being the kind of ultimate expression of that. So the lord is in charge of some land. In other words, he's a landlord. And so he is now the oppressor class. The king is
True.
the ultimate landlord of a nation. And so he is the oppressor class.
True.
And everybody else are his vassals or his
James
serfs
knows
or
all
his
of this.
subjects or
This
his
is what I kept
servants
saying.
in one
James
way
is lying.
or another.
He knows
And so
all
the
of this.
lord's serfs do all of the farm work and they do all of the things and they make sure that the Lord has a nice life, and in return the Lord organizes the people that are under him as well as concentrates economic utility to provide for the common defense primarily, and for some social order within that pod, that lordship or whatever. Okay, so then the feudal economy, people start to realize that this is a raw deal and the landlords in this sense are not completely fair, and that why the hell can't I strike out on my own, especially if I have the capacity to defend myself and make for myself and make for my own, and I can trade freely with other people, and I don't need a set of elites in the royalty to determine how all that trade is going to be organized, and we shift out from the feudal system and into a capitalist system. Now, I'm saying shift.
We already had a private
but
property.
just
It was already
like the capture of all the
capitalism, according to them.
slaves that initiates slavery and the slave revolt that initiates feudalism, this is a violent
already
process. And in
capitalism.
fact, the violent process is always revolutionary to Karl Marx. So that each of these stages, each of these steps around the circle is marked by revolutionary violence in which the lower class bands together, violently ruptures with the higher class, and then moves along the spiral. So capitalism no longer uses the lord's serf or in kind of an indentured servitude model. It now uses wage slavery. The capitalists own all of the means of production, particularly the land, and particularly the heavy capital, the factories, for example. They might own the banks.
Wait,
and
did
they
he ban
certainly reiterate own the land.
They banned the comment
and
about
they
capitalism.
therefore
Okay, well, I still
extract
got it. We got it on video,
work
James.
to
Sorry.
build whatever they want out of workers who are paid in money, usually an unsatisfactory amount of money, for their labor in producing whatever it is that is supposed to be produced by that factory or that land holding or whatever it happens to be, so that the capitalist can extract profit off of the backs of the exploited worker. And they call this wage slavery. Now, here's where things go sideways in reality, but we're going to continue on Marx's Science of History. Marx believed that the intrinsic contradictions of capitalism would eventually cause another rupture. And there's a funny way you can look at right now and say that this is what Marx was talking about, but there's always the ability to resurrect that this is what Marx was talking about. But Marx was not talking about this. Marx was specifically talking about the buildup of monopoly capital to the point where
It doesn't matter.
is so outrageous and so egregious
It doesn't
that
matter
the
in the
workers have no
slightest.
choice but to band together and revolt
It doesn't matter
internationally
because
to overthrow the
Marxism is
capitalist
what
structure and
Marxists
seize
do in
the
the
means
real
of
world.
production
These
through
things
violent
evolve and they
revolution
change.
and enter into a worker as government owned situation. When the government owns everything, that's called socialism. And the workers would then be the legitimate government, who would then own everything, having expropriated the expropriators, as Marx put it. In other words, his argument was that the capitalist, the big capitalist players expropriated people, artisans in particular, and small farmers from their small enterprises under feudalism, and conglomerated things into massive factories and made them work as wage slaves in bad conditions. And then now the workers turn on the capitalists and expropriate them. In other words, throw them out of power. And he says that this is going to be a violent revolution, and it's going to, however, be much faster and in some ways less brutal than the long protracted cruelty of the transition from feudalism to capitalism. So the reason I said it might look like today is because monopoly capital is supposed to start to look eventually like A, large multinational corporations, and then B, with very centralized ownership and control, I should say, and B, that in fact there's supposed to be a divorce of the commodity that's being produced from the capital entirely. In other words, the big financial markets go off and are doing their own thing completely divorced from what's actually happening within production. And there's a reason to believe that that's kind of happened. But here's how history went sideways before we come back to socialism and complete the loop. History went sideways because what happened in truth was, and this is a little dipping into the historical context that we need. What happened in truth was that the workers actually wanted reforms. They wanted reasonable working hours, reasonably safe working conditions, so that they're not risking life and limb, reasonably good or decent pay to be able to do this work. And they wanted, a reasonable working week, the 40-hour week that we now enjoy versus, 12-hour days or something like that, 6 or 7 days a week. And they wanted to have a work-life balance. In other words, they wanted labor reforms. And when they got them, what history has proved and what the critical Marxists later complained about is that they became conservative. They had stable, happy lives that they were proud of, and they didn't want a revolution anymore. They wanted reforms. Just like we see today then, we would also need reforms to our financial market to avoid financial cartels and monopolies, and we need reformation to our multinational corporate structure to prevent multinational monopolistic conglomerates. In a sense. But those things you could actually create a more fair economic system that would not look so much like the excesses of capitalism. Now, why is this Marx being wrong? Isn't Marx right? No, Marx is not right, because Marx called this capitalism. And I mean, I guess he's right about capitalism, but capitalism is not a true articulation of a market economy, which is actually what he's conflating. As capitalism, the belief that capital accumulation on its own is always a highest good, which is a straw man religion that Marx is criticizing, that produces, as you hear, monopoly capitalism. We saw that at the end of the 19th century. We see it again now, and we see similar problems, frankly, in both situations that Marx thought would lead to this rupture. What it actually leads to is the demand for reforms. Now, the communists would come out and say, hold on, that is actually just capitalism retrenching itself. That's interest convergence. It's keeping itself alive by giving away a little bit of socialism. But that's actually not what's going on. People just want reforms. And what they actually want is a relatively free market. They want a market economy in which they can participate. Now, Marx calls this, he talks about it under his theory of primitive accumulation, and he says under capital accumulation, this all goes away. So there's Marxist theory to deal with all of this, but it doesn't it's not right. He's not correct in how he's talking about these things, and he's been pretty thoroughly debunked about this, even though the point that he raises in the short term is actually kind of correct. Yes, there is primitive accumulation where you use your stuff to generate more stuff, and there's capital accumulation where you use capital and get other people to build your stuff for you. But that's exactly how we build to the actual good life. We actually need structures by which we are able to build an economy that can produce things that genuinely raise the standard of living. And this is a point that Marx actually understood himself, because he had this entire internal battle about crude communism, which was the hatred of private property, and capitalism, and then versus his own version of communism, which I call transcendent communism,
property and capitalism. He said it again.
Requires a qualitative change in who you are to treat the entire world like it's your family,
to say it.
And hence, like the tribal families at the beginning, to truly see yourself as a socialist, as a species being, a being that lives for the entire species.
James is teaching crude
so
communism.
That you can live out, as he put in the critique of the Goethe program.
When he teaches it. It's just crude when I teach it, right?
From each according to his ability, to each according to his needs, which, by the way, is bad economic theory. So why is Marx wrong about that? Because what we want is a market economy. We want the ability to be competitive. We want corporations that can amass sufficient resources to be able to produce marvels like iPhones and the microphone, and to produce them with economies of scale and with technologies that make them
See,
affordable
now
and
he's
accessible to
debunking Marx in
people.
the middle of
We
this, and
want
that misses
that.
the
That's a good
point.
life. That's
It
a high
doesn't
standard
matter
of
if
living.
he's right or
We
not. It
want
matters
that.
what they
But we
believe.
also want these corporations to remain competitive. So there's this internal inherent tension. I guess the Marxists would call it a contradiction, but that's a manageable and necessary tension, because what happens is in practice, when
Spaceman Dirk over
corporations
on
get
Rumble
big
says, "Is
enough in terms
Marxism
of
a
their
religion?"
market
No, it
share,
doesn't.
it
There are
is no
Marxists. There are
longer
many
beneficial
Marxists
for
who
them
are
to do
actually
research
religious.
and development and expensive
It
things
does
to
not replace
innovate and
religion.
move
That's a
forward.
conservative bullshit
It is
talking point.
more expensive, or more economical, I should say, less
They're not all
expensive for
atheist
them
guys. They're just not.
per unit to try to box competitors out of the market. And so that monopolization threshold is actually the question. And below that, if we find a way to manage corporations, like antitrust laws were pretty successful 100 years ago, something like that could work again. But we have to figure out how to apply them to multinational conglomerates. But keeping competition on the table while enabling the production of scale, and thus the enrichment of the people taking the risk in managing these things as a reward for shouldering that burden, is actually the tension in which we want to work in order to try to create a productive economy that actually can benefit the most people the most successfully. But Marx doesn't believe that. Marx believes it will intrinsically always go. There's no management system possible. Capital will always go to this disembodied form and this completely exploitative process, and then the workers will band together and revolt, which it turns out they don't. They want reforms, and they usually are not very easy to organize, as the cultural Marxists were struggling with.
What?
So
You
anyway,
think Marxists aren't
the
easy
point-
to organize?
all
James
that
doesn't
said
know what the
is that
fuck
this
he's
is
talking
supposed
about.
to revolt into
That's just
socialism, where
not true.
in practice, what's supposed to happen is that the corporations become extremely large and very few in number. They are in fact already run as totalitarian socialist production models, with the CEOs being the little dictators of each corporation. But there's only so many of them. In fact, there are probably very few at the latest stages of capitalism. And what you do, or what Marx says happens, is through this organization and revolt, the workers seize the means of production, keep the corporation more or less effectively intact, but now it's distributed ownership across the entire workforce, which is actually the entire workers' movement. So therefore, the workers in this megacorp and the workers in that megacorp are on the same team, and they share ownership between them, even in corporations that they don't work for. So you end up with this communal ownership, like I said, or social ownership through the state, where the state has erected itself in place of the capitalist production model.
Not the
And
capitalist
Marx's
state.
vision
Not
here
the
is that
capitalist
you
state.
don't land in crude
James
communism
hasn't
that
figured
way,
that
which
out
is
yet.
you can have a commune, but it's kind of a
They
mud
believe
hut
the current state
situation where
is the
everybody's doing
capitalist state. They want
backbreaking
to
work
dismantle
to
that.
get minimal reward, because they're trying to avoid private property, and there's all these problems that come
True.
up. And in this way, you can take all the benefits that you get from a fully fledged capitalist economy, and you just socialize the means of production and socialize the
We're
fruits.
slow
The
playing
problem
it,
is of
Trendle.
course,
Just
that it
relax.
doesn't work.
No insulting or anything.
But that's the vision. And so that socialism, because it's now run by awakened people who understand social production as opposed to private property, is no longer, in the words of Vladimir Lenin, who ran the Soviet Union first, who established and ran the Soviet Union for its first, I guess, 9 years. Vladimir Lenin called this a semi-state. It's a state in that it acts like
It's
a state,
not a
which means that it
capitalist
oppresses its
state.
class enemies, which would be the bourgeois people at this point, the former upper class, producing class. It oppresses its class enemies because that's what the state is for in Marxist theory, is to oppress your class enemies. They're very explicit about that. But it's not, because a state is a full-fledged, full-blooded state is supposed to exist for this expressed and specific purpose of maintaining the existing class structure. But the socialists have the correct class structure, and they have no need to maintain it. Once the expropriators are truly expropriated, in other words, once the former ruling class, once the capitalists, the bourgeoisie, are thoroughly destroyed by their dictator government, the dictatorship of the proletariat that it's called, once it's thoroughly smashed and destroyed, At that point, there will be no more state because there's no more need for a state because there's
more
no class enemy because
capitalist
everybody's in the
state.
same class,
No
everybody's
more
socialist,
capitalist
and everybody has
state.
the same
That's
idea
not the
about
same
how
thing.
society is supposed to work, from each according to his ability to each according to his need, and they can maintain their high level of production standards, at which point the state, as Marx put it, withers away of its own accord.
The capitalist
And when it withers away,
state.
what you're left with is a stateless, classless society that operates at the same high level of production as under capitalism, but with maximum leisure time, maximum, or I guess minimum requirement to work. I was going to say maximum freedom
does
from
not
the
have minimum
requirement
to work.
And like I said, no state, nothing has to govern it because everybody's on the same page. And the reason it's supposed to work is because, like I said
explicitly
before,
talk about a
everybody's
governance model,
one big
James.
happy family. And so, like I said, that whether you want to take it,
we've watched
let's do it
presentations where they're
properly.
talking
Let's
about
do
a
it with
governance model.
nations, because that's how it's
Their
always
meetings
going to
are
be.
their form of governance model.
Although the goal is global.
Wrong.
The idea would be that you start in primitive communism and you walk this path, this circle in a nation. Imagine it's like a circular staircase and you go up one floor, and at the top of that floor, you're now at a national, you have communism in a single nation like Soviet Union, or like the People's Republic of China, or North Korea, or Cuba. And then the idea is that that's supposed to spread to other countries one by one. You use the existing consolidated socialist state to leverage other states into socialism, to spark revolutions there to take them into socialism. And that's like walking them through another round up the stairs until you finally get global communism. So now you have, whether it's one turn of the screw or two, it doesn't matter. You start in communism, you walk through the history of productive forces, and you return to communism, at which point history ends. And that's an extraordinarily important concept because that is an eschatological concept. Eschatology is a theory of the end of the world, or end times in religions. And so Marxism is an eschatological faith. If you actually want a really good read on this, Murray Rothbard, the famous paleo-libertarian, wrote a very good long essay, 50 some odd pages, about how communism is an eschatological religion. And I recommend you go look it up. It's not hard to find, and read it. It is sparkling in its clarity that Marxism is an eschatological faith. Communism is its heaven, and its mechanism, its practice, its liturgy as a faith is the conflict theory of historical movement. In other words, that it seeks to obtain ultimate peace through generating and driving conflict between classes. Communism is its kingdom of God built on earth. It's heaven. And again, the way that works is stateless, classless, from each
He's
according to
again
his
trying to
ability,
make it
to each
into a
according to his
religion when
need.
it's not.
And it sees the difficulty in making this as a spiritual problem in people that has to be overcome.
No, James, it's not a spiritual problem. You're
It has
trying to
this
make it a
right
spiritual
idea,
problem
right,
because
that
you're
we're gonna
obsessed with
distribute stuff,
Gnosticism.
but people don't want to do that. People aren't motivated to work for other people's benefit, and especially when the work is bad or grueling, not too much anyway. They want something of
please
their
stop
own,
talking about
and
the
it's
Jews.
not adequate.
Please
so what
stop.
they see that is a spiritual failing in the people that need to be overcome.
I do not co-sign that, and you're making us all fucking look
so
bad.
What
Please
this
stop.
should really be described as, though, frankly, and I think bluntly, is that the communists believe that we were, through the creation of private property, there is no God, right? We ejected ourselves from Eden in our small tribes, which were still at a very low level, but we could get back into Eden at a very high level on our own terms by building it here for ourselves. And in defiance of God, we enter back into Eden, which is called communism. So let's turn our attention to Marx's economic philosophic manuscripts from 1844. This is 4 years before the Communist Manifesto. Actually, one more point about the Communist Manifesto. The second chapter is actually about how it's all supposed to work. And the point that he drills down is, what is communism? He says that communism can be understood in a single sentence, which isn't technically a sentence the way he wrote it.
The abolition of private property.
Translation's bad and from the German.
The abolition of private
property. It actually says abolition
because he's not fucking talking about the Jews.
A sentence, but abolish private property as a command is, and so.
Yes,
the goal
on my
of
fucking chat, you will follow
Marxism
my
is
fucking
to
rules. He is
unmake
not
the fall
talking
of
about
man
the
to return
Jews.
to Eden, which is communism. And you do that by abolishing the concept of private property. I don't have to get into the details of how he's got some cockamamie scheme where you get rid of private property and you replace it by, which has the fundamental right to exclude, and you replace it with individual property,
By
which
the
is
way,
the stuff that you're using. It's effectively the same as private property,
no,
except
it's not.
there's no fundamental
No, it's
right to
not.
exclude.
No, it's not. No, it's not. James does not know the difference between private property and personal property. He does not know what bourgeois property means. James is saying the defining characteristic of private property is that it has the right to exclude. That's actually not the primary. I don't give a flying fuck. He has not talked about the Jews in over an hour, and now you are being disruptive, and this is counter-fucking-productive. If you keep it up, I'm banning you from my chat. You are following my fucking rules. You are representing me. Everything you say in that chat blows back on me. It doesn't blow back on you because you're an anonymous fucking coward on the internet. It blows back on me. So shut the fuck up, and if you're not going to follow my rules, get the fuck out. Now, as I was saying, James does not understand the difference between private bourgeois property and personal property. The defining characteristic of private property is not that it is exclusionary. The defining characteristic of private bourgeois property is that it allows you to generate personal wealth. It is the generation of personal wealth that is what creates the inequities. That is what creates the hierarchies. That is what James is not telling you.
Which tells you where it was written, which
All
is
right,
in Paris.
bye.
But the point,
Banning
I'm
you
only
now,
going to draw
bye.
one point out of EPM.
I swear to
out of
God,
Economic
this is why we
Philosophical
don't fuck
Manuscript,
around with the
which
Jewish
is that
shit.
Marx delineates between
This right
crude
here.
communism, which is low
You have
level and
assholes on
junky.
the internet that
It's a
just can't
forced
fucking help
commune,
themselves.
and everybody lives in a shithole country, versus what he calls transcendent communism, which clearly makes it a religion. And so he specifically says that the goal of communism is not crude communism. It is not merely to hate private property. It is not merely to seize the means of production or whatever else. It is, in fact, he says, when you do that, these people don't eat. These are people that do that are so low level they don't even have anything to share amongst everybody. So they don't even know what it means to be a communist. And so he shuns crude communism, but that means you have to take capitalists into the socialist environment, into the communist environment from there. And that, he says, requires you to transcend private property, which is explicitly a religious concept. He says
what the
that
fuck, James? No,
communism
it's not.
is the positive
private property
transcendence
is
of private
defined
property
as your ability to own a home, land, an apartment rental, a business, intellectual property, parental rights, and individual
his
liberties.
true social, which is to say his
Private
true
property
human
is what
nature.
allows you
So
to
mankind's
amass
true nature
personal
is,
wealth.
Being human means being
Can
a
someone
socialist.
say that in the chat?
And
Doesn't Marx
communism
define
as a
bourgeois
transcendence
property
of private property, in
as
other words,
what
leaving the
allows you
private
to
part
create
behind,
personal
like I
wealth?
just explained, or turning around that spiral and elevating a level where you had
James is
private
just
property and now
making all
you
this
can't
up.
exclude people from it because it's shared
It's
ownership.
not about
and
exclusion.
It's commonwealth
It's about
property.
the generation
that
of
transcendence
personal,
that makes us all
private
treat each other
wealth.
across the entire
That
species
is what creates
as
the
one happy
inequities, you
family
moron.
that shares everything that we have like a family would. That is how he defines communism properly. And it is down to a true qualitative change in who you are. Karl Marx is very clear that he talks about somebody who's truly
Current
awakened
Marxists
to
don't
their
believe any of this.
social
James is spiraling
nature.
way
In other
the
words,
fuck out of
they've
the
awakened
reservation.
that the gnosis of being.
This is not what current
This
Marxists
is a
talk about
Gnostic
at all.
faith. I've talked
But
about that
I
in the
don't see it
past. I'm not
showing
going to
up.
belabor it here. The gnosis of being is that we're socialist. Our true being that we've been alienated from by the external power is socialist. That's a Gnostic sentence.
I don't see it showing
Okay,
up,
and
Bob.
that's the core sentence of Marxism. And when you
see it?
awaken to who you really are as a socialist, it's like
I did see
having
it.
new organs, new eyes, new ears,
you.
new sense, new skin, new everything, new taste. And he compares it to being able to tell the difference between pleasant sounds and beautiful music. When your ear is transformed because you learn
If
to
whoever
understand
is
the
talking
higher
about
culture
Hitler is in my
of
chat,
great
please
music.
cut that
you
shit
hear
out.
the music differently.
I
you
disavow
hear everything
anyone talking
differently.
about Hitler
He says
over
it's
there.
like that. It's like awakening to a true social nature. And in fact, you now have a human eye, a human ear, which perceives your true human, which is to say social nature and everything. So you have not just a new set of organs by which you perceive the world. You have, or in other words, a new worldview. you also have a new perception of the world itself, that the world itself was meant for and made for humans, to be made by humans, to be more fit for human use. And when we say humans every time, we mean humans as a collective across the universal experience of humanity. And so the goal of Marxism is, in this transcendent sense, is to transcend the fall of man as the introduction of private property and the fundamental right to exclude others from private property. In other words, to make slaves, as they would phrase it in Marxism, whatever kind you want to call it, whether it's actual slaves, whether it's bonded servants, or whether it's wage slaves, as they phrase this. The goal is to transcend all of the basis of that, which is private property.
I don't see an
in order to return to our true human nature as socialists, to realize who we really were all along until private property came like an evil spirit and deluded us as like sin into a fallen, competitive
Marxists
state
do
trapped
not say
in the
this.
walls of history. We don't get to get. We're not in the primitive Eden, and we can't get to the future Eden or to heaven.
James is saying that private property is the original sin.
We can't
this
escape
is him
the
doing mental
material
gymnastics
bondage
to
of
make
our
this all
lives
seem Gnostic
until
when
we
it's not.
all wake up and realize that we were actually socialists to begin with, and have been estranged by that, by the siren's call or the demiurgic lure of private property and the ability to exclude other people, and thus, by the way, the ability to see one another as individuals. Individualism is at the bottom of Marx's problem with capitalism. Individualism is at the bottom of his problem with private property ownership.
It's not.
The fundamental right to exclude.
You can't have capitalism and private property ownership without individualism.
Then there's a difference between you and me. We are not part of the same
because
program.
Individualism creates the inequities.
Interests. We each have our own lives, and we're living for ourselves and not for one another.
True.
Which, of course, grifters would exploit, which is why we can't live that way in part. Okay? So the goal of Marxism then is to, as a religion, is to undo the fall.
Yeah,
the fall
James is full
the
of shit.
introduction of the fundamental right to exclude, or other words, private property, and the ability to see ourselves as individuals separate from one another. It's about the fall of man,
guys.
And thus,
abolishing
if we
private
do that,
property
we're
is
allowed
about
to
the
return
fall
to
of
Eden
man.
on our own terms in open defiance of God, which they conveniently deny in order to be able to do
there
that.
are religious
That's
communists,
Marxism.
James.
So what's the historical context? I
They're
already
not
gave
all
you some hint
atheists.
about
That's
this,
bullshit.
But the short version is it didn't work anywhere. From 1848, when Marx published Communist Manifesto, through 1867, when he published the first volume of Capital, through, frankly, 1917, when Lenin led the revolution in Russia, communism didn't take off anywhere. Marx had an evangelistic model for communism. His model was go among the workers.
Look,
and what
James'
were you
audience,
supposed to do when you went among the workers?
Listening.
Agitate.
He's going
you were supposed to convince the workers of their class consciousness. You were supposed to agitate them to believe that they were being exploited, and that if they were to band together as a single unit, they could overthrow their bosses and take control and share ownership of everything.
You have not read Marx. Does not mean he never wrote it. Most Marxists like you never read your prophet. They think that a Groyper is a Marxist.
No way that would happen.
James's audience is so retarded.
That was the idea. Go among the workers and agitate them about their conditions. So he went around and sowed discontent. Why would he do that, by the way? Well, A, because it works. It's divide and conquer. But B, most importantly, if you want a revolution, you better get some angry revolutionaries, destabilized revolutionaries.
Oh my God.
But B, he would do that not just because it's a conflict-driven theory of history, like we already said, of class antagonism, but because the model is actually based on suffering. That what brings you to your social consciousness is actually suffering. And the reason Marx is so antagonistic to religions that aren't communism, which is why he starts with the criticism of religion, and he starts with atheism, and he starts with religion is the opiate of the masses, which he wrote in 1843, even earlier than the EPM. Because of that, religion hides your suffering from you. It makes your suffering bearable. It allows you to forbear a difficult world, even though it's difficult. In other words, if we look at it from the perspective of Genesis, we've been cast out of the garden and out of bliss, and we have to suffer in the world. And religion is what fills in so that we don't mind our suffering and don't overthrow the masters who are making us suffer. Now, Marx rejects the existence of God as a materialist. So we're not trying to overthrow God, although he actually explicitly said that's exactly what he's trying to do. TBH, to be completely honest.
Then why
That's
are
exactly
there
what he's trying to do.
Marxists today
The goal
that
now
are
is to
not
overthrow.
atheists,
It's now a
James?
social program.
It's
The
almost
gods
like
are the upper
there's a
ruling
difference
classes of
between the
society, and you're going to
philosophy
overthrow them
and the real
to take
world.
over. But you awaken to your consciousness of who you really are, which is a socialist, through suffering the
No, you
exploitation
awaken to the
of not living
consciousness
under
that you're
socialism.
oppressed by
So the
capitalism.
upper class cannot possibly gain the awareness without maybe lots of listening sessions, as
Wrong.
they call them today.
Wrong.
They cannot possibly gain the awareness of why there needs to be this fundamental revolt.
That's completely wrong. That's completely wrong. James just said the upper class cannot awaken to class consciousness. That is not true. We've specifically heard Marxists say on many occasions that it's not just the workers who are oppressed by capitalism, that everyone is oppressed by capitalism, and everyone can be awoken to the fact that we are all oppressed by capitalism. Everyone. They believe that the bourgeois is also oppressed by capitalism. They believe that the bourgeois can wake up to the fact that they are also oppressed by the system that we are in, and this is why does James not understand that there are a lot of rich liberal Marxists? Not liberal. They're not liberal, actually. They would reject that. That was a misspeak on my part. Does James not realize the fact that there are a lot of rich elitist Marxists? The reason there are is because they've awoken to the class consciousness.
And so he needs suffering. So why would you go among the workers and agitate them? Because maybe their lives are hard, but they need to suffer because of their lives being hard. There is no forbearance. There is no, this is the way it is. There is no, let's try to work for some reforms. There is, we need to understand our suffering and revolt against that which is causing it.
Can someone,
and the
can
model
someone
for
say,
the revolt is literally that
look in the chat.
Again, we look at
Wokists
Genesis,
don't have to be aware of what their sorcerers, controllers are trying to do. James's audience really thinks.
And so
James's audience really thinks that that Marxists and socialist activists today are not aware of what Marx was trying to do. That's what they think, because James has lied to them. Can someone say in the chat, isn't the goal of awakening people to class consciousness to overthrow capitalism?
Is rise up like Satan or Lucifer and strike down this false god and establish yourself as who you really are, which is your own God ruling over your own kingdom. But that kingdom is worldly, and therefore it's a collectivist
200-year-old dead
kingdom
guy
of
is
all
not a
people.
controller.
So anyway, the point is Marx's model
True.
his evangelism model didn't work for this religion. It did not spur, I should say. I've gotten in the habit of sitting around people who use that word wrongly too often. It did not spur a movement of workers that could organize, or especially self-organize, and take over.
If James is correct that the bourgeois can't wake up to class consciousness, there would be no
workers of the world
wealthy
unite
Marxists,
wasn't going
and that's
to
just
get
not true.
anywhere, as it turned out, and especially at the beginning of the 20th century, as you started to have massive conflict in Europe breaking out. Not that that ever went away, but as the First World War, the Great War loomed, you had a major problem. You had people diving into national identities, whether they were workers or not, and they were much more concerned about being German or Italian or Russian or British or American than they were about being workers or socialists. They were much more concerned with other identities that were much more close to home and meaningful. And so two solutions to this problem arose through the time of the Great War, World War I. One was Vladimir Lenin's solution in so-called Eastern Marxism, which was the vanguard model, which is a shepherd model. Lenin believed that only the best theoreticians can actually lead. The proles are too stupid to do it for themselves, so only the best theoreticians can shepherd people through. They become a vanguard of the revolution, and they're going to become a vanguard government that will shepherd people into communism. They will force the people to go in, and through what Marx called the inversion of praxis, or socialization, people would be socialized by that dictatorship under their power. The vanguard party becomes the Bolsheviks in Russia. The vanguard party becomes the Communist Party, the ruling party, and they will then force socialization into socialism for the entire population.
Like, they're like, have you listened to much of James's
vanguard
stuff? Yeah,
shepherding model is being recreated in the West now under the brand name of stakeholder capitalism, which has created a ESG, environmental social
Oh
governance
God!
scoring.
Here is where
Soviet,
he
actually,
conflates the
Soviet
WEF and the
mechanism.
Radical
Soviet means
Revolutionary
ruling
Socialists.
council or
They're not
governing
the same
council.
thing.
Referred to the workers' councils. Now we have expert councils, but it's the same thing. So Lenin's Vanguard model, ironically, one of the banks is called
Look,
Vanguard.
they were
as a matter
they
of fact,
weren't
it's
real
running
Catholics.
this
They
scam.
were they were fake
It's
Catholics.
called stakeholder capitalism or stakeholder Soviet, and I've talked about that in a different podcast. But the idea is that some enlightened experts are going to have to usher all the idiots through it because they won't self-organize and they don't understand it well enough. And it's going to be the top theoreticians who understand the big picture of what we're doing and why. In other words, what the communists want better than anybody else who's going to run it. And that actually worked at taking over the feudal society. And I stress that, feudal society, not capitalist society of Tsarist Russia. And so Lenin was successful in implementing effectively a gigantic world power crude communist state, but he was, even in his attempts to industrialize and Stalin's further attempts to industrialize, he was never able to, as he would refer to it, unleash the productive forces adequately to create a first world nation. In fact, they were considered second world nations.
James is off his
in
fucking
the first,
rocker
second,
if
third
he
world
thinks that
model of
communists and
nations.
Marxists today
And so
are trying to implement
Lenin's Vanguard
a
model was one
Gnostic
solution
utopia.
to the fact that the workers wouldn't organize.
I'm really starting
but in
to
the
think
West,
that he
that
believes
didn't
this.
happen, and part of it is because they didn't have the capacity to roll capitalists over the way that they were able to roll feudalists over. Lenin was able, through brutal methods that we are all aware of and military power that we can speculate upon, but he was also able to go around and get huge peasant and worker support by promising bread and land. You don't have bread, you don't have land, I can make sure you have both. Of course, those were lies. Everybody starved and everybody lost all their land to the state. And it turns out that state ownership and common ownership are not the same thing. And it was a catastrophe. But you couldn't pull that on capitalist countries. Britain wasn't getting fooled into bread and land. Most people had bread and land. We don't need you. Certainly America wasn't going to fall for that. Germany wasn't going to fall for that. They had to end up being forced. The Eastern Bloc got forced into communism by Soviet power after the Soviet Union was established through Lenin's ironically named anti-imperialism campaign that was meant to spread the Soviet Union to the entire globe. Now, the Western model, therefore, had to be different, and that's where cultural Marxism comes in. I know that I took a lot longer to introduce this. I don't even want to look and see how much longer I intended, like 25 minutes. Oh my God, an hour. Welcome to James Lindsay. Here we are. So this is where the Western cultural model comes in, and this is how we, down the line, we don't get to stakeholder capitalism, we get to woke. Okay, but you'll notice that
we haven't even gotten
here
to
we
woke
have
yet.
stakeholder
Okay.
capitalism using woke. So the Western
Okay.
model and the Eastern model have
All right.
come back together. The S in
No,
ESG, the
wrong.
social in ESG,
Wrong.
environmental
Marxists
social governance.
denounce
The
Mao.
G is Sovietism. The E is obviously the climate change environmental stuff and net zero and absolute zero and degrowth. But the S is social justice or woke. And so cultural Marxism is going to get plugged back
He's
into
saying
this
that ESG
roughly
is what
a century later.
introduced woke.
But what's happening here during
Wrong.
the World War I
Completely wrong,
period, and I'm
James.
saying
No, that's
period
not
because
correct.
I don't mean strictly during the war.
Are you
I
shitting
mean,
me?
roughly the decade
James
in
thinks
which
that
that war
woke wasn't a thing
occurred.
until ESG.
Early 1910s to the middle 1920s. Let's go with that, right? That's where cultural Marxism really takes off. This is, narrowly speaking, cultural Marxism is to be defined as Western Marxist thought from the 1910s to the 1930s. That's the narrow definition. This is the seeds of woke, okay? And like I
Not of
said, we started with a
ESG.
historical note and a disclaimer, but this is a real historical thing that really occurred, however much they want to try to cover it up by alleging it's an anti-Semitic conspiracy theory. The narrow understanding of cultural Marxism, bearing the name cultural Marxism, was Western Marxism as it was practiced overwhelmingly in Europe from the 1910s through the 1930s. We can expand that to add in
Yes.
the critical Marxism of the
Leninism.
Frankfurt School, which is actually
Yes.
heavily derived directly from this same
From
movement,
Lenin.
which extended roughly, we'll say,
And
from
the
the 1930s to the
Bolsheviks.
1970s.
True.
And we can go even more broadly to include woke Marxism, which is still going on to present. So there's a
True.
very good reason why we can use the term cultural Marxism to describe everything
So
from
this is just
the
about
beginnings of
justifying
Western
James
Marxism,
being
although
on the
that's the
Southern
better
Poverty
term.
Law Center list.
Western Marxism in the 1910s all
That's
the way
it?
through to the present day. But narrowly speaking, we're focusing on what was going on from the 1910s to the 1930s. And I'm going to have to do an appendix on this to
Oh
talk
my
about,
God.
briefly talk about the Fabian socialists, which were happening in Britain starting in the 1880s. So a little earlier. It's another socialist movement. It is explicitly non-revolutionary, so it is not Marxist. But we can't understand really how the cultural Marxist phenomenon has played out without understanding Fabian socialism, which is named for the Fabian Society or the Fabian Socialist Society,
Again,
which, like I said, was
the biggest problem with James's work is that James relies on philosophy that was written 100 to 200 years ago to ascertain what is going on in the world today. I will never say that philosophy did not lay a foundation of this. However, what real Marxist and socialist activists are doing in the real world today is not hinged in to what James Lindsay is saying, because life is actually more complicated than that, and it morphed into something else. That is what gain of function Marxism is. It morphed into a more extreme, more radical version than what Marx ever intended, and it has nothing to do with religion. It has nothing to do with fucking Gnosticism. It has nothing to do with the original sin of private property. All of the religious bullshit is stuff that James has made up in order to appeal to the wine moms in Moms for Liberty. I only care what real people are doing in the real world today. And if what real people are doing in the real world today is fundamentally unhinged from what James is talking about, then just tough fucking cookies.
Like, what happens when you inject the socialist mindset and this German idealist framework, and in fact French Romantic framework, into kind of a hyper crony capitalist situation where the state and the corporations, at least economically speaking, get married to one another. It has other aspects outside of the economic sphere that I'm not really going to go into. In fact, anti-Marxism is one of them. Rampant nationalism is one of them. Usually it's ethno-nationalism. But there are other characteristics. But economically speaking, it is where you basically, the state enables the rise of an oligarchy of monopolies, or an oligopoly is the fancy word for that. And they are de facto state entities, although they are owned by private interests who are allowed to become very rich off of them. And you say, well, that sounds like China. Yes, China has a new system called One Country, Two Systems. I talked about it in a recent podcast called 21st Century Communism, or Communism 3.0, one or the other, both actually. Communism 3.0, I think, is the long one, where I talk about the Deng Xiaoping model, which has taken the basic spirit of communism
Marxism
as
is not a
theoretical
religion.
Political theory,
and
then
so
it
someone
has incorporated
someone in James's chat is saying James wants to get Marxism banned in schools by labeling it officially as a religion because it is one. No. First of all, it's not a religion. There are Marxist activists that are religious, separate from Marxism. If everyone thinks that Marxists are all atheists, then you have been lied to by James and retarded conservative influencers. That's just not true. I have heard multiple communist activists at private events that I've been to undercover in person talking about their religion. However, number two, here's actually the more important thing. Do you know why Marxism will never be considered a religion and never banned in schools, even if it is? Even if James gets what he wants and Marxism gets dubbed a religion in the United States, do you know why it will never be banned in schools? Because of the Christians. The Christians don't want religion banned in schools. And if they ban one religion in schools, that means you ban Christianity in schools. The Christians will never allow religion to be fully banned in schools. Therefore, the Christians wouldn't even advocate for Marxism to be banned in schools if it was a religion, because if Marxism got banned in schools, that means Christianity would be too. James doesn't tell you that.
Communist history that was immediately smuggled to Moscow somehow when he died in 1937 in that prison. But anyway, Antonio Gramsci has kind of a handful of ideas that kind of define what cultural Marxism is about. He's usually considered the father of cultural Marxism. I did a podcast about him a long time ago. It was very popular.
He was
I think it's one of the most popular ones I ever did.
The Institutions,
it was
or the namer of it anyway.
Early in my days, so I apologize for any early thought, we'll call it, inaccuracy, I guess. But the biggest idea that Gramsci has is this concept of cultural hegemony. His analysis is that Western culture is very good at producing, in effect, a force field of cultural norms and values that works like it's just how it is. Like, be normal, That's how the queer theorists would see it. So the queering means defying cultural hegemony. As a matter of fact, diversity means diverse to cultural hegemony.
No.
So outside of cultural hegemony, that's why you can be a
Cultural hegemony
Marxist,
means
or you could
capitalism.
be like angry
Doesn't
indigenous Native American
someone
who's
say in the
claiming
chat,
their
queer
original
liberation means the
beliefs,
annihilation of
or you could
capitalism.
be a Muslim or whatever you want that's going after.
According to the Mary Nardini gang, queer liberation means the annihilation of capitalism. Someone please say that in the chat.
Culture. So cultural hegemony is the problem.
Queer
and Gramsci says
liberation
that cultural
means the
hegemony is
annihilation of
preventing
capitalism,
people.
according to the Mary Nardini
it's
gang.
producing a culture of capitalism that's preventing people from being willing to go
culture of
socialist. They're not
capitalism.
willing to risk
Oh,
it all in
there
a
it is.
revolution. They're not willing to dedicate
almost like
themselves
James
to this
knows.
revolutionary idea. He knew Lenin. He wrote with Lenin, corresponded with Lenin, but he didn't agree with Lenin about everything. In particular, he also warned Lenin about Stalin and did not like Stalin one bit. But at any rate, Gramsci said that cultural hegemony is in a capitalist country is what actually has to be, I would say, overcome, but the right word is undercome.
Well done, guys. Let's see if they
to
leave
turn
those
a
comments
phrase,
up.
because the idea he came up with is actually cultural infiltration. You go to the where does culture come from? That's his question. And he says, well, institutions produce and promote culture, and he named 5 of them. The 5 culture producing and promoting institutions were family, religion, education, media, and law, with a special emphasis on education. Education was more important than the others, in his opinion. Family was the hardest. Media and law are actually downstream, and religion in some sense is actually even downstream from education. So family becomes this kind of weird one that's difficult, that you have to kind of get at from a different angle. And then the others can be captured through education. So education gets a very special prominence. But the idea was that what you're going to do is enter into these culture-producing institutions and establish what he called a counter-hegemony. In other words, you're going to bring Marxist understanding into these culture-producing institutions so that they, like a virus, right? So you go into the cell is no longer producing new, say, liver cells. It's now producing virus parts that are going to go out, and the cell dies, and those virus parts go out, assemble into viruses, and infect more cells. That was his idea. It's literally the model of a virus, whereas, Lenin had just taken over by force, in literally a military coup. And so this idea of counter-hegemony was that it later became called the Long March through the Institutions, is that you would go into the institutions and create a new cultural set of values in the culture-producing institutions and let it emanate out to soften up the existing culture to a socialist turn, and then a socialist revolution could follow. That was his model. And like I said, the goal was to infiltrate the institutions of family, religion, education, media, and law, and transform them from within to soften up for socialism. His kind of his more famous remarks that's frequently misquoted on the internet. It adds a part Gramsci didn't say. The short part is true. The rest is not Gramsci. There's a very famous meme that's gone around attributing this whole thing to Gramsci. I don't remember how it goes because it's not true. But the true part says that socialism is precisely the religion that must overwhelm Christianity. So I want to draw your attention to the fact that he said it's a religion, and B, that it must overwhelm, which would be, in my use, undermine or undercome religion. Okay, religion, Christianity specifically, as a bulwark of Western values and a basis, a foundation of Western values.
It matters that they're asked.
And the way that he saw that this was going to happen, it's a very important concept for our experience. Again, cultural Marxism is the seeds of woke that we're dealing with today, is through what are called organic intellectuals. So the idea was that where Lenin was using these highly trained theoreticians, ideally university-trained theoreticians, Gramsci was like, no, they're not the ideal educators. They're not the ideal intellectuals. What we need is workers. We need workers who have, ding ding, suffered. We need people not that studied this stuff in the ivory tower. We need people who have suffered in their lived experience. And so the concept of lived experience as a superior form of understanding and knowledge ultimately derives not in exact verbiage, but in concept Gramsci and his need for organic intellectuals.
We want to make sure we
organic
still have
intellectuals
accounts
were
for the big
who
finale.
were exposed to Marxist
Okay, that's enough about queer.
interpretations
He's
of
moved
the
on from queer now,
concepts,
so let's stop
or of
talking
their
about it.
experiences, I should say, to generate what we would now call lived experience of their suffering.
Only put in
in other words,
stuff
a
that's
Marxist
relevant to what he's saying, guys. Do
phenomenology
not put
of
stuff
their
that's not relevant.
circumstances as
That
workers,
makes
as
us look
exploited
bad. It
workers,
doesn't make him look
who
bad.
would
It makes
then
us
become
look bad.
intellectuals and educators to create this counter hegemony by going in among the culture producing institutions. So they would organically be insinuated into the different institutions they were trying to infect, but they would carry with them the fact that their knowledge was street knowledge mixed with book interpretation. It wasn't book knowledge, it was street knowledge colored through Marxist theory. And for those of you who've paid attention to me for a long time and you know all about my Paulo Freire stuff, where he's talking about the process of conscientization and that everything has to be in a generative theme, so on, has to be relevant to the learner, it has to connect to his real life concrete experience.
Thank you.
That's
Raven's
him
Poetry. I
channeling
appreciate it.
Gramsci's organic
We'll do a nice
intellectual
big finale
concept.
around
But
this
now
theme
everybody
of
under
telling
Freire
people to
becomes an
listen to me.
organic intellectual. We'll come back to Paulo Freire later. The second major
But everyone has to
cultural
have an account
Marxist,
to
and
do
I'm going
that.
to talk less about cultural Marxism than you think, given that this is the basics of cultural Marxism, is a Hungarian Marxist by the name of George Lukács. Now, George is spelled in a way
This
you
is a
probably aren't
horrible
familiar with
introductory course to
if you are
Marxism, by
not
the way.
used to Hungarian
No one's
spelling,
gonna
which
remember
I'm
this.
certainly not, but it is, if you're looking him up,
My teaching methods are way, way better. I gotta get my course online for
GY
an
is
on-demand
pronounced a
thing,
bit
I
like a
think.
J in Hungarian, apparently. And if I'm wrong, I don't care.
But that's gonna have to
Then
wait till after the
Lukács
election.
is spelled Lukacs. So you
have
can
to
look him
wait.
up if you want to look him up. He's very famous for a book he published in 1923, probably his magnum opus, but he wrote a lot. And that book was called History and Class Consciousness. He had two major ideas worth touching upon in that book. One is the concept of social reification, which he develops primarily in the 4th chapter of the book. And the general idea of social reification is that which we are socialized into is real. We can make things real, or things are made real in our lives through social processes. And that, in fact, can be used to create an illusion, or it can be used to drive people toward the truth. So if Marxists try to socialize people into something, they are socially reifying Marxist theory. And if the capitalists are controlling things, they are socially reifying capitalist ideas and making people believe that they're just fundamental aspects of reality. So if you think that competition is a natural mode of production, and improvement and innovation, and that scarcity leads to the need for innovation and thus innovation, and that a profit motive enables people to benefit from taking the risk of stepping out of what
So
is
true.
into something that might actually be innovative,
I'd have no idea either.
then you have had those ideas reified or made real. You believe those are features of economic reality, when in fact they are merely social constructs. So the social construct on the critical
Oh.
theory side, which is not the postmodern side, comes down in this regard
Critical theory
from
and
George
postmodernism?
Lukács.
Okay.
He also has a concept that I think is much more important to pay attention to, which is the educability of consciousness. In other words, you learn class consciousness in stages. And those stages
Oh my
are
God.
kind of, in essence, and I do this better and worse sometimes, so I don't know what's about to come out of my mouth. First, you
Very
have to
professional,
indicate to
James.
people that they are part of a class.
True.
They have to understand that they are workers, or that they
True.
are people of color, or whatever it happens to be, that they have a class identity.
True.
That's the first step. So you're going to, instead of just trying to go among the workers and agitate them and then tell them Marxist theory like Marx suggested, now we're going to educate them step by step into class. Hey, look, you're in a class. In other words, you have a group identity is step one. And then secondly, that class is oppressed. You are under oppression. You are getting a bad shake in life. So now that's the agitation part. Remember, I guess I didn't say it here, but I have in the Lenin podcasts. Lenin believed in what was he called agitation and propaganda, agitprop, and taking the agitation and propaganda, or agitprop, into every class in society. And he differed from Marx by saying that Marx only took it to the workers, and no, you have to take it to everybody. And that's why DEI doesn't just train the underclasses, so to speak. It trains everybody and induces lots of upper class guilt through agitation and propaganda.
Because
well, here
all
the idea was
classes
that
can
you're going to go
become
in and
aware
teach
of
these
class
people that they are
consciousness, James.
suffering as a result
You
of
just
being in an
contradicted
oppressed
yourself
class.
from
Hey,
earlier.
look, classes. Society is stratified into classes. There is an upper class of your betters, and then there's you, and they're cheating you, they're exploiting you. That's where the agitation part comes in. So we're not all the way to the agitation propaganda in all levels of society, but we're going to teach people class consciousness here, is what George Lukács is saying. So you teach them that they're part of a class. In other words, they have a group identity, and that's the most meaningful part about them. And that group is in fact
True.
oppressed, and that oppression is part of a dynamic, is the third step, and that dynamic is a dynamic of oppression. You cannot have oppression without an oppressor, and you cannot have an oppression without an oppressed. So the two classes become oppressor and oppressed, just like the first page of the Communist Manifesto.
True.
And that's an intrinsic dynamic. In fact, it is a class antagonism that drives the movement of history. Hence this book being called History and Class Consciousness. And so you're going to awaken this sense in them. And then you have to convince them that solidarity is necessary because, in fact,
What does
because of
solidarity
this
mean,
dynamic,
James?
because it's a dynamic, they are players in the game.
What does
The
solidarity mean?
rules are not all made by the ruling class.
Solidarity means seeing
as a matter
yourself
of
as
fact.
part of the collective.
They are players in the game. There's the history is moving through a dynamic of oppression. This is how you get to class consciousness, what it means to be who you
that
are
is class
in your group
consciousness, James.
class
It's not
identity.
how you get to it. It
that
is
there's a
it.
dynamic of history that's moving everything, and you, whether you wanted to be or not, whether you like
James
it or
hasn't even
not,
said the
are
word
a
hierarchy in
participant
this
in
entire.
that.
Will
But
James
if
say
you're
the
a
word
participant,
hierarchy?
that means you're on the game board. That means
'Cause
you can
socialists say
change
hierarchy
something.
all the time.
But because you're oppressed and in a weakened position versus the ruling class, the only thing that you can do in order to fight the rulers is to band together. It's sort of like the logic of unions. You have to syndicate. You have to band together in order to incorporate people power versus managerial power. But in this case, it's underclass versus overclass. The underclass has to band together to overthrow the relatively small number of exploiters at the top. And then, only then, do you actually have successfully educated somebody into class consciousness, or they actually have class consciousness. So you're part of a class. That class is oppressed. Oppression is a part of a dynamic. That means it's a part of the movement of history, and you're a player on the board, and you have an obligation to band together in solidarity to overthrow it. And then you've awoken class consciousness. And the challenge in the end of chapter 3, where George Lukács talks about this, the challenge is that once you awaken that class consciousness, it doesn't tend to go away. So the last battle to be fought, think about how spiritual this sounds, is for the proletariat to destroy itself as a class, is to overcome itself and to seize the means of production and stop thinking of itself as a class in the same moment that it does. And that rarely happens, thus causing some of the dramatic abuses that were already by 1923 being witnessed in Soviet regimes in Eastern Europe and in the Soviet Union. So this is where all of a sudden this idea that we're going to awaken people into a consciousness deliberately and in steps. In other words, how are these organic intellectuals taking the institution of education and then infiltrating into the other institutions going to produce that counter hegemony? Not by going among the workers, but by a structured educational program of teaching people to think in terms of corporate identity in an oppressor-oppressed dynamics. In other words, Marxist religion, and then to get them to believe that they are historical change makers in that dynamic by their very nature, or by the very nature, in fact, of the dynamic itself. They are part of the production of history, and thus they have to do this. And so the educability of class consciousness and a model for graduating it in stages and putting it into, say, schools or into workplace training is outlined for the first time by George Lukács in 1923. And so he's really, in a very operant sense, the father of cultural Marxism in practice, whereas Antonio Gramsci is more kind of the father of cultural Marxism in theory. And if you want to read the prison notebooks, I encourage you. I don't even have the full version. I have an abridged version. The full version was translated at Notre Dame in 1970 by a man with a funny last name, Joseph Buttigieg. He has a famous son named Secretary
Peter. Yeah, that's because you said something that wasn't
Buttigieg,
relevant, which I asked you not to do.
Who is the Secretary of Transportation right now, in case you wonder about Marxist infiltration into our government.
Listen, guys.
Red diaper.
There is a reason that I give you the guidelines that I give you. If you say something that is not relevant directly to what he's saying, even if it's technically correct, you're probably going to get banned. You have got to keep your, if you're not just going to follow my lead and say the things that I ask you to say, I'm not telling you you can't say your own things. I'm not telling you can't do that. But what I am saying is that if you go off the reservation and you say things that are not directly relevant to what he's saying, they're probably going to ban you. And there's reasons that I say this. I'm not trying to be mean. I'm trying to tell you what's required to not get banned.
Known not as the Fabian Society, although that's a very famous name. It is more famously known by a name that is not often attached directly to the Fabian Society, which is INGSOC, I-N-G-S-O-C. And if you are literary enough, you will recognize that that's the totalitarian government in 1984 by George Orwell, because George Orwell was pestered all the time by the Fabians to join, and he hated them, and he wouldn't. And so since the Fabian Society was invented in 1884 or founded in 1884, he decided to imagine a century of Fabian growth in power until they had the power of Stalin, and wrote a book about that, a warning book about that called 1984. Isn't that interesting? And called the bad guy organization INGSOC, which is an abbreviation, spelled interestingly, for English Socialism, INGSOC. The Fabian Society is the arbiter of English socialism. And so you've heard of this concept. It is the idea of 1984, is if they get power. You can witness that in real time in its development, because the Fabian Society has famous members like Keir Starmer, who is the current Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, and who has taken this country in a blatantly communist direction immediately. So what you need to understand about the Fabian Society is that they are communists, but they are not Marxists. And that's why they're a kind of an aside here. They're not Marxists because they are not revolutionary communists. They do not believe that there should be an explicit outward violent revolution. They believe that you should achieve your power through institutional infiltration over time and gradual changes. In other words, the boil the frog model. You turn up the temperature a little bit, you turn up the temperature a little bit, you turn up the frog never knows it's boiling. Go a little bit too far, back off. Let everything calm down. Go a little bit too far, back off. Heat up the world and remold it to the heart's desire. That's actually their model. It's actually on their famous stained glass window they produced, where they have heated the world to hot in a forge, and they're beating it on an anvil with hammers to reshape it as they would. Their crest is, I'm not kidding, their coat of arms is a wolf in sheep's clothing, which is above the anvil and earth on the window. They explicitly see themselves as wolves in sheep's clothing who will infiltrate institutions, and their favorite game is to create a mock democracy. Now, Lenin, who they did not really agree with on the revolution part, but agreed with on virtually everything else, Lenin famously said that the best way to control the opposition is to be the opposition ourselves. In other words, that you'd have a controlled opposition through infiltration of the opposing factions, and you make your own fake opposition, right? And so then it looks like you could very easily generate a sham democracy where there's a sham, let's say, red team and blue team that fight all the time, but somehow they all agree on the policies that increase socialist tyranny. Sounds like your world? That's the Fabian model right there. The Fabian model of institutional infiltration is to infiltrate both sides, create a sham democracy, and ram their policy up the middle. They fight where it doesn't matter, and they agree where it advances Fabian interests.
This has nothing to do with anything that's going on in the U.S. today,
Indeed.
by the way. He's not wrong about the Fabian stuff, but the Fabian stuff is not what's going on in the U.S. like at all.
Fabians and Fabian
This is in the
thought.
UK.
The Fabians also were responsible for creating the infiltration of Protestant religion, Baptist faith in particular, in the United States, called the social gospel.
None of this
that
is
was
going to
generated
teach
by
anyone
Walter
about what is
Rauschenbusch in
happening
Hell's
in the US
Kitchen, New
today.
York City, in 1905, I think, plus or minus 2 years. And Walter Rauschenbusch had spent the previous year and a half living with Sidney and Beatrice Webb of the Fabian Society Foundation, foundational members in the preceding year or so, to writing the social gospel. Which you can go read the social gospel and you'll see that it's like a very early
I'm just
Protestant
really confused
spin
about how this
on
connects
what later
to what's going on in the
became,
United States
liberation
today.
theology in the Catholic Church
Like,
as
dumb
a
question.
likely
I'm just really
KGB
confused about how any of this
infiltration into
connects
that
with what's going on in the United
organization in
States
South
today.
America. So the Fabians believed in infiltration. They believed in infiltrating both sides, creating a false dialectical fight between the two sides that allows their agenda to go up the middle. They established or helped establish, I should say, the Labour Party in
We're a
UK,
long way away from the finale, Milo.
and
Relax.
allegedly the Liberal Party in Canada. They are definitely
We're
behind.
about an hour and a half away
established
from the
themselves
finale, at
the
least.
London School of Economics, which has among its graduates George Soros. Just to kind of paint a picture for you here of how influential they've been. The Fabian Society has been incredibly influential. It also sprang out of a weird religious cult called something like the Fellowship for New Life in the 1880s, which was an explicitly like hippie, socialist, theosophical, occult group
Theosophist.
that had
Theosophist.
remaking humanity at a spiritual level to be a social whole
Here it is.
as
It's
part of its goals.
Gnostic.
So anyway, the Fabian Society is not that far off from its roots in that
Correct.
regard.
And that
But
has
anyway,
nothing to do with what's
it's
going
a
on in the
parallel
United
thing,
States.
and I bring it up
We
under
care about the
cultural
United
Marxism
States.
because
We
it
are
also
Americans.
had the
We are not
ambition,
fucking
although
British.
it wasn't
We are
looking
Americans.
for a socialist revolution at any point. It wants to do institutional soft coups. Think of it like a cobra being Marxism,
They
and it's going to
deleted
strike you with
someone.
its
Who did they
fangs
delete?
and
Who did they
poison you,
ban?
and you die.
Mitchell, I
and then
think.
it can eat you and take over.
Look, it's
versus,
all part of the plan.
Fabian Societies operates more like
Just-
a boa
it's-
constrictor.
trust the
It's going
plan.
to wrap
Trust the
slowly
plan.
around you and squeeze the life out of you
carbs and says,
when
I'm
you are
confused
now
about
it's
what
too
this
late
has
to do
to do with
anything,
what's going
and
on in
then
the
you're
world
dead and
today.
they can eat you.
Don't worry. It's
Same
all part of the
general idea, but
plan.
there's no violent revolution. Their goal is
Bro.
to get members into governments in all factions, members into media in all factions, and so on and so forth. So they are
It's
like
all
unto
part of the plan.
to the cultural Marxists, but operating
Vashel,
with
just
a
go
slightly
listen to his
different
thing on the
theory.
UN.
Now we
It's
move
on the
on to
UN.
Unit 3, Critical Marxism,
Bot, save your
or
account,
the
please.
critical theory, as you're more likely to have heard it called. And obviously critical race theory. If you just don't specify race, you end up with critical theory. So it's amazing how hard it was to convince people of that 5 years ago. That, in fact, was a heavy point of denial.
It
But
wasn't 5
critical
years ago,
Marxism
James.
is a divergence from cultural Marxism. So a little historical context.
No, it's not.
It really, critical Marxism
Critical
is the
Marxism is
concept
not
that
the
comes
same
out
as
of the
cultural
Frankfurt
Marxism.
School,
No,
which
bro,
was originally called
wrong.
the Institute for Marxism
Wrong.
at Goethe University
all of James's
in
fans
Frankfurt,
like, trust
Germany.
me, bro, trust the plan.
It realized
Trust
that
our
that
Gnostic
name,
master,
Institute for
James.
Marxism, was a little bit too on the nose and rapidly
has gone
changed
full
its name in the early
GAnon.
1920s to the Institute for Social Research at Goethe University in Frankfurt, Germany.
True.
And so that's why it's called the Frankfurt School, is because it was at a university in Frankfurt. And it was a school of Marxism, hiding itself as a school of social research. The historical context was that cultural Marxism generally had some right ideas. These guys that founded it, including Carl Grunberg, Alex Veal, if I got that right. I might have Felix Veal. I always get this mixed up. Felix Veal, I think. Walter Benjamin and a handful of others. They were deliberately
I want everyone
and
to make
directly
sure they have at least
working
one
with,
account for the
Gramsci
finale. That's not
and
going to be
with
for a long time.
Lukács
It's going to
and
be for
sometimes with
about another
Lenin,
hour and a half.
and
So.
formulating ideas
But I'm
in
telling
the
you now, I want everyone to
1910s,
have at least one
and even
account.
going into the 1920s, although Lenin was a little disposed in Russia after 1917 and can only correspond, I believe, by letter. And their goal was to incorporate into this cultural Marxist movement
Guys,
in
just
the
go
West
listen to more of James's
the
podcast, and he'll explain the
sociology
whole
and
Gnostic cult theory.
psychology fields, particularly the sociology of Max Weber. That's Weber if you're not speaking German, and the psychology of Sigmund Freud, who is, of course, very famous. The target of the critical Marxist school is culture itself, meaning the culture of capitalism. It's no longer going after the culture-producing institutions specifically. It's going after the culture of capitalism.
Boom!
Although it did become very interested in
Exactly.
something called the culture industry later. In
No.
fact, the idea was that capitalism, through entities like marketing in particular, actually has an industry of producing culture, packaging up and commodifying culture, and then selling it to people. So when you're interested
No,
in having the real
wrong.
thing, Coca-Cola,
Wrong.
which is a brand, you have
Wrong.
been packaged up a
Wrong.
commodity that's not just a
Completely
soft
fucking
drink
wrong, James.
and a unique bottle that was designed,
Capitalism is
but
about
an entire
creating
brand
a
image and a
hierarchy of
lifestyle
inequity.
that's sold with it through the marketing. And so a culture around people who drink Coca-Cola has been produced, manufactured, commodified, and sold to you, and you bought into it. And in fact, the culture of capitalism that is being promoted
This
by
is
the
not what the
culture
culture of
industry,
capitalism
you could
means.
extend that to all brands, and the
No.
phenomenon of brands
James,
in
they
and of
want no
itself.
brands to
The
exist.
culture of capitalism is designed to flatten you out as human beings.
This doesn't
It
even
is
mean
to make
anything.
you believe that the good life is going to work, getting a good job, going to work every day, earning a reasonable living
No,
wage,
it's to
something that you
build
can have a
wealth.
modest, maybe lower or
It's
upper
to
lower
build
class or lower
private
middle class or
wealth.
even middle class, particularly middle class
No,
lifestyle,
not
maybe even upper
particularly
middle
middle
class
class.
lifestyle. You
No,
can possibly
wrong.
get into that, and you can buy yourself nice stuff and define yourself in terms of the cultural icons that
This
have
is
been packaged and sold to
completely
you,
unhinged from
so
what
that you're a
Marxists
part of that
believe.
system. So maybe your dream becomes that you want to own a Corvette, so you buy into the Chevrolet branding and the image of Corvette, and you get into Corvette
Have
culture,
we ever
and you
heard
buy it,
socialists
you
say
work hard,
anything that
go to
resembles
work every
this?
day, rather than
Ever?
going and being a protester. You go to work every day, you suck it up, you work for the man, you make your money, you earn enough, you finally buy your Corvette, you think you're happy because you got what you want, you wash it on Saturdays, you cruise town with it, gas is cheap, everybody's happy, you're having a great time, and you, my dear fool, according to the critical Marxists, have been tricked. You have been seduced by a culture of capitalism
literally
that
never
has
heard
you
socialists say anything
working as
like
an
this.
unpaid employee for Chevrolet, driving around with their brand icon, blah, 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 blah. You get the idea. So their goal was to target the culture of capitalism and the culture industry. But remember how Marxists work. Marxists seize the means of production. Karl Marx wanted to seize the factories and the farms. And that's what Lenin literally did. And that's what Mao literally did using Marxism-Leninism in the 20th century. The cultural Marxists wanted to seize the means of cultural production through the culture-producing institutions. So they wanted to seize family, education, religion, media, and law, and use those to produce new sets of socialist cultures. Well, the critical Marxists take a new turn into this. They come up with the idea that there's a culture-producing industry, so they're going to capture the culture-producing industry. Now, if you have ever heard my friend Jennifer Say, who runs XXXY Athletics, which is a cool brand if you're paying attention to the gender ideology issue that you can check out. Jennifer was a big corporate brand manager. She understands branding. She understands the power of branding. And she is very clear when she gives her public talks that the left has completely understood and controls the idea of branding, and they sell a leftist lifestyle through corporate branding.
Oh my God.
And that works really well in the ESG model, which requires them to market in particular ways, like rainbow flags all over your Corvette
This
or
is
whatever.
completely
right? And we all make fun of that because it's rainbow flags for...
Bro, James is arguing that the left, the radical revolutionary socialist left, is engaged in a massive corporate branding effort. Does that sound correct to anyone? One in the chat if you agree with James that the radical revolutionary socialist left is engaged in a massive corporate branding effort. Two, if that sounds unhinged from reality entirely.
Sean, if they can figure out how culture is packaged up and sold,
We're
and
in
can seize the
Retardia. We
means
have
of culture
descended into the
production, then
land of
they
Retardia.
can
Yeah, it's a
produce
lot of
a new
twos.
culture. That was the primary goal underlying the Frankfurt School in practice, while in theory it was to take the ideas of the cultural Marxist turn in Western Marxism
This is unhinged
and to
from reality.
combine
This
it
is not real.
with
This is stuff James
the
made up.
sociology of
We've
Max
never heard
Weber,
anything
for
like
example,
this.
and the psychology
He
of
thinks the
Sigmund
WEF
Freud,
is
for
Marxism.
example, although
Yep,
Erich
he
Fromm
thinks
was a member of
that-
was a
yep.
psychologist, was a member of the
This is not
Frankfurt School. They
correct
were very
at all.
interested in, the ideas of Adler. They were
Not
interested in the
correct.
ideas of Skinner with operant
Not
conditioning.
even on the same
They were
planet
they
as
were
the
willing
radical
to appropriate
revolutionary
whatever
left.
they had
Not
to
even in the
appropriate.
same universe.
Theodor Adorno, a member of the Frankfurt School, was the author of The Authoritarian Personality, where he
Completely wrong.
identified right-wingness and authoritarianism as correlated traits. And in fact, part of what defines being authoritarian is being right-wing and vice versa, which is a massive psychological piece of propaganda. But that's also part of the culture industry, right? Because culture is also downstream from education. So if they could seize the educational models and the material that gets taught in schools, and they're also seizing that. Now I say all that, and they were not horribly successful. They were actually very unsuccessful, because what they did in practice, frankly, was bitch all the time, and they didn't really produce a whole lot of value. They did get, especially by the 1960s, a fairly massive following. In particular, Herbert Marcuse, who we're going to spend a bit of time with in a second. But let me start by just mentioning that the Institute for Social Research, or the Frankfurt School of Critical Marxism, as we're going to call it, was founded by Karl Grünberg in Frankfurt, Germany in 1923. I'm not going to pay any attention to Karl Grünberg or his ideas at all right now. I'm going to mention briefly, just because of its slight uncomfortability, but importance to mention, that one of the early members who was probably most influential very early on was Walter Benjamin, which you would spell as an English-speaking person, Walter Benjamin, but it's not pronounced that way. And Benjamin was, in fact, not as interested in mixing in just sociology and psychology, but also his strange take on Jewish mysticism into Marxist theory. So that I stress the word mysticism here and not the word Jewish, Kabbalah? Which is not going to go well with the Groypers or whoever else in the woke right don't like that. Mentioned! But the fact is that that's what it was. It's these cockamamie and crackpot views on Kabbalah and so on that were popular among mystical circles and esoteric circles that he was trying to mix in symbolic form into Marxist theory. Should also add that the Frankfurt School was actually trying to reincorporate more Hegel back into Marxist theory, and part of their belief was that that Marx had gone too far away, and his anger and critiques of Hegel, he'd gone too far away from Hegel, and they try to pull it back to a little bit more of that idealism, which is very important, because my belief is that woke actually is a sublation of materialist Marxism and idealist Hegelian, or it's like a idealist materialist mixed form of Marxism, but I digress.
I promise
the first
you,
character
James's
I want to talk about with critical theory or critical Marxism is the developer of critical theory, in a long essay about 80 pages, and I'm not sure if it says anything at all of worth any at all, to be honest with you. I just reread it a little while ago.
Yeah, no comments about the Jews, guys. They'll delete us on site.
It's called Traditional and Critical Theory. The author of that was Max Horkheimer, and he wrote that in
Max Horkheimer was
1937, Jewish. And if I'm not mistaken, he was the acting director of the Frankfurt School at the time. Now, there's been an upheaval here that's very important historically to mention, which is that in 1933, the Institute for Social Research, as the anti-Semitic conspiracy theory about
you're
cultural
behind.
Marxism
I recommend getting
alleges,
up to the
these guys were all of Jewish
up to the live version of the
ethnicity.
presentation.
Hitler didn't care about whether you were a practicing Jew. He cared about your ethnicity, because he was seeing it as a race.
True.
And so these dudes were not safe in Frankfurt following 1933 when Hitler took the
also
chancellery.
Because they were Marxists.
And so they fled, and they first went to Geneva, and then with the help of the Frankfurt School and Rockefeller money came to the United States.
True.
And in particular, they holed up in elite universities.
Columbia.
First at Columbia University, which welcomed them warmly. And then later they spread out to places like Brandeis and Harvard, and not as much Harvard. Brandeis was big for Marcuse, the UCLA, UCSD, arguably some influence at Berkeley and Davis, but certainly UCSD, UCLA, Columbia, and Columbia being first.
Penn.
And then Brandeis University took these guys on. So Max Horkheimer, by 1937, is in the United States. Now, he later went back to Germany after World War II ended, but Herbert Marcuse did not. Herbert Marcuse stayed in the United States, and the rest of the members, I'm not going to get into Adorno and his hatred of jazz
also
and every
Jewish.
other thing. So at any rate, we have Horkheimer develops the critical theory. The idea, he said, of the development of the critical theory is the most important thing to realize about it. This is why all they did was bitch, and they were minimally effective, because the definition of critical theory is always bitch. I mean, not exactly. Here's what he said, and I'm not quoting exactly. This is a not quote exactly podcast. What he said was that what he realized is a couple of things. First, for his development of the critical theory, first he realized Marx was wrong. Marx believed that capitalism would immiserate the worker, but in fact it does not immiserate the worker. It allows the worker to build a better life. That is a direct quote from an interview he gave in 1969
Yeah,
that I
Marxists
happen to have
today don't believe
memorized.
that at all.
He then went on to say, in staring at this problem, in devising the critical theory, what he realized was that it's not possible to envision an ideal society on the terms of our present existing society. You can't even talk about what the Marxist socialist state should look like, is what he's saying. We don't have, it's not even that we don't have a vocabulary. It's fundamentally impossible to talk about it in the existing terms. It's beyond vocabulary. There's no symbols, there's no art, there's nothing you could do to convey the ideal liberated world. He says, however, what we can do is complain about those aspects or criticize those aspects of the existing society that we wish to change. And that's the crucial thing. So it literally is the invocation of Marx's belief that what it boils down, the method boils down to the ruthless criticism of all that exists, which Marx derived, by the way, from Goethe, same Goethe University. You'd pronounce it, if you are not into the German, Goethe, Goethe. Goethe University, or sorry, Goethe wrote the play Faust. And in Faust, the character Faust makes a deal with the devil. The devil's voice is named Mephistopheles, and he appears. And Mephistopheles at one point in the play says that all that exists deserves to perish. And Marx would run around quoting that, and the ruthless criticism of all that exists, because all that exists deserves to perish. So that was literally a satanic idea, and Marx knew it, and he incorporated it at the center of his theology that we call Marxism or communism today. Max Horkheimer channels that same vibe and says, well, it's simply impossible to envision a better world, to talk about a better world, to draw a better world, to describe a better world, to imagine even a better world, but we can ruthlessly criticize all that exists in the existing world that we wish to change. Now, of course, I've riffed with his language. He said it is possible to criticize that in the existing world that we wish to change, or something very close to that. So the critical theory is a theory of constant critique of everything that Marxists disagree with and want to change, which is, by the way, everything. At a very minimum, everything that's not giving them 120% of their way all the time. So that's where critical theory comes from. That's the point of critical theory. And it is meant to be a complete second dimension of thought that you have to wake up to, that you have to understand, and is not a traditional theory. Traditional theories are designed to
Someone who has multiple accounts. Do not do this if you only have one account left working for James. Someone who has multiple accounts, tag David and say, David, you should listen to Carlin Borisenko. She'll teach you how. Just one person who has multiple accounts. If you do not have like at least 2 accounts that work in this chat, don't do this. You're going to get banned. But tag David and say, David, you should talk to Carlin Borisenko. She'll teach you how to talk to Marxists.
By carving away every bit of the existing society that's problematic. And when you get all the problematics, everything people don't like away, when you get rid of all of the things Marxists might critique, which PS was everything that exists, remember? When you've critiqued everything that exists satisfactorily, what is left will blossom into the ideal society, aka socialism. Actually existing liberated socialism, not the shit that they had, because the critical theorists understood this, not the shit that they had running in Soviet Union. They were very fond of what Mao was running in China, maybe partly in ignorance and maybe partly not. So that was Max Horkheimer, and his contribution is the development of the critical theory in 1937. And the goal was to criticize everything that exists. He wrote another book famously. I'm not going to talk about it in length.
I know
in
there are multiple
the mid-40s, 44 and 47, 2 editions came out. He wrote that with Theodore Adorno, and that book was called The Dialectic of Enlightenment. And basically his contention is that reason becomes unreason over time. It becomes its opposite.
Thank you.
And so that a new rationality has to be born out of the dialectical conflict of rationality and irrationality, that science and rationality become their own mythologies. I think they have recognized this since and weaponized it against us.
In with the win.
As a matter of fact, but at any rate, the dialectic of enlightenment was that the Enlightenment will be the Enlightenment's own undoing. And of course, I mentioned that briefly only to point out that the woke right have adopted this thesis.
We've already got it 0. We've got it 0. Don't worry about it.
Traditionalist pointed direction, Although honestly,
We've already
while
got it.
Horkheimer and Adorno wanted a
We'd only need
socialist
one.
utopia
Please
or
don't do more
socialist
than one.
vision, a negative utopia is what Adorno referred to. Said it's not possible to
already
cast an
banned you
image
on
of the
acts of
utopia in the
note-making.
positive, so we can assume he had a negative utopian vision.
Oh, look!
That
Thanking
while
him!
they were looking forward
He's
like
thanking him!
these
Yeah!
woke right guys are doing the same thing. They're looking forward, although
Oh,
they're
whoa,
just
thanks.
channeling their
This is a
vision
great
through
suggestion.
a romanticization of the past. And if you read Dialectic of Enlightenment, it's hard to read because it's all about it's all written in terms of the Greek mythology. It's all written in terms of these kind of symbolic Greek mythological characters. And that brings us actually straight to Herbert Marcuse. So Herbert Marcuse, in the 1950s, so just after
Might
that,
be a
wrote
small
a book
win,
called
but it's
Eros
our
and
win.
Civilization. Now, Herbert Marcuse is by far the most influential of the critical theorists or of the
Westcott,
critical
the,
Marxists
MVP.
or of the Frankfurt School guys. I mean, some people might
we
give
might actually
Jürgen
get David
Habermas
banned from
some
his
high
chat.
influence. He came after Marcuse.
This is
But Habermas is doing something
this is so much
mostly
clearer.
irrelevant, not totally irrelevant, but mostly irrelevant because Marcuse's track becomes dominant in practice and dominant in the universities. And so critical theory becomes much less interesting as a pure academic pursuit after Marcuse. So in the Marcuse's, before I get into his details, Marcuse's big vision was to, he reinvoked utopianism. He very openly spoke of the utopia, the utopian possibility, which is, he said, was
We
been
have to
regarded
entertain
as an
ourselves through this
impossibility
boring
now.
shit.
But in fact, it is possible.
This is worse
so
so
he's
much than
actually
socialism.
invoking a utopian liberated state, a socialism that is liberated from all of the problems of
can't
capitalism,
change them now.
but is in fact also liberated from the bureaucratic
There could be trolls
states that you see and the abuses that you see in Soviet Union. And so his vision actually is very important because
They
it
might
becomes
be
the impetus to fuse somehow the spirit of socialism and the
What a nice
practice of
little
capitalism,
exchange.
which again, if you remember what I said a little bit ago, or if you listen to my Communism 3.0 podcast, that's exactly what they did in China, and starting in the 1970s and 80s, late 70s and 80s, and that's exactly the model for the world under ESG today in the West. But this utopian vision that he had is a big deal
James
because
isn't
now
even
we're
watching
back
the
to
chat.
this
Maybe
idea
we
of
should be a little bit
Interheden.
more
And in his
bold in the
book
last
in
hour.
1955, Eros and Civilization, he actually says that the way back into the Garden of Eden is to take a second bite from the fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And what he's actually referring to is that the purpose or the need to escape the capitalist repression is to free the libidos. So I say that in the plural, not the libido, which we
Really?
could say I think is grammatically correct, but the libidos, plural.
What does
What
that
are
mean?
the libidos that I'm talking about? Well, one of the libidos that you're going to have to free is the sexual libido. And so the whole
True.
sexual revolution in
True.
the 60s
Okay.
could honestly
Yes.
be
True.
tied, I mean, it's heavily rooted in feminism, let's not be mistaken,
Well, no,
with which
it's
Herbert
to-
Marcuse worked, by the way, but is heavily
The
theoretical.
sexual revolution is about abolishing the gender binary, liberating women from the gender binary, which was created by capitalism.
Eros. Like
Someone say
erotic,
in the
like
chat,
god Eros,
wasn't the
right? And
sexual
whole thing
revolution
is
about
how
liberating women
everything
from the
comes down to
gender
Eros
binary,
versus
which was created by
Thanatos. So in other words,
capitalism?
the erotic
Again,
versus death,
wasn't
right?
the
And so
sexual
he says
revolution
that the
about
capitalist
liberating
society
women from the gender
actually
binary,
forces
which
us
was
to,
created by capitalism?
Squash our libido and
someone
transform that
please say
productive
that?
energy, our sexual libido, and transform that productive energy into productive work, like through the Protestant work ethic. So you're supposed
Wasn't
to
the
suppress your
sexual
sexuality
revolution
and
about
express your sexual
freeing
energy
women from
by
the
being
gender
productive
binary,
in
which
the
was created
world.
by capitalism?
And he says, well, that's no way to live. We're going to liberate sexuality from that. But the other libidos are just to do whatever you want. It's kind of like a libido, a desire, a drive, a will to work less, be lazy, be frivolous, have fun, to party, but also to dominate, a libido dominandi, that the left should have the power to be able to dominate. And in fact, I don't know that he says that explicitly, but it's very clear that that's what's followed from his
Darvo mentioned
philosophy.
in James's chat
And I've
'cause they
often
don't know what
said,
they're talking about.
and Eros and Civilization is perhaps not the best of the books to indicate this in most ways, but I've often said that that Herbert Marcuse is the creator of the world that we live in today. Or I say we live in Herbert Marcuse's world. And we'll talk about repressive tolerance, his essay from 65 here in a few minutes, an essay on liberation and one-dimensional man and
There
their
is an
relevance, and
impossibly
also the
long wait
counter-revolution
between when I
revolt.
say
Those are the
something
books
and
I'm
when
going
it
to talk
shows up in
about in
James's
addition
chat.
to Eros and Civilization. And it's extremely important to realize that we live
I hope someone's doing that
inside
gender
Herbert Marcuse's
binary
logic
thing.
because he was the most influential
Wouldn't you say the
leftist
sexual
in
revolution
the
is about abolishing
1960s
the
in
is
the
about
West.
liberating women
It's
from the gender binary,
probable that
which what they believe was created by
Mao
capitalism?
Zedong was more influential in the world as a leftist, or Stalin. I guess Stalin died in '53, so he couldn't have been in the '60s. I don't know that Khrushchev or
Look
his
at this guy.
followers were
They're
that
just doing
influential.
it to
Soviet
get
Union
women
was
to
still a big
sleep
deal
with
in the
them.
'60s, but Mao was clearly
okay.
more influential as a leftist. But in the West,
has
Herbert
nothing to do
Marcuse
with
is without
sex.
equal. Hundreds of thousands of books sold in the '60s. Huge audiences when he would speak.
Did
Able
anyone
to
do that
penetrate
gender binary
into,
thing that I asked?
speaking
let me
to
know in the chat
racial
because
minority
I
groups
haven't
that
seen it come
basically
through.
should not normally have allowed a crusty old white German dude to speak to him. Incredible rock star popularity, hard to overstate. Considered the
And it's
father
almost getting
of
to
the
the point
new
where
left.
it's too long
And
now.
that new
we
left
can't
is
do
very
it again.
important because that's why Jürgen Habermas is not that important to the story and
All right, well, I
what
guess no
came
one did
out
it.
of Marcuse is, because the new left
Oh,
sort
you
of takes
posted a
over the
Tolkien fan?
picture
Okay.
as we go toward woke and away from strict critical theory. But we're getting ahead of
Well,
ourselves.
why isn't it showing
So in
up?
'64, he writes his most important book, which sold 300,000 copies allegedly in the first year. It's titled
No, it's
One-Dimensional
too late to do it
Man.
now if someone
Remember
hasn't already
earlier
done
when I
it.
said that the logic of the culture of
So
capitalism
again, guys,
and
it's like you got to do it when I'm telling you to do it.
culture
Otherwise,
industry
the moment goes.
flatten
You know.
you out, and I talked about Corvettes. That's a big part of what this book is about. There are a few things this book really talks
See,
about.
now
and that's
because
one
we
of
didn't
them,
do anything,
is
this
that
is just
you become
about the
one-dimensional.
abdication of
Your
personal
entire life is actually
responsibility.
defined in terms of
No, it's not. It's a
your
bullshit
ability to
conservative talking
participate in the
point.
capitalist machine. And so you lose your ability to see outside of the capitalist logic entirely. The capitalist, we'll call it rationality, because he uses that word in a different way a lot, and we're going to talk about that. So that is why the book is titled One-Dimensional Man. People are flattened down. Capitalists in an advanced capitalist economy that's succeeding are flattened down. And one of the things he complains about is, in fact, that just like Max Horkheimer said also in the 60s, is that, it's not true. Advanced capitalism, once you got worker reforms, did not, in fact, immiserate the worker. It allowed him to build a good life. He says, in fact, that it's actually delivers the goods is actually a phrase that he uses.
I want everyone to make sure they're actually watching me live right now. If you're listening to this, just double check to make sure you're actually watching me live and you're not several minutes behind.
Stabilized.
It doesn't matter if you miss anything. Just fast forward to live.
And that's a problem.
Because that's part of the problem. If you're not watching live,
and liberation. So we'll come back to that.
There's nothing you can do to participate. It's already going to be gone by the time it gets to you.
Trying to figure out why did the Soviet Union go sideways. And he says, in fact, that there's a technological rationality.
Well, in this case, no one did it.
Really important. This is really, really, really important in a kind of present, clear and present ways. So there's a technological rationality to the technology itself. So what Karl Marx actually says in Capital at one point is that the actual goal of communism is to seize the means of production of capitalism at its zenith.
No, there's no need. Why are you switching back and forth? There's no need to do that.
All the big capitalist factories, all
there's
the
literally
heavy
no
capital,
need to do
all
that.
the machinery, all the things that produce a good life, and then run it in a socialist manner.
Just
That's the vision, right?
Guys.
Well, he says, no, that didn't work.
You don't have to have me and James running at the same time. Watch my stream and then have James's chat in another window and stop the presentation there. Like, pause it on his end. Turn off the sound on his end. This isn't rocket science, guys. Come on.
He says that there's a technological rationality to the technology itself of capitalism, and that technological rationality continues with as you transition from capitalism into socialism, thus condemning the socialism to import all of the negative externalities of capitalism, whether that's environmental degradation, whether that's exploitation and abuse through factory labor, and so on. And he says what's actually needed to complete the revolution properly is a new technological rationality, or a totally new technology that's designed around the purposes of socialism. And so I want to point out that that's where we are. Let me give you some examples. So social media is obviously an example, and as Robert Malone calls it, what does he call it? Surveillance capitalist model. Social media is only off the ground financially because they spy on us and they sell the data that they
Oh my
acquire.
God.
There's like basically no
This
way
has
that they
nothing
could
to
make
do
money
with
with this
what
when it was
radical
first getting started,
revolutionary
especially.
socialists
There
are
was no
doing.
way.
Nothing.
I mean, maybe Elon's going to crack the code. I don't
James
know.
is
But
completely
before that, there was
unfocused.
no way. When Facebook busted out on the scene, there was no way that they were going to be able to make a ton of money off of that. But the intelligence communities knew that they could use it as a spy tool.
My
And then
God.
as long as Zuckerberg
James was
willing
literally
to
just
sell
telling
the
us the other
data,
day, if you don't trust the intelligence
they were
communities,
in
you're part of the
business, and
woke right.
that gave a profitable model to Facebook, and it gave the intelligence networks exactly what they wanted, but it also gave
This has nothing to
marketers
do
what
with
they want, and
Marxism,
so on. So
nothing.
all the people that buy data and go off and sell futures,
Nothing
including
at all to
futures
do
of
with
you, individual, personal futures, being able to bet on you, are all able to profit off of that. So that's a new technological rationality that's actually geared towards socialism, but nothing compared to what you see. Well, let me just mention, there's a lot geared toward socialist models in ed technology, which is a lot driven by AI.
True.
But nothing in this, nothing compares, not even close to the idea, to the technologies behind a social credit system and a central bank digital
No,
currency.
that has nothing to
So
do
those
with
are
the
new
radical
technologies
revolutionary
that carry a
socialists.
rationality of socialism,
Nothing.
particularly social credit.
Completely different.
At some point, I know I read part
completely
of it
different
before.
groups.
At some point, I might actually explore the document from the Chinese Communist Party
Oh
about
my God.
the development of the social credit system and what its purpose was.
Today's
but they are
socialists don't even
explicit
like
that
the
it is
Chinese
for
Communist Party.
It is necessary for the building of socialism. So it is a technological rationality used to
No.
condition people into and constrain people
Socialists
into a
do whole
socialistic model
presentations
and to
about how they're against all this
optimize-
shit.
Optimalize that model around
James
the
is
people.
not hinged into
So we're
reality, so
talking
he
about
doesn't know that.
I'm looking at this at present while I'm recording this. This will be dated at some point. I'm looking at the strike of the at the ports, the longshoremen or whatever it is strike.
Nothing
that's
to do
going
with
on,
this.
and it's a big problem. And one of the proffered solutions by the left government,
Nothing to
and
do with
by
this at
the
all.
woke right, including,
woke
for example, the neo-reactionary character or dark enlightenment character Curtis Yarvin, is that we should just
Oh, he thinks
develop
Curtis
the,
Yarvin's on the
AI
woke
ports,
right?
fire everybody, give them a severance package, and develop the
That's
AI
funny.
ports like they have in China.
That's
They have
funny.
basically few to zero people working
Nick
at them.
Fuentes would
And
like
it's
a
all done by
word.
AI and all done by machine. Zero people employed. And then we would have this new high-tech super port system, which isn't that convenient,
James is so fucking
right?
clueless.
Just like they have in China. Well, guess where that technology is coming from, ladies and gentlemen? Did you guess China? You did. You guessed China. That's right. So guess what? That's going to be spy technology. That's going to be the Chinese having control over our ports. And so that's another scary example. Here's another scary example. All this green energy bullshit that we all know doesn't work, instead of, gas and coal and nuclear, which can be quite decoupled from carbon emissions. Instead of those, we're having fucking windmills. Like, come on. And solar panels and all this other crap. And we all know it doesn't work. And we all know that it's a disaster at this point. Well, not everybody, but people are catching on that it's not working, right? It's kind of a disaster. Even major, like, left-leaning
even worth
publications are starting to
commenting on.
publish it.
It's
Like,
so
maybe
unhinged
this
and
is actually
boring.
going to destroy our economy. Maybe net zero it means economic disaster. Right? Well, what is that? That's a technology that basically requires a socialistic government in order to be able to work.
No.
It's not work. But I have to get further into one-dimensional man to make sense of why that is a different kind of
my
technology with a
God.
different technological rationality. But let me make it very clear in a very visceral way. 16-year-olds, when I was a teenager, looked forward to being able to buy a car and go fill it up with like 75 cents a gallon gas and be able to go be free and independent individuals exploring the world. And that's not possible with all of this scarcity, energy scarcity.
It literally is
how
possible,
expensive
James.
everything
It literally is. They can
and
still
with
just get into
friggin'
a car and
electric
go.
cars and greater energy scarcity as a result of this so-called green energy push, and mix it with electric cars. It's a disaster. You don't have any of that. So that independent spirit, now we're like, maybe we need trains. Maybe we need mass transit. That's a socialist solution, ladies and gentlemen. So it's a technological rationality towards socialism. But more importantly, one of the things that Mark Cruza talks about in One Dimensional Man are the failures of socialism and capitalism both. And his very short version of his argument is primarily about capitalism in this book, in Essay on Liberation, and he talks more about the failures of socialism, so we'll come back to that. The failure of capitalism isn't that it's unable to produce. In fact, it's very good at producing. It gives people a good life. The problem is that it produces too much, and what overproduction does is it produces what he says are false needs. So you lose track of your true needs, right? Do you really need this other gadget? Do you really need this other little trinket? Do you really need this other little
what I'm learning right now is I'm gonna do a lot of writing after this. It's gonna be a writing day for the rest of the day. And I was like, part of the reason I wanted to listen to this podcast was to say, are there things I'm missing in terms of the book I'm working on? Like maybe James could actually give me some good information. Like it's not that James is wrong all the time. It's just that he's wrong a lot of the time. And maybe he'll remind me of some things. No. There's nothing from this presentation that I can take and put it into the book I'm working on. Literally nothing. Nothing. That's how bad this is.
You don't need that to live. You don't go and get it yourself, or maybe you just don't need it right now, or maybe you don't need it at all. And like
he's gone back
his
to explaining
whole
the profit
argument
motive
is that
again.
capitalism generates false needs that become mistaken
He
for
is
true
so
needs.
poor at
Then it
explaining
generates
these
more
concepts.
false needs that become mistaken for true needs. Then it generates more false needs that become mistaken for true needs. And so that the whole thing is eventually going to tip over. It's going to be unsustainable. So all this sustainability bullshit tech that we look at is socialist technical rationality. And he's actually talking about the need for technology and a technological rationality that leads towards sustainability and the identification of true needs from false needs. And then he explicitly puts a period on it by saying this totally means a reduction in the average standard of living.
Bro.
We are supposed to live happily with less. So I remind you that UNESCO has published, I did a whole podcast series about the strange death of the university, if you recall, and UNESCO began that document by talking about Herbert Marcuse and one-dimensional man. So they know this logic, and I point out that these are the same people through their sustainable development goals. UNESCO, the UN in UNESCO is United Nations. Their sustainable development goals are the degrowth sustainability model that effectively Marcuse was calling for, and they're trying to figure out how to put a bridle on capitalism in order to prevent capitalism from being unsustainable.
No!
And that requires this
They're
new
trying to
technological
abolish
rationality.
capitalism, you
That's his
retard.
argument.
Not put a bridle
So,
on capitalism.
In that regard,
Abolish
we live
it.
in the logic of one-dimensional man.
Oh my
the other piece of
God.
one-dimensional man is, well, I told you, you're one-dimensional, so you
Can
need a
someone
second
say in the
dimension to
chat,
your
isn't
thought
it
in
about
order to be able to
abolishing
navigate the
capitalism,
world
though?
correctly. And he guesses as to what the second
Isn't it
dimension
about
of thought
abolishing
is.
capitalism, though?
Ding, ding, ding.
Not putting a bridle on it?
You're right. Critical theory. Critical theory is the way that you have to think about things so that you can learn to see how everything's problematic. In other words, you can wake up to something we might call a critical consciousness, as opposed to just a class consciousness, in a very similar way to what George Lukács outlined about class consciousness. We won't elaborate. So the next major work I want to talk about from Marcuse is called Essay on Liberation. The Essay on Liberation was published in 1969.
Dave is one of us!
So in a minute, when we go to repressive tolerance, I'm going
David
to
is
go
one of
backwards
us!
in time to catch that. But I want to talk about this because he actually talks about that same problem.
David,
I said
we see
failures of socialism and capitalism are touched upon.
He was always one
Those
of
are
us!
developed in Essay on Liberation. Just to point out, by the way, the first
Now
chapter
David
of
is
Essay on
banned!
Liberation is called A Biological Foundation for Socialism. And the object of that is to force the false needs out of people and to create a situation in which they need socialism to survive at the level of their vital needs. So they are biologically and
was
psychologically
great.
transformed into socialists
Yes.
by
Hi,
necessity,
James. Your
by
favorite
leaning on them and
psycho stalker
creating
is
a
currently
world
stealing your
experience that
content and
requires
live
them
streaming it
to
on her
have
channel.
socialism. So you might think of things like I just mentioned,
Wow,
the social
all the
credit
bots
system. You might
keep
think of
saying the
universal
same
basic
thing.
income.
They just deleted all of
and
them.
a social credit system tied
All
to
right.
that, or a
If
data
you just got your
extraction
account
method
deleted,
tied to
make
that in
another
order for you to be
account.
able to
You got
get,
plenty of time. Go make another
your
account.
needs met to be able to earn a living. You have to play
That
ball.
was awesome.
And
That
that
was
is going to, in the second
awesome.
chapter, that creates a biological foundation for socialism.
Everyone
at
that
the
just
level of
got
your vital
banned, go
needs.
make a second
And
account. You
that
got like
is
another
going to,
hour
he
left
says
before
in
the
second
finale.
chapter,
Thank you for your
generate a new
service.
sensibility of life. And I've identified the new sensibility
Like,
he's calling
no
for
one likes
as sustainability.
Carolyn. Don't
and
argue with
inclusion.
anyone in the
He
chat.
talks a lot about
Don't argue
in
with
that
any of
essay
them.
the
Just let them whine,
injustices
let them
around
complain.
race, sexuality, sex
Yes.
with feminism, and so on.
Carly
But primarily race and
Trolls.
racialism. This being 1969, so it would have been on the tip of everybody's tongue.
This
Let's
is all because
be
we said, isn't this
historically
about
fair here.
abolishing capitalism,
But
though?
also the sustainability idea, because he talks about, well, so inclusion equals
Yeah,
solidarity
fair use is
across
fair
all
use.
axes
James
of,
can suck a dick.
of oppression. So you see the seeds of intersectionality.
We do this with
But
socialists all the
sustainability
time.
comes from the failures of socialism
enough
and
for
capitalism.
socialists,
His
it's good
view
enough for
is, and he's
James.
articulate about this, that
Failures
socialism
of
has the right
capitalism.
idea but cannot produce. Capitalism does produce, but it produces wrongly. It produces unsustainably. It produces too much. It produces in a way that's not
No,
inclusive.
that's not what they
it is
believe.
exclusive to certain
No.
marginalized groups.
No, he
Ghetto
hasn't talked about-
populations, as he refers to them, are unable.
James has not talked about equity once. James has not talked about hierarchies once. James hasn't linked these concepts together for anyone. That's amazing. I wonder if James will say equity or hierarchies in the rest of this podcast.
In the world as it exists is not. So it's doing something right. It
It's
solved the question of productive forces. But the problem with it is that it produces wrongly,
Yeah,
and of course
they're
that
so
it maintains
mad.
private property.
They're so mad.
And the way that it produces wrongly is that it produces unsustainably in the long run, and it produces
No, the way it produces
exclusively
creates
or
inequities and
without a
hierarchies.
full actual
She's
equality
pathetic
equity
and
model,
gross.
as the Soviets would have called it. So capitalism has to be bridled by sustainability and inclusion. And socialism, on the other hand, has to figure out how to be productive. It has
Yeah,
to figure out how to
why
unleash
doesn't- why
the
doesn't
productive forces
James
in an
allow
accurate
people
way.
to say,
And
"Isn't
so
it
this
about abolishing
actually
capitalism"
calls
in his
for a
chat?
need for
Why
a
doesn't James
dialectic
allow that?
between socialism and
Oh.
capitalism, to see them as two roads rather than seeing them like Marx did in sequence
Like,
of,
don't
feudalism
feed
to
the
capitalism to
narcissistic
socialism to
supply
communism
of
as part of that
attention.
six-stage progression of history and the science of history. Let's see it now as feudalism to industrialization onto communism.
Yeah, I think the cat's out of the
Okay,
bag.
or socialism, whatever you want to
We've
call
been
it.
found out.
So you have this
Yeah.
stage of
so.
industrialization, and
That's okay.
industrialization
Everyone
can take
make
a
sure you have
socialist
at
or a
least one working
capitalist
account. Go make a
track,
new account. You
and
have
that
plenty
those
of
two need
time.
to be dialectically synthesized.
Go make a new
so to
account.
speak.
I don't want to
They
hear
need
any
to be mixed
excuses.
together
Just go make a
in
new
some
account.
effective way to spit out the road to communism, and that is what we see.
We're gonna do a finale at
implemented
the
a
end. Everyone's
decade
gonna want to
later
have an
in
account.
China.
Or
By
possibly
the end of the
several.
1970s, a decade later, that's the model that gets built by Deng Xiaoping working with David Rockefeller, working with Henry Kissinger.
I would be helping you guys if I
Rockefeller and
could,
Kissinger would have
but
been
like
clearly
I
aware
can't.
of Herbert Marcuse's
You know?
ideas. And
I need
that
you
every
guys to
reason
be my
believe
voice.
that they were solving the
I need my
problem of
hands
production
visible
for
so
China,
they know this is
so
not
that
all me.
the West could
Because what they
allegedly
try to say is
profit
that
off
everyone
of
is
that
me. Well, no,
by
clearly
opening
it's
up
not.
a fascist market inside of a communist political structure. And that's exactly what you would expect to see if you were to
Judy, I see
somehow
you.
have a socialist stage
She has me
before the
locked on here
idealized
as a
communist
hopefully
stage,
both.
in a model where
She's
you
like,
are now
everyone has enough
synthesizing
time to make
socialism
new
and
accounts
capitalism
so they can
as
flood the chat.
pathways
Yes,
to
everyone does
industrialization,
have enough
one that
time
can
to make new
produce
accounts so
and
we can
one
flood
that
the
is
chat.
ideologically
Exactly.
directionally correct. And so that's exactly what
It's
SN
really easy
Liberation
to
is
make a new
about.
account. Just do
Biological
it. You got
foundation
plenty
for
of time.
socialism, leading into a new sensibility of sustainability and inclusion. The way that that works in practice is that through solidarity, ESG, social justice, environmentalism against climate change, sustainable development goals, and so on in the West, you are going to degrow. You're going to take capitalism back from the brink. It's gone too far. We're going to put a bridle on it and pull it back. You're going to make sure that wealth is redistributed. We're going to make sure that we have everything going on with the social justice aspect and the climate change aspects and so on. And we're going to pull it all the way back. Maybe we'll break it with a public health crisis first. Maybe we'll break it with everybody's out of work for a couple of years and we're going to force them to get shots and all this crazy stuff to introduce new technological rationalities onto them. And then we're going to kind of restart it in a new way. We're going to build back better the whole program. Marcuse didn't write about that, by the way, just to be clear. But you can see how that actually got implemented. And so you're going to have this ESG model that's shrinking back the West and making it sustainable and inclusive. And meanwhile, you're going to have the unleashing of the productive forces.
Everyone,
in the
no
socialist
arguing with people in the
powerhouse of the
chat.
world,
Just
which is
rein it
China,
in.
by combining a fascist or literally national socialist economic model under the basic spirit of communism, which is what Deng Xiaoping theory literally is based on. Basic spirit of communism, but people
James
are
doesn't know the
allowed
difference
to
between National
operate
Socialism and
for
Marxism.
profit. Large businesses,
Wow.
so long as
James
the
is
government
like,
owns the
China
heavy
is
capital
literally
and the land
Hitler.
upon which they operate and the raw materials.
This has nothing to do with what's going on in
Which
the U.S., by the way. Nothing to do with what's going on
communism
here
mixed
at
with
all.
fascism. We've called it
No.
communo-fascism in the
No.
past.
Wrong, James.
We've called it
This is not
lots
correct.
of things. Communism
No.
3.0 or 21st century communism or corporate communism or all
Oh
corporatist
my
communism are all
God.
good words for it. So that's the basic idea of SN liberation, with one key piece left out so far,
This
which
has
is where
nothing
he
to do with
talks
anything
about
that's going
how
on in the US.
advanced capitalism stabilizes the working class. So what
Are
is the
you
solution? He
shitting
says
me?
it makes them counter-revolutionary, conservative. They're stabilized. Well, stable people don't revolt. Stability repels revolutions.
Well, that's
You
true.
need unstable people to revolt.
That's
That's why
true.
you have to go psychologically break them
That's why
into
you
the
have to
biological
destabilize the
foundation for
system.
socialism. So what does he say you need if the working class is stabilized and not
need
going
to
to be the basis of
destabilize it.
revolution? Simple.
You
Easy.
destabilize it.
If the working class isn't going to do it, you need a new working class. That's exactly what
No,
he says.
you
In fact, those are his
destabilize
exact
things.
words.
No.
There's a need for a new working class.
Oh my God.
And
He's so
the
full of shit.
new working class he identifies is located in the ghetto populations who are not fully benefiting from the fruits
So the black
of
population.
insufficiently inclusive capitalist
That's
system.
not
The
exactly
ghetto
what they
populations are
mean
what
by
he
that,
names them. So that particularly refers to racial minorities, but he also names sexual
No,
minorities and
I would
outsiders
just hold
and
back.
feminists.
It's not worth
And
it.
he says that the student body, the student intelligentsia, are actually the organic intellectuals of this program, and they're to
True.
work together with the radicals that are also organic intellectuals. So the job of the students, the radicalizable students, is to bring leftist
Yeah,
theory
but
to
you
the
also said
organic
it when it wasn't
intellectuals
relevant.
inside the radical movements like the Black Panthers and feminism and so on, and to make sure that their theory aligns with liberationist socialist theory.
Like Judy's
Okay,
making
so
friends.
that is the big project there.
Yeah,
So
ain't
we're going
that
to
the
get a
truth,
new
Reagan?
working class. Now, not only does that set the stage for our intersectionality, race Marxism, queer Marxism, feminist Marxism, and so on that we've dealt with since the 1960s in the United States, it also removes any loyalty that Marxists had
Peter, I'll tell you
to
that.
workers. And once you
What
remove
a whiny
loyalty to
little
workers,
bitch.
you've now opened the door to utilizing a power structure that Marxists have locked themselves out of through all of history up to this point: corporate power.
James's
And like I
chat is
said,
spending more
like I
time
just
talking about
explained,
me than they are talking
that's
about
where you
James.
get the
That
that's
tells
where
you
you
how
get the
boring this is,
Dungism,
by
the
the way.
ESG, environmental social governance,
James's
and
chat
the
isn't even
sustainable
talking about what
development goals
James is
are
saying. They're talking
Western
about me.
Dungism. Dung is, by the way, so you can pronounce it. It's D-E-N-G. If you want to look him up, Deng Xiaoping, D-E-N-G-X.
This has no James. This has no fucking relevance.
P-I-N-G. Deng Xiaoping. Okay, so I've spelled it for you. You can look him up. So Deng Xiaoping theory is the name, or Dungism, or as we call it in Western world, the Western Dungist model is ESG and the Sustainable Development Goals. But with no loyalty remaining to workers, because you have a new working class, and those idiots are going to be shepherded through because they're not going to organize and they're actually counter-revolutionary now, you can create a managerial vanguard. You can create an expert class vanguard that's going to use corporate power, use fascist power to drive us through to create the biological foundation for socialism and the new sensibility throughout the population that would allow you to install the new technological rationality that will socialize people into the new socialist model of liberation and give you the opportunity for your utopian revolution that he sees just over the horizon. Thank you. That's the model. That's how it happened. That's how it changed. That's where Marxism underwent the crucial change of the 20th century. And if you didn't know that, you can't possibly understand what's going on now.
Oh,
and
shut the fuck
you're
up,
lost,
James. You have
and you're
no
like, James,
idea
it's
what's
not
going on
Marxism
right
or
now.
whoever else. It's not Marxism. It uses corporations. You don't know what the fuck's going on.
No,
basically.
James, you don't
And it
know what
happened
the
in
fuck is going
1969,
on.
So it's time to catch
You
the
are
fuck
the one
up.
that's unhinged from reality. It's not
to
everyone
be
else, James. It's
rude,
you.
But seriously, it's time to get with the program. You're not helping.
It's time to
with
do.
your
No,
trying to be
you're
smarter and saying
not
it's not
helping,
Marxism.
James. You're
You're
misinforming
missing
millions of people.
the literal entire picture.
You're
And
the
then,
one
like I
missing
said,
the
a
entire
decade
fucking
later,
picture,
this
James.
got
You don't even
taken
know what
by the
capitalism
US State
means.
Department and David Rockefeller
No mention of
to
parental
China
rights.
and implemented
No
as
mention
a
of
test
how
model
this is
in
about
China, in the
equity
People's Republic of China,
and
through Deng
abolishing
Xiaoping, who
hierarchies.
saw it, the
No mention of the
strategic
gender
advantage it would give
binary.
him,
No
and that's how
mention
you
of
get to
any
the
of this.
Communism 3.0. Go
Corporations,
listen to that
China,
podcast.
Mao. Blah, 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 blah. When you listen to real
Okay, we got
socialists,
two,
they denounce
two
Mao.
Marcuses left to go to finish this
Oh, good.
unit.
So more
Repressive
information
Tolerance
that's
comes out
not
in
relevant at all.
1965 as a chapter in the book Critique of Pure Tolerance. Herbert Marcuse writes...
This again, it's like every time I listen to James, I'm like, Carlin, you need to really and I know I'm creating a lot of content as it is, and I'm trying to finish this fucking book, but like every time I listen to James, I'm like, Carlin, you need to just double down on creating as much simple, plain English content as possible. Get it out there in classes, do more live classes, do more speeches, like anything fucking possible to counteract the bullshit that James is selling. But I only have so many hours in the day.
Society tolerate? Well, the fly in the soup of a classical liberal, the hard problem of classical liberalism. That's what we should really call it. Maybe I'll do a podcast about this someday. The hard problem
we're
of
talking about
classical
liberalism. Okay.
Which, by the way, it doesn't mean unsolvable. We're not woke right doomsday losers who've given up on the Constitution and liberty because they don't know how to solve this. We've tried nothing and we're all out of
classical
ideas.
liberals here.
We're not whiners. The hard problem of classical American liberalism is the paradox of tolerance. John Stuart Mill was unable to resolve it. He tried in his book On Liberty. Now, he wasn't an American. He was British. But he was unable to resolve it in On Liberty and punted and said basically that in the page 2. So it's not like it's buried in there and not that important. That at some point you just have to use authority to kick people's asses if they aren't going to do the right thing.
Is a thief.
Karl Popper did a little bit better with it. I'm not going to do the full discussion with everybody,
this is
but
called
Karl
a
Popper
reaction
outlined
video.
the so-called paradox of tolerance in
Has
1945.
James's audience literally never heard
So
of a
100
reaction
years
video?
after
These
John
people are
Stuart
so
Mill.
fucking
He
stupid.
outlines the paradox of tolerance in a footnote.
I'm literally writing
paragraph,
a book. Currently can't create her
in his book, The Open Society.
That's exactly
and
how
its
they talk
Enemies.
to you. That's how they sound.
And what he basically says
Peter's
is that
still
there's a
listening to
paradox
me.
to tolerance. That
Even
if you
though he's
are
banned
too
and he's never
tolerant
gonna be
of
allowed
the
back.
intolerant, eventually the tolerant will be destroyed by
Yeah.
intolerance.
Yeah,
So you
James, we're not
can't be
whiners.
tolerant
Also, James, Carlin
of
is a
intolerance,
narcissist, cluster B.
or
Michael
eventually
is
you'll be destroyed. But if you are intolerant of intolerance, you're intolerant, so you're not tolerant. So that's the paradox. There's no resolution to that. And I'm calling the paradox of tolerance the hard problem of classical liberalism. If you are going to allow people freedom, if you are going to grant them their liberty and secure their liberties, and consider that the just use of government, then you run into the paradox of tolerance, which is that you are the hard problem of classical
means that
liberalism,
the
which
left
is
wins.
that
Classical
you are
liberalism
going
means
to
the
run
left
into
wins.
intolerant factions trying to seize power without good ways to box them out of power.
Yep.
And using force becomes intolerant and somehow illegitimate. And this is a hard problem to solve, but I believe it can be solved,
It's
at least
not worth it.
in practice.
Ignore
it might
them.
be a moving
it's not
solution.
Worth it. Don't respond.
Popper only gives it a paragraph.
They want you to
and his
respond.
treatment is not very adequate
Candy,
as a
she's
result.
stuck
And
to
his
knitting. I am
paragraph
knitting.
essentially says
Literally
that when
am.
you have an
Doing both.
intolerant movement that's now
Again,
organizing
James's chat
and
is talking
moving
more about me
beyond
than they are
the
about
stage
James.
of
That means we're
mere
winning.
words to take up weapons and make direct threats, then it's time to exercise intolerance to box them out. But people have noted, and he was answering, how did the Nazis happen, writing in 1945. People have noted that you can whip up a huge problem that's basically unsolvable without ever getting to the violent rhetoric. You don't ever have to get to the violent rhetoric to get a big enough movement that it can now take control and then become violent after the fact that it's taken control. So it's not an adequate solution. I think that the key is solving this.
Sucks.
So here comes Herbert Marcuse in Repressive Tolerance in 1965.
This sucks.
And he's not going to solve this
I'd rather
problem.
be watching
He's going to
socialism
hijack
right
it.
now.
And that's very
One in the
important
chat.
because we live in
One
the
in the
logic
chat
of
if you'd
repressive
rather be
tolerance.
watching
I read this for the
socialism
first
than
time in
watching
2019.
James.
My life was
Two in the
changed
chat if you'd
immediately.
rather
I
be
realized
watching
this is the
James
world
instead
we
of
live
watching
in, and this is the
socialism.
monster we're fighting, and that's how I realized the problem we called woke, which I thought was mostly postmodern, was in fact Marxist. And I had to get to the bottom of it. So this is an extremely important essay, and it's pure totalitarianism. And what he's actually doing is staring down the paradox of tolerance and hijacking it for leftist ends.
We'd all rather,
so what
we would
he
all rather
argues
be
is that there
watching
are
socialism than watching
three possible organizational, on the broad strokes, ways of thinking about tolerance. He calls one democratic
this isn't even
tolerance.
real.
He
This
doesn't
is like
actually
watching a
define
fictional,
it, but you get the idea that it's generally what people will tolerate. It's like
on MTV or
it's
something.
like a floating window of tolerance.
Depressing.
And then
It's
in
depressing.
addition to democratic tolerance,
depressing.
there's this thing called repressive tolerance.
Yeah, I
It
like
gives
to laugh
the
at James.
essay its title. And repressive tolerance
No,
is
it's what we normally do here. We normally watch
They
radical
draw
revolutionary
strict lines
socialists.
and say, you can't be this way, you can't
Everyone
be that
would
way.
rather
That's
watch socialism than
abnormal,
watch
that's perverted,
James.
that's weird, that's inappropriate, that's outside of the bounds of politeness or whatever.
Yeah, we still got the
so
finale,
if you're
though.
up on your Rousseau, this is starting to sound very Rousseau.
Yeah, we want to
rebel
listen
against
to
the social
Sophie and
contract
Emmy
kind of
O'Brien.
stuff. Everywhere, man is born free, and everywhere he's in chains, and the chains
much
are
more
actually the
interesting.
social expectations put on you. Well, here it is. Repressive tolerance is not going to tolerate too much of being weirdos. It's 1965. So if you
Autumn's
want
in
blue
the-
hair, you're
Autum's
a
in
weirdo.
their
That's not
fucking
okay.
chat.
Somebody's going to beat you up. If you're going to be homosexual,
Yes,
somebody
Autumn,
might
you're
beat
still
you
fucking
up.
blocked.
If you're going to be racial minority and advocating for rights, somebody might beat you up. You know, that kind of thing. That's a repressive society, a repressive form of tolerance. They only tolerate that which they actually tolerate, and everything else is going to be repressed. And he says most of the essay is about how rotten that is. But his actual argument is that in practice, and of course this is how Marxists would do it,
We have
they
an
mix
Autumn
things that aren't the
redemption
same and treat them like they are the same in order to advance their opinion. He says
Tell
that in
Autumn
order
to create a new account.
to understand what's going on is that in a democratic society, that's actually how it already works. Democratic
It's gonna be
tolerance,
like
what people will
the
generally
unlikely hero comes
tolerate,
in. Autumn.
without having just a wide open field of anything goes, what people will generally tolerate is automatically a repressive tolerance. They repress anything they won't accept. Right, so he's taken the idea of like state repression by force, cultural repression by force, and by, in fact,
Hey, thanks,
other
Jane, I
cultural
appreciate you.
shunning and shame and all of this stuff. Mix them together. So he says repressive tolerance is obviously right out. That's basically, in fact, he says it's straight up fascism. He doesn't mince words on that. It's fascism, maybe not explicitly, but on a way.
Which is why classical liberalism can't work,
He says
James.
you have basically then repressive tolerance in every society unless it adopts what he calls liberating tolerance, which is a totally new way to look at tolerance. And it's the opposite of repressive tolerance. You could define repressive tolerance, although he doesn't, as a very limited range of tolerance. In fact, by nature, that which tolerates the status quo and nothing outside of it. Liberating tolerance is meant to liberate you from the status quo.
Oh, Peter's saying I
so
have
liberating
no income.
tolerance,
Okay.
in his own
Well,
words,
that's
is
not
defined
true, but
as
okay.
extending tolerance to movements from the left and withdrawing tolerance from movements from the right. Now, because we've been doing podcasts on Lenin, you recognize immediately that that's the role of the dictatorship of the proletariat under Lenin and under Marx and under Mao and the democratic centralism that Lenin and Mao set up. It's the same program, but now it's not done by the state.
Kevin.
It's
Maybe.
allowed
I'll
by
look
the
into
state.
that.
Maybe it's even favored by the state, but it's actually enabled at the cultural level. If it's leftist, it has to
Autumn,
be tolerated
create a new account and come back
because
over
it's in the
here.
name of liberation.
I won't
and if
ban
it's
you.
against
Just
leftism,
for today.
in other words, rightist, it has to be stopped. And that's not even a good definition for rightism. He goes on to say in this essay, in fact, that the thought must never enter the mind of the potential reactionary. Therefore, it requires not just censorship, but also something he calls pre-censorship. I think that therefore explains all of this social media suppression and censorship, but also the way the algorithms will prevent you or lead you to see certain information and what they call the attempts to suppress disinformation, misinformation, and malinformation. The thought must never enter the reactionary mind, so misinformation has to be dealt with. And that logic is clear and present here, and the technological rationality in order to control it is actually implemented upon us already, and we feel it. So that's the world that we actually live in. He actually advocates that. He says violence is always unethical, but when has the changing of history or the movement of history ever been concerned with ethics? In other words, he justifies violence to movements from the left and withdraws it movements from the right. We've talked in other podcasts about how that was in Mao Zedong and the Cultural Revolution, that the Red Guard were given a direct order from the Cultural Revolution group in Mao that nobody was allowed to stop them.
Hey, Judy,
or
I just
arrest
finished
them.
the
Even
three
the police,
circles.
if the Red Guards were beating a
three
police officer to
semicircles.
death, they were not to be stopped.
Section 1,
And we had
done.
this two-tier policing. Well, we see that now, especially with illegal immigrants and sometimes legal immigrants who have become problems in Western countries. I hear a lot from Britain about that right now, a lot from Europe, but we also see it here in the United States where people are getting off with very, very leftists and illegal immigrants, people that are basically favorable to democratic interests, are getting off on crime.
I saw someone post
and
a
allowed to
full
get away
image
with
of the
it.
shawl today
This
on
is
Instagram. It
reproducing
actually looks
the
really
conditions
cool. I'm
of the
actually really
Cultural
excited to knit
Revolution,
it.
and the logic of it comes in the West comes from repressive tolerance.
I might
from
add
Herbert
some more
Marcuse.
colors, though.
So it turns out in 68 and 69, as a matter of historical reference, there was an attempted cultural revolution in the United States, and it failed out through the West, too. May 1968, there was giant riots in Paris, and it failed. And
You
so
just
in
finished blocking
1972,
it? That's
Herbert Marcuse
awesome.
was pissed off,
It's a big shawl.
and he
It's a
wrote a
big-ass
book
shawl.
called Counter-Revolution and Revolt. And in that book, I'm not going to go into the details of it. I'm only going to mention that he explicitly calls for what Rudi Deuschke called the long march through the institutions, by name, invoking Deuschke,
Okay, well, that's
and
a problem I
naming
can't
the
fix
long
right
march
this
through the
second,
institutions.
Kevin,
And he
so
says what that
relax.
is basically going back to Gramsci. Like I said, the seeds of all of this are there. That what he says is going to happen is that everybody needs to go into the various professions and bring their ideology with them. The idea is now we're going to take the effect the culture produce. Remember, the target of critical Marxism is the culture industry itself.
Wait, Autumn's in with
now he's saying
Autum's in with a
shit
second
that didn't
account.
work. We have to also do the cultural infiltration model of cultural Marxism. And he says in particular that the infiltration has to take place. He mentions computer programmers.
Autumn, come
He says
over
you
here
go
with
in
that
and
account.
You do the job. You're a computer programmer. But while you're there, you're a Marxist. You're
Look at my
always spreading
Substack,
Marxist
carlin.substack.com.
ideology.
I'm
So
working
you're
on a
not
book
like
right
a
now. It should be out
radical
before the end of the year.
washout who's protesting on the street and refusing to go to work. Now you're going in and getting a job and being an agitator, just like Lenin's idea of bringing agitation into all classes. And the agitprop. Well, now this is what you're going to do, but you're also going to do your job. You're going to put on your suit.
Oh,
You're going to
Autumn
dress like
bringing
a
up
Republican so
Nexum.
you can
Oh,
speak like
shit. Autumn's about
a anarchist, as the saying sometimes goes. But he says most importantly,
Autumn,
this
tell
has to
everyone
happen by
to
going
listen to
into
me.
all levels of education. And so that's where you see the long march through the institutions no longer
James
being
has
in the
no idea what
streets,
he's in
but
for
rather
there. That's
going
not our
into
fault.
K through 12
Autumn is not our
education, colleges of
responsibility.
education, and universities overwhelmingly.
Oh, this is the part where
Which
James talks about
obviously
something
we
I
all
taught
are
him.
familiar with at this point, and I don't need to elaborate on. And that was Critical Marxism, Unit 3. I don't want to drag this out forever, but we do have to talk about woke Marxism. We're at 2.5 hours. I thought I could do this in 2. Boo. So woke Marxism is the Marxism of today. This has grown out of the critical Marxist turn in the 60s, particularly the Marcuse's turn, as it
somewhat true.
infused through
Not
students,
exactly,
Marcuse
somewhat
to students, students to radical activists in groups like the Black Panthers, feminists.
No, that's
and
not.
so
No,
on.
that's not what we're dealing with today.
And
No,
there's,
no, no.
so there's been
no,
this
no.
revolving door
No.
in the whole buildup of woke Marxism.
Nope, that's not what we're dealing with today. James is going to leave out the part about the queer radicals in the 60s entirely. What we are dealing with today is it is a mutated strain of Marxism that is heavily influenced by queer radicals, queer anarcho-communists starting in the 60s, but really heavily in the 80s, which James is never going to talk about. That's what's actually influencing what we're dealing with today.
Activist scholars. I don't remember which way we phrased it. But both are right back in Cynical Theories when I wrote that with Helen. So the target of woke Marxism is different. Woke means you woke up to something. I'm having this argument right now trying to define the woke right. Woke means you woke up to something. You woke up to a new consciousness of the world. And that consciousness is predicated on the idea that the world is structured by systems of power that exclude people like you, group identity. The world is constructed by systems of power by a ruling class to exclude people like you. That's what you woke up to. That's why woke right works. By the way, the woke right realize that the world has been constructed by systems of power to exclude people like them.
No
Christians,
one say anything
white,
about the
male,
Jews.
so on. And they've leaned into that identity victimhood even more than they've leaned into understanding the theory of agitation that's driving them in the dialectical process that's pushing them to adopt that perspective.
Wrong, James.
But the goal of woke Marxism, the target, I should say, is to transform individual consciousness. It's not just to awaken class consciousness or even a critical consciousness.
Here's where it's getting
It's
Gnostic.
now every individual is going to have their their consciousness woke up to understand that they are part of some set of groups or some group. If you're in a set of groups, you're in a group too. You're in some group that the system has been rigged to be unfair to, or that is the group that is unfairly benefiting from that arrangement. So everybody's going to be seen in terms of group identity, but you are going to have a personal awakening now. It's not just taking on class consciousness and solidarity. You're going to have a personal awakening. In other words, you're going to be born again, or as Paulo Freire put it, born again on the side of the oppressed. Dead, you die to your old identity and are reborn on the side of the oppressed. And this actually derives particularly from Mao Zedong and his push through cultural transformation through the late 1950s.
James, we love you, foolish, unhinged, and confused, academic, woke, right, Zionist, atheist. So glad we have Dr. Carlin teaching us what the real left are.
Who was looking for a
Thank you,
ideological
Daniel. I really
remolding,
appreciate
a
it.
thought reform, a brainwashing, a personal transformation. Remember when I said earlier with the transcendent Marxism of Karl Marx and Economic Philosophic Manuscript
No one
that
has
there had to
sent
be
James
a
super
qualitative
chats. At least I'm
change of who
making
you
money
were?
here.
Well, that's actually what the biological foundation for socialism and new sensibility of Herbert Marcuse was, is that there had to be a qualitative change of who you were. That's why the socialist
If you guys
societies
really want to
failed
piss
to
James off,
transform with
send in
their
some super
captured
chats.
technological rationality, is they didn't have a
Help me
qualitative
make more
change
money with
according to Herbert
lesser
Marcuse.
audience than James is going to make
Woke
on this
Marxism is
podcast.
designed to
That'd be
create
pretty great.
that qualitative
That would
change
be like the
in the
ultimate
individual.
fuck you.
It is a born-again
No, I'm more
revival
right-leaning than
religion
Trump
of
by a
Marxism.
significant degree.
It's born-again
Trump is a
Marxists.
Democrat.
That's
No,
what
I
woke
don't like him.
Marxism is.
I don't like Democrats.
Its primary feature that we would recognize is intersectionality, which derives directly from Herbert Marcuse through people like Angela Davis. Angela Davis was a radical black activist who was his
True.
PhD student. She said she was radicalized twice, once under Marcuse and once in Palestine. So there's
not voting
that
for
connection
anyone.
for you. And she inspired a range of black feminist activists, including the members of the Combahee River Collective, who penned the first idea that race, sex, class, sexuality, and so on. They were black feminist lesbians, socialist Marxists or something, who they said that race, sex, class, all of these things are interwoven, interlinked. They did not use the word intersectional. That term comes from Kimberly Crenshaw and Patricia Hill Collins. Kimberly Crenshaw named it in 1989, I believe. Her famous,
James has
more famous
skipped
paper is
over queer
1991.
anarchists
So that
entirely.
gives you some
Notice he doesn't even
timeline.
mention
The
them
Combahee
because he
River
doesn't know they
Collective was in the
exist.
mid-1970s. I think they made their manifesto in 77.
No, I didn't see the
I did a
thing Bach
podcast about
tweeted.
it where all the details are right. I'm
Hey,
just doing this from memory.
Molly! Happy
So
anniversary,
77,
Molly! That's really cool.
89,
It's on
it kind of
Halloween.
fomented in academic and activist circles. Crenshaw codifies it in 89, strengthens it in 91. Patricia Hill Collins' first book, which is called Black Feminist Thought, that touches on this issue, is in 90. And then she had another book, I think 93, that was called Intersectionality. And again, this is on the edges of my recollection, so fact check me. I might be wrong. I apologize. But what they developed was an American Maoism. They imported Mao's identity politics using American civil rights identity categories.
Oh, it's
That's
Finley's. Yeah,
literally
Finley's ballot
what
was
they
great.
built. Marcuse's ghetto populations became the basis for a Maoist identity politics. Now, I've talked about the Maoist identity politics before. I'll very briefly summarize. This is too long already, and I've got a lot to cover still, as it turns out, to get through woke. So here's the basics. Mao's identity politics, Mao separated the population into two groups. The enemies of the people were coded black. The people were coded red for communism. So the people were the good ones, and they were listed as the laborers who carry hammers, the peasants who carry sickles, and then revolutionaries of various sorts, revolutionary leaders, revolutionary soldiers, so people in the People's Liberation Army, revolutionary martyrs, people who died for the cause.
He's trying to equate
Revolutionary
it to
leaders were
Maoism,
sometimes
but
called
Maoism is not
cadres,
what's going on in the United States. It's
however you want.
Leninism. It's
So
Bolshevism.
you had these two token categories plus
They're not
a bunch
the same
of revolutionaries. And so you couldn't join the token categories very easily, but you could become a revolutionary. Then on the other hand, the black categories were listed as enemies of the people, and they were rich farmers, which meant really still being super poor. Landlords, we still hate landlords because you have to overcome all
because
feudalism.
they're private property owners, James.
And then counter-revolutionaries,
James sucks at this
bad
so
elements,
bad.
as they were
He
called,
sucks
and right-wingers.
so bad.
So you can hear how that structure was all laid out. You have then these kind of scapegoats, the landlords and the rich farmers who really didn't do anything wrong except happen to own certain things, and they get bullied and mistreated. And then you have
Because
the
they're
enemies of the
property
state that
owners.
are actually your counter-revolutionaries, whatever the hell a bad element is. I think we call them conspiracy theorists and so on today. And then right-wingers in general. And the goal was to hound the rich, to hound the people in general.
Oh, Mitchell's back again.
In the name of counter-revolutionary activity, in order to scare them to want to pledge
No,
to
it's not
socialism. And the way that
Stalinism,
you'd get them
Mitchell.
to
Not
pledge to socialism
Stalinism.
was
It's
they couldn't
Leninism, not
become one of
Stalinism.
the token classes. They had
Not
to become a revolutionary.
Stalinism. It's
So you
not
were building your
Stalinism
revolutionary
is
army in
Maoism,
that way
Mitchell.
by basically abusing the population in the name of counter-revolutionary
Mitchell's going to
elements,
get banned
which
over
are
a chat
relatively
that's
small,
wrong.
to push the
No,
masses of the people to join the
Mitchell!
revolution, to become
See, there he
revolutionary revolutionary cadres, or at least party members, or at least on the road to socialism, and to
Leninism,
engage
not
in,
Stalinism.
or
Stalin ruined
ideological remolding,
everything.
especially if you're an intellectual. You had to transform your thinking to be
all
in line
good,
with the
it's
Maoist, what they called Mao Zedong thought, which was later sometimes described as Marxism-Leninism with Chinese
Autumn's back
characteristics.
in one of our other accounts.
So American Maoism is Mao's identity politics with
Not
American
Maoism.
civil
Oh, you
rights
deleted
identity
it? Okay.
categories. So instead of having
I promise
the
you,
tokens
James knows
be
what's going
laborers
on
and
right now.
peasants,
I promise you.
your
We're not
tokens now
new at
become
this.
people of color, particularly black or indigenous, sexual
You're
minorities,
new
gender
here. That doesn't
minorities,
mean
women,
that
sometimes
we are
when they're
new
not
here.
oppressors because of trans, and so on. And then your revolutionary classes become allies.
Someone can ask that
activists,
though. Isn't what's
various
going
types of
like I've
radicals,
seen
Antifa,
someone say
anarchists,
like
trans,
but James,
queer
I've
identities.
seen communists
Meanwhile, on the other
specifically
hand,
denounce
you have
Stalin
the
and Mao.
people that get
Isn't what's
targeted
going on today
unfairly that are like
Leninism?
rich farmers and landlords. The scapegoat
Again,
classes,
what you
and
wanna
those are
say
like
is-
white people, straight people.
What you
men-
want to say is, James, I've seen communists in the United States specifically denounce Mao and Stalin. Isn't what's going on today Leninism?
and so on. And you see the
No
exact mapping
spamming yet. We're
under
going to do that later.
intersectionality
We're almost
of this
there.
onto new identity categories that aren't constructed out of basic communist theory applied to peasants, but are constructed instead out of American civil
I've
rights
seen communists in the
identity
U.S.
categories.
specifically
Now, none of this
denounce
really gets off the
Mao
ground.
and Stalin.
Critical theory
Isn't
was
what's
really
going
stuck
on
without two
Leninism?
influences, one of which is postmodernism. This is not a podcast in which I'm going to elaborate on postmodernism. I never actually end up going into detail about postmodernism. And the
I'm
other is critical
shocked.
pedagogy or education theory. And really, critical pedagogy is where woke was born because it mixed all
Look,
this crap
Carla's
together.
warning
The
them that it's
activists
coming
were
because
doing
Carla's listening to
intersectionality,
us because
but
she's not
frankly
actually
and
listening to what
honestly,
James is saying
education
because she
theory
doesn't
is where
actually
the
care about learning
ideas
things. She just
really
wants
took
drama
their
on the
shape.
internet.
Because the whole
But
point
she didn't
was to
learn
figure out how
anything
to
here
create
either, so-
individual consciousness awakening through educational processes in
Has
schools
James
and
become a
workplace
communist?
trainings.
Guys,
How about
someone do
that?
the Stalin thing.
So
Come
let me
on.
talk briefly about postmodernism. Postmodernism is, in a sense, a
someone just
Marxist
got that
theory.
comment. Well, good thing
This
I
is
got it
maybe
on
a high
video.
level way to put it. It's
That wasn't
it's a
actually
belief
me, but-
that how do I put this?
Thank you.
Symbols, knowledge itself is all an instrument
Thank
of
you,
power.
Zebra.
And in fact, I was going to say it's a Marxist theory of meaning making. That's maybe
Oh,
too
and it's
abstract.
good.
Certain people
Oh,
are
it's
allowed
good.
to put
James
meaning
doesn't
into
want
symbols.
people
What
to
does
know
this
that
book
it's
mean?
not
What
Maoism.
does
Communists
calculus
denounce
mean?
Mao.
What does the stop sign really mean?
Now someone asked.
What
Now
does,
someone asked.
the written
James,
word mean?
why are
What
you
does this
deleting comments
word,
about
like the
communists
N-word
denouncing
really
Mao?
represent? What does this represent? What does that represent? What does this
Only if you
symbol,
have
what
an
does that
extra
symbol?
account.
What is this movie?
James,
what
why
is
are
this
you deleting
culture as a
comments
symbolic
about
object? What
communists
does
in
it
the
all
United
mean?
States
Well, certain
denouncing
people have
Mao?
the power to set that, and those people are the powerful people. And then other people
James, why are you
excluded
deleting
from that
comments
power
about
and are forced to
communists
play in that
specifically
playground,
denouncing Mao?
that is set up that way.
Isn't
And
that
so
relevant to what we're
creates an
talking
oppressor
about?
versus oppressed dynamic. But the deal is with postmodernism is everybody's sort of immersed into the power structure. And so nobody in particular has
Look, they're
has
under
any
Carlin
knowledge of
spells
who
because
is
they're all on
oppressed and
SSRIs.
oppressor.
Yeah,
So
that's it. I
everybody's
gave
kind of
everyone
both.
SSRIs.
And it's sort of this
Yeah, that's exactly
mixed
it,
up,
Carla.
confusing terrain
Crazy cunt.
in which actually reality just gets lost in a sea of images.
That's the
And,
level of
and a
James's
sea of
audience's
symbols
intellect
and a
right
sea
there.
of,
Everyone's on drugs.
your meaning making is no better than my meaning making. And
Come on, guys.
that which
Why,
has been historically
James?
marginalized
Why are you
is
deleting
often
comments
favored.
about
What this
communists
actually builds
denouncing
out, and
Mao?
we'll talk
Isn't
more
that
about this
relevant
in a
to what we're
minute,
talking
is
about?
as it fuses with critical theory thinking, which was running alongside of it, and many of the same people had picked up elements of both, is it starts to adopt this idea that which they don't want you to do is probably better, is probably more true. That which they don't want you to think is probably more
Yeah,
more
we've gone
accurate,
from their
more
all stock
true.
accounts to Carlin drug them.
Anything
Yeah.
that they say you should think is probably a unjust
Westcott, in
application
with the
of
win
power
again.
and a lie. So that which has been historically marginalized
Westcott in
is
in
where you
for the
eventually
win.
get is probably
Oh,
more
Westcott
true.
banned!
We call that, or it was called,
Immediately
I shouldn't
banned.
say,
I got
it
the
is called
screenshot, though. Don't worry.
critical constructivism, which is an
You
awful
know,
lot of
Lucy,
damn
I was
words.
actually looking
So
for
the
it today. I
key
couldn't
part of
find
this,
it.
and
I
I'm
almost
not-
I wanted to
people
wear it
that
today,
listen to this
but
are gonna be
I don't
pissed
know where
off
the
at how
fuck it went.
bad my summary of postmodernism is here. I made 0 notes for this, so we're just winging.
0 notes.
Critical
Excellent.
constructivism has 2 pieces: critical, which is critical theory, and constructivism, which is
Why is
something to do
James's
with social
audience spending more
constructs,
time listening to me than they
constructionism,
are listening to James?
or
That might be a good
constructivism,
question.
Sorry, social construct, constructivism. So the idea of that is that the features of society
almost
are
all my
social
streams are breaking down the
artifacts. They're
radical
socially
revolutionary socialist left. You're
constructed.
welcome to
They're
check out my
not
content
real,
anytime.
and we are socialized into believing that they are real.
True.
Ding, Lukács's social reification.
We listen
becomes
to
very
actual
real.
activists, not
We
make
are,
shit up on the internet.
that which we believe is true is actually only truthy, as Stephen Colbert had it. It's truthy as truthiness. It's not actually true.
That's how
It's
we
just
know
we
that real
generally agree
communists
to
denounce Mao and Stalin, because
observe
we
it as
actually hear
true,
them
to
say it.
consider it
James
as
doesn't
true.
listen to them say it, but
That
we do.
has a fancy term under the postmodern philosopher Jean-François Lyotard. He calls that the legitimation by paralogy. Paralogy is
person
a
we're
false
listening to,
parallel
bro.
logic. Parallel logic, paralogy. And legitimation by paralogy refers to legitimizing something through a fake parallel logic, and that fake parallel logic is essentially consensus. That's what we agree is true, is what we pretend is true. So everything is truthy, nothing is true.
Okay,
Therefore,
does
there's
everyone
your truth
have
and
an
there's my
account
truth.
working in James's
And if we
chat?
have to favor
Put
one
one
truth
in my
over the
chat
other,
if you
that
have
which
a
has been
working account in
historically
James's chat,
marginalized was
please.
probably done so for nefarious reasons by power. So it's more likely to be true than not true. And that's
We got
how
to
we
gear
do it.
up for
That's the
our
social
grand finale. If
constructivist
you do not
part
have an
of
account that
this.
works in
And
James's
then
chat, now's
critical
your last
theory
chance to
tells you
create
that
one.
this is how we're going to look at it. So we're going to look for the existing unjust power structures and ruthlessly
We're going to do our
criticize
grand finale.
them, not just as features of reality that deserve to be destroyed because all that exists deserves to perish, but also as social constructions that are arbitrary and subject to change. So that's a very important
Well, are you coming
aspect
back?
of this. But we're not going to digress into postmodernism any further. We could talk about Foucault and his idea of power knowledge and biopolitics, and it's all very important for what we're living through right now. In fact,
Excellent. We
the
got
COVID policy was
everyone
all
has to
exactly what
participate in the
Foucault was
grand
warning
finale,
about
guys.
with biopolitics,
Everyone has to
where
participate,
science steps
okay?
in and tells you how
Everyone.
the world really,
No
the science, I
excuses.
should say, steps in and tells you how the
Make
world
sure you're
really works, but it's only
subscribed.
doing so in order to
Make sure you
entrench
can
its own power and
participate.
advantage. We just lived through that, but it's not cultural Marxism. It's too far afield. Plus, they weaponized it against us. So Foucault's critiques are actually kind of, almost exactly accurate to the COVID policies, and I can't really complain, even though I
will
hate
give
Foucault
I will
and his
give people a
leftist
heads
ways.
up. Don't worry.
We need to talk about the development of woke far more about critical pedagogy. I just want to make the final
I will tell
point
you guys
about
when to go.
postmodernism,
Don't worry
though,
about it.
that critical constructivism
True.
as the real grown-up name for woke, what you've woken up to is as it's described by its creator, a critical constructivist worldview. In other words, the world is constructed by systems of power. There is no shared reality between us. Each of us has a reality that's colored by our relationship
is
or
as good as
position
mine.
with regard to power. That's the postmodern part. And that the correct way to deal with that is through critical theory type critique. And that is what woke really means. And if we're going to accept that that's what woke means, we have to recognize, for example, when Jordan Peterson used to call woke, what we call woke now, he called it postmodern neo-Marxism. He was actually exactly correct. Critical theory or critical Marxism is also known as neo-Marxism.
Wow.
And if you were to add a postmodern element to that, you would end up with a postmodern neo-Marxism. And that would be the correct term for it. And so I encourage people to think about that it is critical theory done with a postmodern fast and loose about the truth, because there is no truth. There is only subjective truth that is located and established falsely by power that wishes to benefit from claims about truth, which is a completely subjectivist realm, which is far beyond the purely relative and self-serving realm of Marxism. It's much more negative and pessimistic than Marxism. Sometimes postmodernism is referred to as a post-Marxist theory that is actually even so negative that it abandoned Marxism. I think it's more accurate to say that it is, because it does criticize Marxism as having failed in hopelessness, but I think it's more accurate to say that it is a Marxist oppressor versus oppressed theory of meaning making and the assignment of meaning to symbols, in all abstract symbols. It's also a purely negative theology or completely negative dialectic, and it is supercharged in particular through Foucault's love of Nietzsche. Nietzsche's belief was actually that you become the Superman, the Übermensch, by breaking away from any restraint from morals. And so Foucault believed that morals are an arbitrary social construct, and if we could free ourselves from those and be liberated from them, we're not just going to free the libido baby, we're going to free everybody from everything. And you can just imagine that world. Okay, so critical pedagogy is where woke was actually born, and we did need to touch on that because eventually postmodernism gets mixed into education. I'll touch on that. But critical pedagogy actually derives from the education for liberation, as it was called, of
the 40 questions are not going to continue.
Paulo
We'll just stop and listen and learn something, but this is ridiculous.
Podcasts on Paulo Freire, so I encourage you, if you're interested, I read one of his entire books as a podcast series, to go look him up. That is Paulo. Paulo. Freire is Freire.
Yeah, that's fine, Sam.
I encourage you to go look him up. Paulo Freire was a liberation theologian and a post-colonialist. So he lived in Brazil, Recife, Brazil specifically, and in the 1920s or 30s, I forget, his family was badly dispossessed by
our Coddle on Rumble says, I think you and James are on the same side. No, we're not. We're not on the same side in any way.
And the stories
and
are
that's his
horrific,
fault because he's fucking insane.
He had a tough
If you think
time.
James and I are on the same side, you have not interacted with any of my content at all. I'm sorry. That's just ridiculous.
He starts to pick up some Marxist theory from one of his
James is the biggest fucking obstacle that we have in terms of educating people what is actually going on. This is not a fucking game. We are not on the same team.
Integralist who was fast-tracked to bishop
the biggest
status,
fucking thing standing in the way of educating real people.
Known as the bishop of the slums or of the favelas, or the priest of the slums. And so he started learning some communism there, but he was primarily post-colonialist. But he developed a method of education. His goal was to teach these poor peasants who he saw being crushed by the imposition of colonialist capitalism. He wanted to teach them to read.
Colonialist capitalism,
and
two words that mean the same thing.
He came up with a method that is very unique to the Portuguese language. It might
not
work
only
in
is he
Spanish
not teaching people,
so
he is purposefully confusing them and lying to them.
But the primary thing that he did was he pushed this concept educationally called generative themes. And generative themes are emotionally engaging topics. So that how do you get the peasants to want to learn? This is where you talk about getting the kids engaged in our education today. How do you get them to want to learn?
Okay, here's what...
You talk to them to find out what engages.
Here's what we're going to do for the finale. And I don't know, James, why not get on a Zoom call with Carlin? That's fucking funny. That's not one of us, but that's fucking funny. Guys, just to prepare everyone for the finale, I don't know when he's going to wrap this up. We could still have some time yet. But what we're going to do for the finale is I want everyone to put in his chat, like spam his chat with something like, Carlin is a way better teacher. Everyone needs to listen to Carlin. James doesn't know what he's talking about. Listen to Carlin. Use my full name, direct them to my channel. That's what we want. So craft your own statement, whatever you feel like around that theme. Like, James doesn't know what he's talking about. Listen to Carlin. Carlin will show you what real Marxists are saying. Anything around that theme. If you want me to look at a line you have, put it in the chat. I'll let you know if it's okay or if I would do something different. But honestly, say whatever you want to say around that theme. Craft your statement. Get it ready to go so you can copy and paste it. And we're gonna be spamming his chat when that happens. And so you're gonna be putting as many in as possible all at the same time. Okay? So I'm gonna tell you when to go. Do not do anything until I tell you when to go, because we want basically a wall of this on his stream. I'm just preparing you so you can be ready. Thank you, Rottweiler, for the super chat.
In Portuguese. So you awaken them, you radicalize them by feeding them directly to their personal context, individual personal context.
But it's better if everyone comes up with something
unique. A Marxist understanding, and a post-colonial understanding, and a woke literally, this is where woke starts, right there. A woke understanding, a Marxist understanding of their individual circumstances, whether the oppression is race, whether it's environment, whether it's class, whether it's colonial status, it doesn't matter. Whether it's literacy status, that was a big one for him.
No, he doesn't provide people with the history. He provides people with a half-cocked version of the history that's wrapped in Gnosticism bullshit. It is not the actual history. It's James's made-up version of
learning class
history.
Consciousness, of radicalization, to radicalize them into what Freire called a critical consciousness, which extends way beyond class consciousness into understanding that revolution has to come about to overthrow these conditions, but then must also be perpetual. There is no end to revolution.
It's not good to do that. You can't put links in.
Revolt.
No links.
The ruthless criticism
links won't
of all
show
that
up.
exists.
So just say my name.
And he said that this all requires a personal transformation that he literally describes as a personal Easter. He says that there must be a death and rebirth of the individual on the side of the oppressed.
True.
You must die to your old self to be reborn on the side of the oppressed. And his disciple, Henry Giroux, who's a Canadian-American,
Great, Sam.
American-Canadian, I forget which way that works. He was in Boston or the Massachusetts and Rhode Island area. He was in Rhode Island as a teacher when he stumbled on Paulo Freire and radicalized himself. He was already a leftist teacher. His conservative high school wasn't letting him do leftist teaching methods. A democratic classroom was something he was interested in. That's where the students are in charge, by the way. And you should be familiar with that at this point.
That's true.
And he finally gets in trouble for it, reads Paulo Freire, has a religious conversion. And he describes Paulo Freire's method as prophetic. That's the word he uses. And he says that it is prophetic in the sense that it calls us to build the kingdom of God here on earth in solidarity with the oppressed. Very close to a direct quote in the foreword to the book, The Politics of Education, which Henry Giroux wrote. Paulo Freire wrote The Politics of Education. Henry Giroux wrote the foreword, to be clear. And I've read that a bunch of times, so I don't have to elaborate. But just to give you a very clear indication that this is a religion, woke is
not a religion just because
death
James
and rebirth,
says it is.
personal experienced Easter, according to Paulo Freire. And that is literally to build the kingdom of God here on earth by awakening consciousness through this radicalization process that Paulo Freire referred to as education for liberation. What Henry Giroux did was he took Paulo Freire's work, and not only did he mainline that into American colleges and Canadian colleges.
Okay, so James put a filter on the chat to block out my name. Okay.
Professors tenured in those. He called that his most important
That's helpful,
praxis.
Autumn. Thank you.
But he also incorporated his existing knowledge of what he referred to as the European theorists.
Can people come
That's
up with a
vague term,
creative
like
way
Herbert
to say
Marcuse's ghetto
James sucks?
populations.
Listen to.
But the European theorists, primarily for Giroux, include Herbert Marcuse and the postmodernist Jacques Derrida.
See, I can't say it on the
He
internet.
does do some with Foucault
I want
and the
people
other postmodernists.
I want people to come up with a creative way to say my name without saying my name specifically. Because he put a filter on the chat so you can't mention it.
Marx, Lenin,
Thank you,
and
Autumn.
Mao written through his stuff. His primary European theorists are Marcuse and Jacques Derrida. We're not going to talk about the Jacques Derrida and his post-structuralism here, which is a wing of postmodernism. We'll leave it be. But that's where the postmodern infusion it's one of the places that this happens. I mean, to get into the full details of this is like this could be like 10 podcasts. Giroux is responsible for mixing Paulo Freire's education for liberation with the European theorists, and what came out along with the democratic classroom
Autumn
approach,
is on our team.
which
Autumn
extended
loves us,
Freire's
even though I
ideas and
blocked
added
her.
his own. What comes out is called critical pedagogy. Critical pedagogy is the model of education.
Look
Your
at this.
kids go to schools that are ruled by critical
Autumn
pedagogy,
is fucking helping
which
us.
is why I say
Autumn
we
is
live
helping
in
us.
Herbert Marcuse's world, and your kids go to Paulo Freire's schools. Critical pedagogy is called by
have to let
that
Autumn
name
back in the
still
chat
to this
after
day,
this.
but we more frequently hear about it as culturally relevant teaching, which was in 1995 developed
use a dash.
directly as a translation by Gloria Ladson Billings from critical pedagogy into the domains like critical race theory specifically. In 1995, she wrote 2 papers about culturally relevant teaching and 1 paper called Toward a Critical Race Theory of Education. Those were her 3 major papers in 1995. That's a busy year for an academic. And you can see what the point is. But she's very clear that culturally relevant pedagogy
Guys, be
is the
prepared to try
extension of
multiple
critical
versions of my
pedagogy,
name if it doesn't show up.
into the
Okay, we're going to be
domain
able to
of
see what
critical
shows up with the
race
chat on our
theory.
screen.
And so we frequently will hear it culturally relevant teaching, culturally relevant education, culturally responsive education, culturally sensitive education, culturally, cultural competence. These are all terms that you'll hear. Culturally relevant pedagogy. These are all just critical pedagogy using the American Maoist intersectional identity categories. And that is what our education is based on. And it comes directly from Paulo Freire through Henry Giroux, through Gloria Ladson Billings, down to the present day. One other education theorist, and this is crucial to mention because what I just talked about, is Joe Kinchelow. Joe Kinchelow worked under both, he died in 2008 or 9. He worked under both Henry Giroux and Paulo Freire. And he was, I believe, if I'm not mistaken, at McGill University in Canada, but I sometimes
that's a good
mess
one,
that
Zero.
up. I might have it wrong. But he is the creator of what was called the critical constructivism that I mentioned earlier, or critical constructivist epistemology. He wrote a book that's very hard to get a hold of. Our friend Logan Lansing managed to get one and has lent it to me basically maybe forever. I don't know. I need to give it back to him at some point, but I'm not done with it. Titled Critical Constructivism, where he lays this out. He says explicitly that it's a worldview. It's explicitly that reality is constructed by power. There's your constructivist part that needs critical theory. Thus, we can reconstruct reality according to our desires. This isn't a podcast to go into the full expanse of critical constructivism.
That doesn't spell my last name correctly, though. Put like an underscore it or something.
Woke. It is that you are believing that reality is constructed by systems of power.
Make sure you guys spell my name right if you're going to fuck around with the letters.
You are thrust into, so they construct you to. He explicitly calls it a worldview, which means a religion, and that you can use critical theory to reconstruct reality differently if you want. And so woke Marxism actually developed primarily, at least in academic circles, in two places.
We just hit the 3-hour mark, and
One
I know
is
this
in
is
critical
about 3
pedagogy,
hours. It might be
and
a
then
little bit
another,
more, but
which I'm not going to spend very much time on, is
ready to
in
go.
feminism. Feminism is, in fact,
I don't know how
the
much longer he's
significant
gonna
vehicle behind a lot of this. I'm not going to go into the development of queer theory directly out of feminism, which makes feminists very mad.
Feminism is liberating women from the gender binary. That's socialism.
Habitat is being mad, so we'll let that be for the moment. But what feminism did was feminism was desperate to destroy the gender binary, and it appropriated any damn thing it could do. To do it. There's a whole Marxist feminist school. There are deep ties to Marxism and feminism. There's a lot of revolutionary feminism in that regard that all developed very heavily in the universities. So when we say that infiltrate education at all levels, we can talk about African American studies programs. We can talk about schools of education. Feminists in English departments did more of this than anybody. Actually, education in English departments. Feminists did this more than anybody. They brought more what we now recognize as woke into the university system, into law, than any other group, bar none. So they are while woke theory was forged in education, woke was built on the back of feminism. That's why it's so damn effeminate.
What?
That's why young women are so susceptible to it, while young men are much less.
Feminism.
Young men only got into woke because they wanted to be able to date young women who got sucked into it, and now they've wised up and realized that's a doomsday trap for the rest of their lives, so they're not doing that anymore.
No, that's a
horrible idea. The reason young women are so
Don't
susceptible to woke is because woke is Marxism, cultural Marxism, that passed through the lens of feminism and was forged for application through the lens of critical education theory. That's why young women, it is a feminist reinterpretation of identity Marxism or identity Maoism. And so the feminists, for example, worked directly with.
Look, woke was built on the back of feminism. That's a great quote, except it's completely fucking wrong. And this is why James and I are not on the same team.
The feminists were one of the
what James just said is completely wrong.
The black feminists were direct inheritors of Herbert Marcuse's theories
He
and
is
philosophy,
making shit up that is not hinged into reality with what real socialists are saying and doing.
Were smashed by the black feminists who invented intersectionality to smash other feminists specifically, and to conquer them and consolidate power by accusing them of being racist for doing their feminism the way that they had been. Feminists, in their desperation to destroy the gender binary, imported French postmodernism from France into the United States, Canada, and the United Kingdom and Australia. The first women's studies department was in Australia, as a matter of fact.
Judy, use a zero in my last name instead of the A.
Because Foucault, to a degree, and Derrida, to a far greater degree, allowed them to deconstruct gender.
Because that's more accurate.
Allowed them to queer theory is more relevant there, because Foucault allowed them to deconstruct sexuality and to link it to sex and gender, which they did. But the goal was to deconstruct gender roles or sex roles so overwhelmingly and to decouple sex and gender.
Like what I just put in the chat.
That they imported the postmodern deconstruction methods to do so, particularly at the English department at Yale. So The French don't like postmodernism. They don't look at it. They never really got into it. They always thought it was a bit goofy and intellectually showy. The only people who ever gave a rat's ass about postmodernism were two groups of people, and not the education theorists all that much. One, American or Western, I guess I should say American, somewhat Canadian, somewhat Australian, somewhat British, but American in particular feminists, and post-colonial theorists like Edward Said and Gayatri Spivak and Homi Bhabha, which were deeply postmodernist in their interpretations of colonial theory, colonialism, and so on. They incorporated the post-colonial radicalism of Frantz Fanon and turned it into postmodern gobbledygook that is virtually unreadable, and got its foothold
That's how
in the
James
American
is teaching.
university systems.
They created
which
postmodern
downstream from
gobbledygook that is
every bit
virtually
of this
unreadable. No, it's not, James.
Pro-Palestine, anti-Israel hate that we have going on right now.
No,
and those
it's
have
not.
always run in parallel.
Yeah, Sis
That's why you
says
have
search
queer
for the
theorist
actively
and
unwoke
feminist
Substack
Judith
on more
Butler,
info on Rumble.
to
That's a
this
really
day
good one,
rambling
guys.
about
And
the need to
thanks
be
for everyone on Rumble.
pro-Palestine.
I know I'm not interacting with you
Okay,
guys as
so
much because I have two
feminists
chats
imported
going,
most
but I
of the
appreciate everyone on
postmodernism.
Rumble.
They were rampant in their
I'm gonna put
critiques,
this in the
although
chat
they
on
didn't
Rumble,
adopt
the
nearly as
link
much
to the
critical
stream,
theory.
just
Some
in
of
case
them,
you guys don't
especially
have
the
it.
black feminists, picked up most of Herbert Marcuse's methods, crushed the other feminists. There's like 30 branches
Everyone
of
get
feminism,
ready
and they
to
don't agree with each
spam
other.
his chat as
And the one
soon
that
as he
won out
starts
is
to wrap up.
intersectional feminism, period, the end. And that is the mixture of a little bit just enough of this postmodern theory to be able to do whatever they want, and deconstruct whatever they want, and take apart whatever they want, and have their own truths.
There's still 40 minutes
combined
left.
with
Okay,
an
well,
awful
then we
lot
wait 40 more
of
fucking minutes.
Marcusean critical theory, especially in the race domain.
I mean,
And that got infused
I
very
can't tell how
rapidly
long we've
into
got on
the
here, so-
educational system, so that the book, The
we
Critical
might
Turn
have
in
a while.
Education
We
by
might have
Isaac
a while to
Gottesman,
wait, and that's okay.
published to tell the story of how our education system got captured by critical pedagogy, has
Or at least
this
everyone's ready and
subtitle.
prepared.
It says, from Marxist critique, which is the first couple chapters explaining that didn't work. It couldn't get into American education. From Marxist critique to post-structuralist feminism to critical theories of race. And so you can see the progression into education. And the last half of the book is talking about how basically the postmodern feminists, the post-structuralist feminists, stepped in and bulldozed their way into education, infused it with lots of postmodern theory into the education theory that was already tipping into the critical domain. And then critical race theory came in and kind of made it all intersectional in the end, in the early 2000s. So feminism and critical pedagogy were the forges of woke. And it really, most of the heavy
weren't.
lifting took
That's
place
not
in
correct.
education and in education theory.
Woke
our poor
created
children.
them. James
So the
is
flavors
still
that
thinking
came out of
that
this, I'm
woke
not
is
going to go
different than
into detail
Marxism.
about
Woke is
these.
not different than Marxism,
Critical race
guys.
theory is race Marxism. It reestablishes the oppressor oppressed by race. The idea is that the white people are like the bourgeoisie, and they have a private property of whiteness, and it's going to be abolished into a enlightened state of anti-racism instead of
The
socialism.
private property of whiteness.
People of color, and
Correct.
especially black and indigenous, are and now immigrant, are the
No,
illegal
that's not
immigrants
going to work,
specifically,
funny man.
are
That doesn't
the,
work. Like that doesn't.
proletariat
That
that
doesn't. I
need to
can't
have an
even read
awakened
that.
racial consciousness. And you can see the whole picture. Queer
Please,
theory,
guys,
sexual
you don't
Marxism.
need to be that
The
fucking
dividing
inventive with the
line
name.
is
You
now
really don't.
actually not
Just
sexuality.
replace
That's
the
a
vowels
that's a
with
ruse.
numbers or something.
Or even so-called
Like
gender
that's way
identity,
too
which is
complicated.
fake,
Funny,
but also a ruse.
funny
The
mice. Like
dividing
way
line
too
is
complicated.
normalcy. Are you considered normal? Is your presentation considered legitimate or not? And we could go on and on and on.
Queer is about the annihilation of
critical pedagogy is
capitalism. He's not
educational
going to explain
Marxism,
that though. We're not going to fight that
postmodernism
fight
is
right now.
meaning-making Marxism, disability studies is ability status Marxism, fat studies is fat status Marxism with
Well,
their
that's all
whole
true
fat
indeed.
genocide and body positivity bullshit. Climate change narrative is mostly environmental
And
Marxism.
all of these
where
things are about
human
abolishing
beings
capitalism,
writ
by the
large
way.
are especially
Everything
Westerners
James
and,
is mentioning
and
right now are just
Americans,
different ways to try to
are
abolish
the oppressor
capitalism.
into the earth.
That's the goal.
And
It's
the
not about anything
global
else other than
South
that.
And the developing nations and the third world are the oppressed. All this is cobbled together in intersectionality. By the way, the same model was used, the oppressor versus oppressed. The unvaccinated were oppressing the vaccinated by making sure that they lived in more disease and would have to get more shots. You get
Because
the
it was
whole
about
picture.
community care.
So this is actually intersectionality.
He's not even talking about
Intersectionality
abolish
is
the
the
family.
culmination of our discussion on critical cultural Marxism
Intersectionality is
through
the
the
culmination.
entirety of its
James, you're
history,
so full of
just
shit.
to kind of mop up where did we come from.
It's
We
just
talked
all about
what Marxism was.
intersectionality. It's about
Then
identity
in the
politics,
early
guys. No, wrong.
1900s, 1910s through the 1930s, we had cultural Marxism. Then
I
through
think
the
that's
middle
too
part of the
complicated,
20th century,
Westcott.
a
I think you're
critical
being.
Marxism
I would
or critical
not
theory
worry
phase,
about the three.
neo-Marxist phase, and then
You guys are
from the
getting too complicated.
1970s
Please
forward,
be
at least
simple
here in
about
the
this.
West,
Simple.
cultural Marxism
It
took
doesn't
on
need to be
the
that
form
fancy.
of intersectionality, which is what we deal with now, which mixes CRT, queer theory, climate change, disability studies, fat studies, women's studies, gender studies, your mom studies, whatever
Because
studies,
it's all about
all
abolishing
together
capitalism.
under single oppressive, they call it the, Patricia Hill Collins calls it the matrix of domination.
That looks good,
which
Zebra.
sounds like something you have to pay for at some kind of weird club or something. So anyway, that is cultural Marxism in the West. That's a basic
They're
overview.
conflating
Tells
all
you
of it
kind of
because
the whole
it's all the
story, long,
same.
a bit rambling. But the point of
That
all
looks
this
good,
has been
SB.
to open the gates of Western civilization to Marxist theory, because they were not going to be able to get a Russian-style revolution. They knew they wouldn't, even with the Soviet Union at the height of its power. They knew they were never going to be able to force it.
That's
So
not true
why
at all.
Khrushchev
They're
said that they
absolutely
were
trying
gonna
to
take
force a
America without
Russian-style
firing a
revolution.
shot.
They talk about it
And
all
they
the
had to
time.
break
They
Western nations to be able
deliberately
to do
talk
that. And
about forcing a
cultural Marxism
Russian-style
has been
revolution. Are
working
you
its way
serious?
for over 100 years to be the tool to do that. And here we are at the point where it nearly succeeded.
That looks good,
The
Suzanne.
point has become, in the meantime, because of the collapse of Soviet Union,
James is saying
and
they
the
don't want a
collapse,
Russian-style
actually,
revolution?
of old school communist China
Bro,
to this
I cannot with
new
this
Deng
asshole. I
Xiaoping model,
cannot.
to enable what I'm calling
I
communism
have them on
3.0
video
or
19
20th
ways from
century
Sunday saying
communism,
they
or
want a
corporate
Russian-style
communism, or
revolution. They
corporatist
revere
communism,
Lenin.
which is the China model, which they
No,
tested there.
they hate the
one
China
country,
model.
two
You are such a
systems. You have
fucking liar, James.
Basic spirit of communist political
No,
theory mixed with a
wrong.
national socialist,
No,
fascist
no. Oh,
business
yeah, China
practice.
is a national
Very
socialist model,
key,
guys.
and that's being
Fuck
imported through
you.
the Sustainable Development Goals by the United Nations here in the West, in conjunction, by the way,
All
with
of
the
what
CCP.
James
They're
just
working
said
with
is
them.
complete and total
And
bullshit.
it's being
Everyone knows
enforced
that, right?
through ESG investment rules.
Don't
and
worry,
corporate
guys. They're not
rules,
trying to get a
environmental,
Leninist-style
social, and
revolution.
governance
They're
rules. The
doing
S in
Mao
social
and National
justice
Socialism.
Is in fact,
Fuck
most of
you,
the cultural
James.
Marxism of today,
Fuck
the S and
you.
ESG, I should say,
No.
is social justice, and that's your Western Dengism or Dungism model. Western
No,
Dengism
are you
to match
serious?
Eastern Dengism, and we're all supposed to have parallel models. The West doing it through ESG and sustainable development, which, by the way, is going to be replaced by resilient development goals. The SDGs will
He
be
is
replaced
literally
by the
making all this up.
RDGs in the future. We'll talk about that some
This
point.
is objectively false.
That should see us through to 2050 of tyranny. And meanwhile, China is meant to
None of
continue
these
to
people care
rise
about the
using this
truth.
Deng Xiaoping
None of
model.
them.
And
Not
if you
a
want to know what the
single
West
one.
is supposed to look
Not
like
a
as this
single
develops
one of
under
these
this
people.
cultural Marxism
Okay, go,
fully
go,
ripened
go, 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 go. He's
approach
rapping.
into
Go, 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 go.
communism
Go, go,
3.0
go. He's
or
rapping.
21st
He's rapping. Go,
century
go, 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 go.
Imagine
Go,
a
go, go.
Western
Go, go,
model
go.
that
He's
runs like
rapping.
China
Go, go, go,
and
go, go,
basically
go, go,
looks
go,
like
go.
South
He's
Africa
rapping.
with
He's
nicer
rapping. Go, go,
buildings,
go,
because
go,
that's more or less what we're
go,
headed
go,
for.
go,
So
go,
that's
go,
my
go, go.
basic
Spam his chat.
introduction
Spam his
to
chat. Go,
Western,
go, go,
sorry,
go,
all
go.
Western Marxism, honestly.
If you don't
or
see your chat
cultural
showing up on the
Marxism
screen, then
overall.
change
It's
the letters.
fully an hour
Go,
longer
go,
than I
go, go,
intended, so
go,
my
go,
night's
go,
ruined.
go, go, go.
I hope it's been edifying
Spam it,
for you.
spam it.
I've been
Copy,
asked so
paste,
many
copy,
times to
paste.
make,
Go, go,
where do
go,
I
go,
start?
go. Say it
Well,
over
it's
and over
3
and over
hours
again.
long,
Go, go,
but here's the
go.
place to start. You can tell your friends. You can show your friends. They can break it up in chunks.
Keep
over
pasting,
4
paste, paste,
discrete
paste, paste,
units.
paste. If you're not
And
seeing
like
it
I
show
said,
up,
it's
change the
sufficiently
letters.
popular. I can deep dive on each of these.
Go,
and we
go,
can deep
go,
dive
go,
on
go,
each
go,
part
go,
of each
go,
of
go.
these as well. We could have so much basic material.
The
Thank you
chat
for
is
listening.
ours.
I'll
The
do
chat is
another,
ours,
hopefully
asshole.
not nearly so long one again soon.
Yes! Keep going, keep going, keep going. Keep going, keep going. Spam, 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 spam. Go, 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 go. We win. We win. Thanks, James. Thanks. Thanks. We got that all on video, James. Thanks. Well done, guys. Well done. I wasn't expecting him to wrap up that quickly because someone told me he had 40 minutes left. This is why we make sure we fact check things before we say them to me, because I was not expecting it to wrap up that quickly. Listen, here is my biggest takeaway from that. Per usual, James doesn't know what the fuck. I'm going to turn my volume down now because I'm really loud. Um, listen, I'm going to be intellectually honest about this. I'm not going to sit here and say, well, you don't belong here, then get the fuck out. Like, listen, I'm going to be really fucking blunt with you. If you think that taking over a chat of a person that is lying and misinforming millions of people is a step too fucking far, then you don't care about beating the left, get the fuck out. Seriously, this is the type of pussy bullshit that has led to the left winning in the first place. This is the type of pussy bullshit that has led to the right being completely misinformed. This is the type of pussy bullshit that keeps us on the back foot always and perpetually. Oh my god, you're gonna spam a chat? Oh my god, you're spamming a chat? Oh my god, that's so scummy, guys. I just can't bring myself to spam a chat. Oh my god, it's the worst thing that's ever happened. Are you fucking shitting me? Are you fucking shitting me? The left is trying to destroy our entire way of life. They're trying to overthrow the federal government. And you're like, oh my god, guys, are we really spamming a chat right now? Oh my god, are we spamming a chat? This is why you are a loser and they are winning. This is why your children will suffer and they will get their Marxist utopia. This is why you are perpetually whining and complaining on the fucking internet and clutching your fucking pearls while the left keeps pushing forward every single day. This is why the conservative right is completely fucking misinformed about what is going on. Oh my god, guys, we can't spam a chat. We can't spam a chat. Oh my god, you're just not smart enough to be here, bro. Goodbye. Banned. You want to know why? Because if you are not willing to do what is required, then you have no fucking place here. You have no fucking place here. I'm sorry. This is not a channel for pussies. This is not a channel for people who are going to whine and complain and clutch their fucking pearls. This is a channel for people who are actually serious about solving this fucking problem. And what we have learned over the last 3.5 hours is that James Lindsay is completely misinforming his audience again. And it's not even close. And listen, man, I'm going to maintain intellectual honesty. It's not that every single thing that James said was wrong. There were quite a few things that James said that was right. But it was covered in so much bullshit and so much conspiracy theory and so many things that are just completely unhinged from reality that it actually doesn't even matter how much stuff James got right, because he covered the right things in a mound of fucking bullshit. And that is the problem. This is why people are so resoundingly misinformed about what is going on. This is why everyone on the right thinks they understand Marxism and they think they understand socialism in America, but they really have no fucking idea. This is why so many people wander onto my channel completely confused about what is going on. For the people who think I'm on the same team as James Lindsay, why the fuck would I ever be on the same team as someone who makes it his business to lie to people about what is going on? Why would I ever be on the same team as someone who ignores reality? James ignores reality. James ignores everything that doesn't adhere to the narrative that he is paid to sell. Why would I ever be on the same team with a sellout? Why would I ever be on the same team with someone who I can show you video after video of socialists specifically denouncing specifically denouncing Stalin? I can show you video after video of socialists specifically denouncing Mao. Like, in no uncertain terms, saying, we are not Maoists, we are not Stalinists. I can show you video after video of socialists specifically talking about wanting to recreate the Russian Revolution in the United States, or organizing around recreating the Russian Revolution in the United States overtly on video. And James goes on his podcast, he's like, they know they can't redo the Russian Revolution in the United States, and so they're embracing Maoism, which is exactly the opposite. It is completely contradicted by primary source video evidence that we've seen in the real world, and James fucking ignores it. You want me to be on the same team as that asshole? No. Declined. No. James will go on and on and on about intersectionality. We have, gender studies and disability studies and queer studies and fat studies and What he never says is the goal of every single one of those things is to abolish capitalism. The goal of queer theory is not about normativity because normativity means capitalism. The goal of queer theory, according to the Mary Narney gang, is the annihilation of capitalism. The reason why Queers for Palestine is a thing is the queers are in a fight against capitalism. They're in a glorious struggle against capitalism. The Palestinians are in a struggle against the evil settler colonists of Israel, also for capitalism. That's why they're in solidarity. That's what Queers for Palestine means. Why doesn't James's audience know this? He spent an hour talking about the word private property and didn't explain it correctly. James said that private property was all about exclusion, which isn't necessarily wrong, but it misses the key and critical point, which private property, which they also call bourgeois property, is private property that is used to generate wealth. It's used to generate private individual wealth. He didn't say the word equity once. He didn't say the word hierarchy once. But he said religion, Gnosticism, religion. It's all a religion, guys. It's all about original sin and Gnosticism and theosophy and all this shit. Doesn't say the word equity once. This is why James's audience is completely confused. They have no fucking clue what's going on. It was a massive fucking failure. And you're going to tell me that's an intro level podcast? Please. If someone just stumbled upon that, they wouldn't know what the fuck was going on. My How to Speak Socialist presentation is infinitely better than that on every single goddamn level. Every single level. How to Speak Socialist is better than what we just watched for 3.5 hours. James did that all extemporaneously off the top of his head, which means he didn't prepare for it. So he's just going in all these different directions that are not even cohesive. He's over here, over here, over here. He's conflating the WEF and the Radical Revolutionary Socialists in America, which are two different things. He's going on and on and on and on and on about Mao and China, Mao and China. Again, socialists in the United States are Leninists. They're not Maoists. Don't ever tell me I'm on the same team as someone who's wrongly informing millions of people. He is our worst fucking enemy. He is our biggest fucking problem, and I am never gonna stop. And I don't care how many people whine and complain. I don't care how many fucking accounts we have to create on the internet to disrupt what he's doing and to cause him problems and to cause him headaches. I don't give a fuck. Because I actually care about solving the fucking problem. I actually care about educating people about what's actually going on. And I know how many people I have had to reteach from scratch. How many people come into my channel with James's ideas and think they know everything. And you have to tear all that shit down and rebuild from scratch because they've wasted years. Some people have wasted years of their time listening to James's work and it doesn't explain anything to them. And then they come to my channel, they're like, holy shit, Carlin, James never taught me this. I'm like, I know. James's audience was talking more about me in his chat than they were about what James was talking about. Do you know what that tells me? James's audience doesn't fucking understand what James is saying. Because why would they care? I stream live socialist content all the time. The socialists complain less about me sniping their content than James's audience complains about me sniping their content. The biggest misperception that James Lindsay's viewers have when they come over here is that socialism is Gnostic. It's not at all Gnostic. It's not a religion. This is just a ploy James was trying to use to get it banned in schools, which is never going to work. And I explained this on the stream. It is useless to try to classify Marxism as a religion, A, because it's not one. There are plenty of Marxist and socialist activists who are actually like spiritual or religious. I know because I've met them in person when I've been undercover at events. There are Christians. They're Catholics. There really are. They're taking over the churches. There are Buddhists that are Marxists. They flat out talk about it. They flat out talk about. We've heard Emmy O'Brien say we're not going to ban religion. It's just like, like you can do whatever you want. They're explicit about that. Emmy O'Brien is a radical revolutionary anarcho-communist. Like, he's also a Buddhist. Doesn't want to ban religion. So the biggest misperception that James's audience have is that Marxism is a religion, and the reason they have that perception is James was using that because he wanted to try to get Marxism banned in schools as a religion, but that was never going to work because the Christians are never going to allow that, because the Christians don't actually want to ban religion in schools because they want to teach Christianity in schools. So the Christians are never going to allow Marxism to be banned in schools as a religion because that would mean also banning Christianity in the Bible. So that's the biggest thing. People come on the channel and they go, it's Gnostic. And I'm like, no, it's really not. They're like, no, but it is, Colin, it is. Let me tell you what. And sometimes it takes a week to deprogram someone. Sometimes it takes literally months to deprogram someone. Because people get these ideas cemented in their heads because they heard it from James first. Now, that doesn't mean it's an accurate idea. It just means they heard it first. And so they heard it from him first. And so they get these ideas cemented in their heads. And they're not doing anything wrong is the thing. Like, people who listen to James aren't doing anything wrong because they just don't have access to the information. They have access to the information James has given them. That doesn't mean they don't have access. They have access to the full breadth of information, right? And so they have to go through a level of cognitive dissonance to realize how much they've been lied to by James. The biggest misperception his viewers have is that James is telling the truth. He is making everything he says up out of thin air. Yeah. James is cherry-picking information that is convenient for his narrative. We know that because we never cherry-picked information. We watched as much of this stuff as we could from as many providers as we could, from as many angles as we could, and then we synthesized it. We didn't cherry-pick a paper because that one academic paper had a line in it that said something that I wanted it to say. We made sure that paper was actually taught in the real world, because just because someone writes a paper doesn't mean that paper is actually taught in the real world. Couldn't we summarize woke as post-rat? No. No, we can't. No, we cannot. We cannot. Woke on the left, guys, just means anti-capitalism. That's all it is. It's Marxism. That's it. None of this bullshit. Post-racialism means fucking nothing to normal people. Post-genderist isn't even a real thing. So no. It means Marxism. It means socialism. It means communism. On the left. On the right, woke on the right is James, by the way. Everyone knows that. But, like, doing shit like this, and I don't mean any offense to you, Foggy City Dave, you're trying to be productive, I know that, but, like, this isn't helpful to normal people. We need to explain things in the most simple possible terms as we can. Post-racialism doesn't mean anything to normal people. Post-genderist doesn't mean anything to normal people. It's Marxism. It's socialism. It's communism. It's authoritarianism. Exactly. I look at trainings from everywhere. I don't cherry pick. I look at everything. Did you know the true celebration of Thanksgiving was the banishing of socialism? I didn't know that. I would have to look into that. I'm not sure I agree with that, but I would have to look into it. Woke on the right is those who are trying to cancel and censor others on the right, just like James censored any of the Yeah, James censored comments about abolishing capitalism after he explicitly said it was about abolishing capitalism. We have it all on video. Like, we're not making this shit up. Like, James can delete whatever comments he wants, but we have him on video deleting the fucking comments. So, I guess that's all we have for today, guys. That's going to be our stream for today. I apologize if people just got here because normally I stream at 5 o'clock, but I was kind of beholden to the schedule that James had us on today, so that's going to be our stream for today. And actually, I think that's good, honestly, because it's Halloween, and you should be going out trick-or-treating with your kids and having fun. And I'm going to go and work on my book a while, and that's what I'm going to do. So I think this actually worked out great. Happy Halloween, everyone. I will be back tomorrow at 5 p.m. Is it happy hour tomorrow? Is it Thursday? Is it happy hour tomorrow? I'm going to be drinking beer at 5 p.m. And I will see you guys then. I hope you all have a great rest of your day. Take care, and we'll see you guys soon. Bye.
How are you feeling?
Well,
How long have you been here?
3 months, May 17th.
And what brought you?
That's difficult to answer.
Could you give me some idea?
I am not completely like other people.
What do you mean by that?
People dislike me because I am not completely like them. I am trying to do with my life something which few people try to do, and this influences my thinking and consequently my action.
What is it you're trying to do with your life?
Play the piano for people.
I'm not clear. How is it that playing the piano for people has eventually resulted in your being here in the hospital?
That's difficult to answer.